The God cards are a series of monsters which have their own specific type and attribute that were created just for them, and is used for no other cards in the game. So you would think that an archetype that was so important that it was given its own type and attribute, something that's not done for anything else, would be somewhat game-changing. But at the best of times, God cards were nothing more than a niche tech option. There are 5 Divine Beast-type monsters in the game, which are also the only 5 Divine Attribute monsters in the game. Of those 5, 2 of them are just different forms of the Winged Dragon of Ra, and basically interact exclusively with that card. Also, each of the 3 original God cards has individual support, with the Winged Dragon of Ra eclipsing all of them when it comes to the amount of support it's received. To start off, let's go over Obelisk the Tormentor. This was the first God card released in 2010 in the TCG, and released a couple of years earlier in the OCG. Despite the God cards being incredibly linked to each other, they were all released at different times in both the OCG and TCG for some reason. In the anime, the God cards were basically Ultimate Falcons on legs, with actual good effects, because they were basically immune to everything and had like 20 different effects that could apply to whatever situation they needed. The God cards kind of acted as video game boss monsters, where they had different phases and different kinds of effects depending on what kinds of things you had in the field, or whatever they thought would be cool for that moment. So when they transferred these ridiculously broken cards over to the real game, where there just literally was not enough text on a card in order to print all the effects they had, they went with a rather lackluster option of just giving them a handful of the effects they once had, while also ignoring a lot of the protection that would probably have made them playable. That is, except for Obelisk. Obelisk is a 4,000 attack monster that requires 3 tributes to normal summon. Its normal summon cannot be negated, and when normal summoned, other cards and effects cannot be activated during that window, a trait that all 3 of the God cards share. Then Obelisk goes on to have its own effects, where, on a spell speed 1, you contribute 2 monsters you control, including itself, to destroy all monsters your opponent controls. However, this card cannot attack during the turn it activates this effect. If this card is special summoned, it's sent to the graveyard during the end phase, and finally, neither player can target this monster with card effects. It was this last line of its effect that allowed Obelisk the Tormentor to actually see competitive play. When it was first released in 2010, gigantic monsters that cannot be targeted were kind of rare, and non-targeting removal was even rarer. So bringing out Obelisk the Tormentor could be paramount to having an unstoppable boss monster on the field, simply because it had high attack while being untargetable. Nowadays though, the average meta deck can easily bring out multiple forms of non-targeting removal and monsters that could beat over Obelisk the Tormentor by battle, which was not the case in the early 2010s. So Obelisk the Tormentor was often used as a single one-of in Frog decks, since back then they were geared more towards tribute fodder for Monarchs and Light and Darkness Dragon, and when Dragon Rulers came out in 2013, Obelisk the Tormentor saw play as a side tech option in the mirror match, because Dragon Ruler decks themselves had a hard time with non-targeting removal, or getting more than 4,000 attack on the field. But it was only really a side deck option because the main other meta threat at the time, spellbooks, had their best form of removal in Spellbook of Fate, which was a non-target banish. Then, after the Dragon Ruler format had its power level reined in by some choice bans, new support cards were released, Obelisk the Tormentor fell out of play and then kinda stopped seeing competitive play ever since. However, Obelisk was only the second most played God card in the competitive scene, as we'll see a little bit later on in this video. Next up, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra. This card was released 2 years later in 2012, or 2009 in the OCG, and has the same summoning protection effects as Obelisk the Tormentor, and also on its summon, its attack and defense become equal to the amount of life points you paid when you summon the card, where you can pay all but 100 life points in order to grant this card that amount of attack and defense. And you are not able to choose the amount of life points you pay, you have to pay all but 100. So if you summon this card with the full 8,000 life points, it will have 7,900 attack and defense. The Winged Dragon Ra also has an effect where it cannot be special summoned at all, and finally it has the non-once per turn effect, where you can pay 1,000 life points in order to destroy one monster on the field, which is kind of counterintuitive with its attack gain effect, because you won't actually be able to destroy anything unless you find a way to gain life points after you bring out the Winged Dragon of Ra. And the first version of the Winged Dragon of Ra was absolutely terrible. It had no protection like Obelisk, which was strange that they decided to regress the protection of the God cards rather than adding more onto it, so its attack point gain could be reset by any kind of negate that just kind of breathed on it. And it was already making you super vulnerable for activating its attack gain effect in the first place because you only had 100 life points left, and Gaga Cowboy was a very common staple in the following years after it came out, which could burn you for 800 points of damage on a generic rank 4 summon. Of the 3 original God cards, the Winged Dragon of Ra was easily the worst, which is kind of funny because the anime counterpart that it was based on was the most overpowered out of the main three, which is probably why they gave it a massive amount of support later on, which simply exists to simulate its many anime effects. And finally, we have Slifer the Sky Dragon. This card came out later in the same year of 2012 as the Winged Dragon of Ra, and came out 2 years after the Winged Dragon of Ra in the OCG in 2011. I'm not sure why they staggered the release of the 3 god cards so much, but it obviously wasn't in order to make them stronger. Slifer the Sky Dragon has the effect tied to its summoning condition that are shared with the previous 2, and its attack and defense are based on the amount of cards you have in your hand times 1000. And unlike the Winged Dragon of Ra, this card can be special summoned. It's simply sent to the graveyard during the end phase, just like Obelisk the Tormentor. And finally, if a monster is summoned to your opponent's side of the field in attack position, they lose 2000 attack, and then if the monster's attack is reduced to 0, it's destroyed, which is actually a really good effect. This would be an excellent floodgate effect to have on another monster that wasn't so difficult to bring out and lacked absolutely all kinds of protection. Since, just like the Winged Dragon of Ra, they didn't give Slifer the Sky Dragon any form of inherent protection, where it would definitely have benefited from being untargetable like Obelisk. Over the years, they did release some generic support for the god cards, either in the form of cards which interacted with their Divine Beast tag or Divine Attribute, list the card's name specifically, or allowed you to tribute summon with the 3 tributes easier. In 2014, they released Mound of the Bound Creator, which is a field spell card that makes it so level 10 or higher monsters in the field can't be targeted or destroyed by card effects. In addition, if one of these monsters destroys a monster by battle, your opponent takes 1000 points of damage. And then, if this card in the field is destroyed, you get to add a divine monster from your deck to your hand. So the floating effect of Mound of the Bound Creator is one of the few ways to actually search out the 3 god cards. Now, its on-field protection actually gives the god cards protections they probably should have had built in from the beginning, as being untargetable and indestructible is actually really good. And the field spell card was obviously made in order to try to rectify some of the early design choices of the 3 original god cards. Although requiring the field spell card to be on the field, which itself doesn't have any protection, didn't really solve the problem. In fact, it was mostly played in non-god card decks to make use of the fact that it works on any level 10 or higher monsters, if it was used at all in competitive play. In the same year, they also released Ra's Disciple, which is a monster that can special summon 2 other copies of itself from your hand or deck on its summon. However, the card then has restrictions, where you cannot tribute these cards, except if it's for the tribute summon of the 3 original god cards, as it lists all of them exactly by name, and also you cannot special summon other monsters, except by the effect of Ra's Disciple. So, funnily enough, because of this card's restrictions on locking you into not being able to special summon other monsters, it's actually a really good card to give to your opponent with something like Give and Take, in order to completely lock them out of special summoning monsters. It is actually what got Give and Take limited in Duel Links, because it was one of the few ways to lock down your opponent, since they don't really have floodgates included in that game. However, since Ra's Disciple didn't actually give you an additional summon, just provided 3 monsters in the field to be tributed for the god cards, it's actually not that useful for bringing them out. 2 years later, in 2016, they released a card called True Name. This card is meant to be another searcher for the god cards, although it's actually harder to use than Mound of the Bound Creator, because what you do in order to activate the effect is declare a card name, then look at the top card of your deck. If the top card of your deck is that card name, then you get to add it to your hand, then you get to take a divine monster from your deck, and either add it to your hand or special summon it from the deck. However, if you get the name incorrect, then you just send the card to the graveyard. And since the Winged Dragon of Ra can't be special summoned, the card only really works to bring out Obelisk the Tormentor or Slifer the Sky Dragon. In 2020, along with some Winged Dragon of Ra support, they released a card called Egyptian God Slime, which is a fusion monster that can be brought out by tributing a level 10 Aqua monster with 0 attack. So cards like the trap card Metal Reflect Slime. And while it's on the field, it can't be destroyed by battle, has 3000 attack and defense, and can be treated as 1 or 3 tributes for the tribute summon of a monster. So obviously an excellent card in order to bring out the god cards, just as long as you play Metal Reflect Slime, which can be searched out of the deck immediately during the battle phase with Reactor Slime, and then activated the same turn. Or with the Raw support card Guardian Slime. And Egyptian God Slime is definitely one of the better cards released in order to help bring out the original god cards, although it's not the best one. In 2021, they released a whole bunch of other support cards for the god cards, including a card called Soul Crossing. This is a quick play spell card which can only be activated during the main phase that allows you to tribute 1 Divine Beast monster from your hand, and allows you to tribute monsters on both players' side of the field. So basically, you can use Soul Crossing in order to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters for 1 of your god cards, which is easily the best way to bring one of them out. However, because Soul Crossing is actually good with its effect, because it even gives you an additional normal summon for this tribute, so you don't have to waste your 1 normal summon, is that if you use this card, you can only use 1 card or effect per turn, not counting a god card's effect, and this restriction lasts until the end of your next turn. So, if you use this during your opponent's turn, you can only use 1 card effect in your next turn. However, another distinction to this card over other similar things like the Monarch Stormforth or Soul Exchange is that Soul Crossing actually works on immune boss monsters, because it treats the effect as a tribute summon, rather than the effect of a spell card allowing you to tribute your opponent's monsters. Which is a distinction that matters for things like Ultimate Falcon. So Soul Crossing is definitely one of the best pieces of God card support created, which is why it has that really awful restriction to allow you to do anything else for the 2 turns after using it. Also, the same year they released Divine Evolution, which is a buff for one of your God cards or the Wicked versions, which gives it 1000 attack and defense, makes it so all of their effects are spell speed 4, and if they declare an attack, forces your opponent to send one monster they control to the graveyard. There's also the Ultimate Divine Beast, a continuous trap card which has the effect where if your opponent declares an attack, you can discard a spell or trap card from your hand in order to special summon a Divine Beast monster from your graveyard defense position and redirect the attack to that monster. And then during the end phase, if you control a Divine Beast monster, you destroy all cards your opponent controls and activate their effects on the field this turn. And both of these cards seem like they'd be pretty good God card support, except for the fact they kind of don't really help getting the cards on the field or in the graveyard, and they might be considered more of a win more option in the case of Divine Evolution or the second effect of Ultimate Divine Beast. However, you may even think Ultimate Divine Beast literally special summons Obelisk or Slifer to the field every turn. How could this possibly not be a good card to get the God cards out? Well, the devil is really in the details in this case. It only activates its effect if your opponent declares an attack, which means it's a sitting duck until your opponent activates the trigger, which is the reason why cards like Mirror Force don't really see play, even though it can destroy all of your opponent's attack position monsters, but Lightning Storm sees play in pretty much every side deck, even though it has an effect to do the same thing. Relying on a battle trigger is one of the worst kinds of triggers, and is just too slow in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Additionally, it requires you to discard specifically a spell or trap card in order to activate the effect, which means you can't even discard a God card to the graveyard in order to help set up its effect. So you need some other way to get the God cards in the graveyard, and some of the best cards to discard are monster cards, because graveyard effects are just much more common on monsters than they are on spell or trap cards. But in addition to these more generic God card support cards, they did also have a series of incredibly specific ones. Let's go over Obelisk and Slifer first, since they definitely have the least amount. When it comes to specific support cards for Obelisk himself, he only really has one that's released in the TCG called Fist of Fate, where it's a quick play spell card that can only be activated if you control Obelisk the Tormentor, where it allows you to negate the effects of one monster your opponent controls and destroy it, and then if you do, for the rest of this turn, it negates all effects of that monster with the same original name, kind of in the same way as Called by the Grave. In addition, the activation of this card cannot be negated, and it does not target, so it can be seen as a way to outpower boss monsters, and it gains an additional effect if activated during your main phase, where you get to also destroy all spell and trap cards your opponent controls. Now, this card definitely seems like a strong card. It's a quasi spell speed 4 destruction of one of your opponent's monsters that does not target, and it negates its effects, so it can remove pretty much anything your opponent controls other than something that's just immune to card effects. And then it's a Harpy's Feather Duster on top of that. But this is just another win more card that doesn't actually help get Obelisk on the field in the first place, or search it out, which has historically been the hardest thing to do with the God cards. There's also 2 pieces of Obelisk support in the OCG that are not released in the TCG yet, which are a little bit better at actually helping getting Obelisk on the field. One of them is called Soul Energy Max, which is a trap card that allows you to tribute 2 monsters you control if you control an Obelisk, in order to destroy as many monsters your opponent controls as possible, and then inflict 4,000 points of damage to your opponent. And this effect is actually one of the highest amount of burn damage inflicted by a singular card, so requiring Obelisk and 2 tributes to use the effect is definitely warranted. The better part about this card is definitely its graveyard effect though, where during the battle phase you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to add Obelisk to your hand from your deck or graveyard, then immediately you can normal summon that Obelisk if you have the required materials. And then there's Magical Trick Mirror, which is another normal trap card that has the effect where, if your opponent declares an attack, you can target one spell card in your opponent's graveyard in order to set it to your field. And then its more useful effect is tied to its graveyard effect, where you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to send a monster reborn from your hand or field to the graveyard, in order to special summon Obelisk from the graveyard in defense position. And then if it activates its effect during your opponent's turn, all of your opponent's monsters must attack that Obelisk. And since it has 4,000 defense, and this card can be used during the battle phase, it could be a way to do a lot of defensive reflect damage to your opponent. And outside of these 3 cards, Obelisk doesn't really have any other specific support cards that's just for him. Next up we have Slifer the Sky Dragon. When it comes to specific support for Slifer, it really only has Thunder Force Attack, which is a quick play spell card that can only be activated if you control Slifer the Sky Dragon on the field, and just like Fist of Fate, its activation cannot be negated. And it has the effect to destroy as many face-up attack monsters your opponent controls as possible, and then it has an additional effect if it's activated during your main phase, where you get to draw a number of cards equal to the monsters destroyed with the effect, but you can only attack with one monster during this turn. Which again seems like an amazing effect since it's basically a Raigeki that can draw you a whole bunch of cards. But since it doesn't let you get Slifer out in the field quicker, it's actually not that useful, because that is definitely the biggest problem with all of the god cards. The resources to just get them on the field in the first place are so difficult to accomplish when you're trying to play through your opponent's disruptions, that anything that requires a specific named god card to be on the field, when they're already hard to search out, is just not viable no matter what their effects are. And Slifer doesn't really have any other support specific to it, except for the Joker Straight archetype. You see, there's a series of support for these 3 cards, which allows you to really easily get 3 monsters in the field with their spell card called Joker Straight, which allows you to special summon a Queen's Knight from your deck at the cost of a discard from your hand, then allows you to add a King's Knight from your deck to your hand, then immediately normal summon it, which will proc King's Knight's effects in order to special summon Jack's Knight from your deck. And since Joker Straight is a straight get 3 monsters in the field without using up your normal summon, it has restrictions where you can't special summon from the extra deck for the rest of the turn except for light warrior monsters. And the card recycles itself to your hand during the end phase. And this definitely allows you to use those 3 monsters to go into any of the god cards. But the reason this archetype is more specific to Slifer is because of one of their support cards called Thunder Speed Summon, which is a quick play spell card that has the effect where, during the main or battle phase, immediately after the effect resolves, you can normal summon 1 level 10 monster, or if you control the 3 King's Knight cards, you can apply an additional effect which allows you to add a level 10 non-dark monster with question mark for attack from your deck to your hand, where you then immediately normal summon a level 10 monster. And what do you know, Slifer is a non-dark level 10 monster with question mark for attack and defense. Although, so is the Winged Dragon of Ra. So I guess technically it could be support for both of these cards. Speaking of that, let's go over the Winged Dragon of Ra. The Winged Dragon of Ra has received way more support specifically than all of the other god cards, probably combined, as 2 of the 5 Divine Beast monsters in the game are just different forms of the Winged Dragon of Ra. We have the Winged Dragon of Ra Immortal Phoenix, which can only be summoned from the graveyard if the Winged Dragon of Ra is sent from the field to the graveyard, and cannot be special summoned in other ways. When it's summoned, other cards and effects cannot be activated in response to it. It's baseline immune to other card effects, has 4,000 attack and defense, and you can pay 1,000 life points in order to send a monster from the field to the graveyard on a non-once per turn effect. And then during the end phase, this card is sent to the graveyard, where you can then summon the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode from your hand, deck, or graveyard, ignoring its summoning conditions. So, the Winged Dragon of Ra Immortal Phoenix kind of has the effect the original one should have had, being immune to card effects and having a high baseline attack and defense, while being able to actually use its effect to send your opponent's monsters to the graveyard. Although, since the activation requirement requires you to have the card in the graveyard already, and to have the original Winged Dragon of Ra both hit the field and then enter the graveyard while it's there, it's really more of a gimmick than it's an actual usable card, unlike the card it actually summons from the deck during the end phase. Next up, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode, which is easily the most used god card, and is actually just a pure staple card that has seen tons of competitive play. Which is kind of funny because it's just a random side support for the Winged Dragon of Ra, the worst god card, which technically makes Sphere mode the best god card by a mile because of its massive amount of success. As what it does is it cannot be special summoned, and in order to normal summon this card, you have to tribute 3 monsters on either side of the field. And that's the main benefit of this card. You can tribute this card with 3 of your opponent's monsters, which bypasses pretty much all card effects, except ones which would prevent you from normal summoning in the first place. So if your opponent is playing a whole bunch of unbeatable monsters, or just a whole bunch of monsters with negates or quick effects, what you can do is side in the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode during game 2, in order to easily out all of them with the least amount of resources, i.e. just 1 monster from your hand, and giving up your normal summon. There aren't really cards that out more unbeatable boss monsters with 1 card from your hand than the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode, to the point where sometimes people only end on boards with only 2 or less monsters just to play around Sphere mode if they think their opponent has one, which is also a benefit. Sphere mode also has the effect where, if you're actually using this card's god card support abilities, you can tribute this card in order to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions, and then setting its attack and defense to 4,000. So actually a pretty good way of bringing out the original Winged Dragon of Ra, especially if you have Immortal Phoenix in your graveyard ready to come out if it's simply breathed upon because it still has no protection. And then they also released a couple of other Winged Dragon of Ra support cards. There's Guardian Slime, which can special summon itself from your hand when you take damage, and allows you to search out a Winged Dragon of Ra spell or trap card from your deck if it's sent from your hand or field to the graveyard. There's also Ancient Chant, which allows you to actually search out the Winged Dragon of Ra from your deck, and then immediately allows you to tribute summon 1 additional monster during your main phase this turn. which is actually a great piece of support for a specific god card, because it actually does the ever important thing of allowing you to search out the card, which all the other specific god card supports are lacking. Really, they should print an ancient chant for both Obelisk and Slifer, and it's kind of a shame that it only works on the Winged Dragon of Ra. Additionally, it has a graveyard effect, where you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to make it so that if you tribute summon the Winged Dragon of Ra this turn, its original attack and defense become the original attack and defense of the monsters tributed for its tribute summon. And since this is a lingering effect granted by a spell card, it actually keeps the attack gains if it's negated on the field, since you can't negate a lingering effect, except if you remove the card from the field or flip it face down. There's Millennium Revelation, which allows you to send a Divine Beast monster from your hand to the graveyard to search out Monster Reborn, and then has another effect where you can send this card from your field to the graveyard in order to allow you to use Monster Reborn to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your graveyard, ignoring its summoning conditions. But then you have to send that Winged Dragon of Ra from your field to the graveyard during the end phase. There's Dark Spell Regeneration, which is a trap card that can only be activated when your opponent declares an attack that allows you to steal a spell card from your opponent's graveyard, and has a graveyard effect in order to send a Monster Reborn from your hand or field to the graveyard to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your graveyard, ignoring its summoning conditions. Then it sends one monster your opponent controls to the graveyard. There's Sun God Unification, which is a continuous trap card that allows you to basically copy the effect of the Winged Dragon of Ra's normal summon of paying all your life points, only have 100 left in order to grant that amount of attack to your Winged Dragon of Ra. And then has an effect where you contribute a Winged Dragon of Ra in order to gain those life points back. And since it's a continuous trap card, can be used in response to your Winged Dragon of Ra maybe getting destroyed by one of your opponent's card effects. And finally, there's Blaze Cannon, the specific quick play spell card made for the Winged Dragon of Ra in the same vein as Fist of Fate and Thunder Force Attack, where its activation effect can't be negated and allows you to grant the Winged Dragon of Ra you control 3 effects, where it becomes unaffected by your opponent's card effects, and if it declares an attack, you contribute any number of your monsters that did not declare an attack in order to give their attack points to Ra. Then, after damage calculation, if you attacked, you can send all monsters your opponent controls to the graveyard, with all 3 of these effects only lasting until the end phase of this turn. Now, what's funny with all these support cards with the Winged Dragon of Ra is that each of these new pieces of support are just trying to give the original Winged Dragon of Ra back some of the effects it had from the original anime, to kind of give you an indication of how many effects the original god cards had, and how completely stripped of them they were when they were imported to the actual card game. And even with all of this support, the Winged Dragon of Ra still hasn't really seen any competitive play, even though the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode has seen mountains amounts of success. So, now that we've gone over the god cards and all of their support, why exactly did the god cards fail as an archetype or mechanic? Well, because, funnily enough, they're actually really hard to search out, and you have to build your entire deck around them in the first place. Only the Winged Dragon of Ra has a card that specifically searches it out in the TCG, with the other 2 god cards just kind of relying on generic support that requires you to jump through hoops in order to really search them out. You can search out Obelisk with Card of the Soul though, but only if you still have 8,000 life points left. And Slifer with Thunder Speed Summon, but only if you have 3 specific monsters in the field. In addition to them actually being difficult to search out in the first place, you have to dedicate 3 monsters in the field and have an available normal summon for them to actually come out. And this in itself is not that difficult to accomplish, assuming your opponent has 0 disruption. The average meta deck has to be able to play through at least 1 form of disruption, otherwise it's not considered competitive. So if you're able to provide 2 forms of disruption, you can kind of shut down your opponent's entire turn, assuming generic scenarios. So with this in mind, getting 3 monsters on the field and a specific name card in your hand, it's already hard to do either of those 2 things in the first place, which just makes it so the card you do bring out has to be absolutely worth the effort, where none of the original god cards are worth that effort. So the ideal situation is being able to successfully resolve Soul Crossing in order to normal summon them from your hand during your opponent's turn. But still, in that circumstance, you still need to have the god cards in your hand in the first place, and they're dead cards in your hand unless you're able to actually provide the tribute fodder outside of that. And a lot of the support cards revolve around them being on the field already, which is the hardest thing to accomplish with them. So, it's a combination of the cards being too hard to bring out and not being worth the effort in order to bring them out, with all of the support requiring them to be on the field already. The thing is, there are archetypes in the game which require a whole bunch of tributes in order to hit the field, which have seen competitive play in the past. So it's not like the concept can't work. The 2 best examples are the True Draco and Monarch archetypes. The True Dracos are able to hit the field a lot easier because they have the effects that allow you to tribute continuous spell and trap cards in addition to monsters, and they all have effects in the field that allow you to gain additional advantage immediately. And because they primarily rely on tribute summons, usually only a single one, they're able to play a whole bunch of floodgates to stop their opponent from playing. Whereas with the God card and its support, each one of them requires 3 tributes, which usually involves a lot of special summoning and playing other resources, where you can't just reliably floodgate your opponent with floodgates, because you actually need to perform a lot of special summons. And there's also the Monarch archetype, which was able to solve its problem of requiring tributes for all of its high-level monsters by just printing a whole bunch of spell or trap cards that allow them to cycle through their deck quicker, search out their key cards like crazy, and easily supplement their tribute cost through spell and trap cards and vassals that grant them extra tribute summons, bring themselves out of the graveyard infinitely, or summon during your opponent's turn for their immediate effects. Whereas the best thing the God cards have in comparison is Ancient Chant that allows you to search out only the worst God card, and Soul Crossing, which can allow you to summon the God card during your opponent's turn, but only Slifer has an effect that's actually useful during your opponent's turn, who is one of the hardest to search out ones outside of Thunderous Speed Summon, which is not easy to use at all, or using MST on your own Mound of the Bound Creator, or stacking the top of your deck and then using True Name in order to special summon it from the deck. So, in conclusion, why did the God cards fail? Well, because they don't do enough on the field by themselves to justify the resources required to bring them out, and their only support consistently only works while they're already on the field in the first place, where their biggest weakness is just hitting the field in the first place. So if they were to help fix the God cards to be more usable, they'd have to add more ways to actually get the cards on the field, rather than more cards that interact with them while they're already on the field. So if they had something like Ancient Chant that worked on all of the God cards, that would definitely go a long way to help. If they had more cards like Egyptian God Slime that can be treated as 3 tribute summons and special summoned easier, that would go a long way to alleviate the massive resource requirement required in order to have them get on the field. And if the specific cards made for them that required them to be on the field had a dual nature instead, where they instead had a good effect that could be activated while the card was on the field, or had a good way of searching the card out if it was not, that would be miles better than what they are now. Which seems to be the direction they're taking with the new Obelisk support, as that's basically what Soul Energy Max does. And to end off this video, I should probably talk about Halaktai, the Creator of Light. This is an OCG-only card that allows you to instantly win the duel if you're able to special summon this card from your hand by tributing the 3 original God cards on your side of the field. I imagine one of the reasons they don't want to give you too many easy ways to get the 3 God cards out is because Halaktai exists, and can allow you to win the duel too easily, which is kind of funny to think about. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been around for over a decade and has released a ton of cards throughout the years. Some of these cards are great, some not so much, and some are right in between. So let's go on an adventure to the unknown side of Yu-Gi-Oh! And find some of the more unique cards in its history. Today's episode, we're going to be going over gods and divine beasts. And starting off today's episode is the Darklord monsters. Although the greater archetype story has been covered before in another episode of the series, it's worth noting the inspirations for each of the members, as almost all of the Darklord monsters are based off of Judeo-Christian theology. All of the Darklord monsters are dark fairy-type monsters which coincide with the themes of the fallen angels. And although several of the members in the archetype have made appearances in the shows with duelists like Serenity Wheeler, Rebecca Hawkins, and Fonda Fontaine, the full archetype had one true owner, Midori Hibiki, who was only seen in the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX manga. The archetype focuses on first sending the Darklord monsters to the graveyard, and then special summoning them once more from the grave, which also works well with the themes of the deck. But now onto the members of the archetype, starting with Darklord Amdusk, which is a level 6 monster with 1800 attack and 2800 defense. Amdusk can discard itself and a Darklord to add back a Darklord monster to your hand, as well as pay 1000 life points to use a Darklord spell or trap from your graveyard, then shuffle it back into the deck. Amdusk is based off of Amdusius, which is a commander of the Legions of the Demons who is typically depicted as a human with claws, the head of a unicorn, and a trumpet to symbolize his command over the legions. Next is Darklord Asmodeus, a more well-known member of the archetype as Asmodeus was one of the original Darklord monsters. Asmodeus has to be normal summoned, as well as once per turn you can send a fairy-type monster from your deck to the graveyard. Asmodeus' goal is to be destroyed, as once he is, he can summon 2 tokens. One can't be destroyed by battle, and the other can't be destroyed by card effects. His inspiration shares the same name as the monster card, and even a similar effect. Asmodeus is the king of both daemons and demons, which is translated through the 2 tokens that he summons. Darklord Desire is one of the higher level Darklord monsters, sitting at level 10. This 3000 attack monster can also be tribute summoned by using one fairy monster, which is rather unique as a summoning condition for older Yu-Gi-Oh! Additionally, once per turn, you can allow Desire to lose 1000 attack to send one target monster opponent controls to the graveyard. Desires is based off Mammon or Greed. Darklord Mari is one of the more iconic cards of the archetype, as it was known as Mari the Fallen One before it was eroded, so it would fit into the archetype. Due to this, it's actually the only non-fairy monster in the archetype. For some reason, Konami wanted to keep the original name of Mari. Mari is a reference to the Virgin Mary. Although the naming isn't the same, the other translations for the card match up with the biblical name of Maria. Surprisingly, Lucifer the Fallen Angel has two references within the Darklord archetype. There's the more obvious Darklord Morningstar, which is the boss monster of the archetype, as well as Darklord Nurse Raffikiel. Although Darklord Morningstar is the more direct reference, Raffikiel was the original. She came out a whole year before the very first member of the archetype, Darklord Zerado, would be released. To further this, Raffikiel is a romanization of the name Lucifer written backwards. Although Raffikiel's effect isn't entirely unique, as it shares the same effect as Bad Reaction to Samochi, it's still one of the few cards that changes a critical aspect of the game, that being causing any life point gain to do damage instead. This unique effect has been utilized in gimmicky OTK decks that utilize mass life point gain cards like Gift Card. Darklord Nastin is arguably the most intimidating looking of the Darklord monsters. Although his beast-like appearance isn't indicative of what biblical figure he's meant to represent, his wings are the giveaway. See, Nastin is based off of Mastema, which was the Angel of Disaster, the father of evil who became corrupted and convinced God to condemn all demons. See, rather than the card itself, how this is referenced is in the card art of the card's Forbidden Droplet, when Nastin is converted into a demon, or in the case of Darklord, Darklord Contract, where Nastin goes to the gates of heaven to meet with God and the sanctified Darklord, where Nastin meets with God to try to convince him to condemn the demons. The last notable Darklord monster is Darklord Superbia, which is a level 9 monster with 2900 attack and 2400 defense. It has the simple effect that when it's special summoned from the graveyard, you can special summon another fairy monster from the graveyard. Although not outright shouting as a reference, Superbia's inspiration is the deadly sin of pride, as Superbia in Latin means pride. Although there are a couple more Darklord monsters in the archetype, they mainly refer to Mayan theology, which we'll save for another episode. But on the topic of deities and gods, let's talk about the ones in Yu-Gi-Oh! So everyone knows the god cards like Slifer the Sky Dragon, Obelisk the Tormentor, and the Winged Dragon of Ra. They're a part of the pretty exclusive attribute called Divine, and an equally exclusive type called Divine Beast. Now, although officially they are the only ones, except for one case, there are actually a couple of other monsters that are considered Divine Beasts or Divine Monsters that aren't exactly Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG or OCG specific. But let's talk about the fourth card in the god trio, Halaktai the Creator of Light. This level 12 Divine monster has question mark stats and is the only card in its type, which is the Creator God type monster, so arguably more powerful than the god cards themselves. Its effect is a summon condition and is essentially a game winner card. It can only be special summoned by tributing all 3 god cards, and your opponent can't negate the summon. Once summoned, you simply win the duel. Now, in terms of specifically Divine Beast monsters, there are a couple more exceptions according to the Yu-Gi-Oh! R comic as well as the 5D anime. There's the Sacred Beasts, also known as the 3 Phantasms, Ura, Lord of Searing Flames, Hamon, Lord of Striking Thunder, and Raviel, Lord of Phantasms, who, all according to the Yu-Gi-Oh! R comic, are Divine Beast type monsters. But in the TCG and OCG, they are Thunder, Pyro, and Fiend. Even their fused form, Armortile the Chaos Phantasm, is just a Fiend type monster. There are also the Wicked Gods that share the same source for their credibility of being Divine Beasts. The Wicked Avatar, the Wicked Dreadroot, and the Wicked Eraser are all Divine Beast types according to the manga, as they are dark counterparts to the original god cards, albeit weaker as they're only level 10 rather than the gods level 12. Following Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, there's also Divine Beast monsters from the 5Ds era. The Azure God Synchro monsters are also considered Divine Beasts as well as Divine type according to the 5Ds anime. Loki, Lord of the Azure, was changed to a Dark Spellcaster. Thor, Lord of the Azure, was changed to an Earth Beast Warrior, and Odin, Father of the Azure, was changed to Light Fairy. It's pretty unfortunate that this group is so exclusive. As a whole, the god cards are pretty unique, so it's both good and bad that these cards are in such a niche group. However, there are cards that can easily overpower the so-called strongest cards in the game in one way or another, just like the next cards on our list. Get all the jokes out now, everyone, as next up we have number 69, Heraldry Crest. This rank 4 Xyz monster needs any 3 level 4 monsters for its summon. This light psychic monster has 2600 attack and comes with a pretty unique effect. Once summoned, Heraldry Crest negates the effects of all other Xyz monsters in the field. Then you can target another Xyz monster in the field, and Heraldry Crest will copy its name and original effect until the end phase. On top of that, it doesn't even need to detach materials, so you're free to use the copied effect of another Xyz monster. However, despite the unique effect of Heraldry Crest, that's not entirely why it's on today's episode of the Unknown Side. See, in the Zexal anime, Heraldry Crest had a significantly more powered up effect. In the anime, Vetrix wielded the Heraldry Crest. Long story short, Vetrix was the secondary big bad of the World Duel Carnival arc, and him alongside his 3 sons, Trey, Quattro, and Quinto, targeted Yuma to capture Utopia. And yes, you heard me right, Vetrix has 3 sons. Despite looking like and being the size of a child, he was tricked into opening a door to another dimension which matured Vetrix into his miniature-sized man. In the anime, Heraldry Crest had a bit stronger of an effect. Rather than being just an anti-Xyz card, it's more of an anti-card in general. In the anime, Crest's effect was that the effects of all other face-up monsters are negated, while at the same time, Heraldry Crest would gain those effects. Yes, effects plural. So that means Heraldry Crest could have multiple effects at the same time. On top of that, not only does Heraldry Crest have card effect destruction immunity, in the anime, number cards, so cards that have number before them like number 69 Heraldry Crest, can only be destroyed by other number monsters. So Heraldry Crest had some pretty amazing survivability. The last effect of Heraldry Crest, and what it can use its materials for, is that when your opponent's monster declares an attack, you can detach a material to target and destroy one card your opponent controls. So suffice to say, the enemy Heraldry Crest is arguably one of the stronger floodgates in the game. But that's not where it ends. Heraldry Crest, like other Xyz monsters, can evolve into its C form. Number C69 Heraldry Crest of Horror, sitting as a rank 5 with the same attribute and type as its previous form, C69 is quite a bit stronger, with a staggering 4,000 attack and 1,600 defense. However, with such an impressive stat line, C69 requires a lot of materials, specifically for level 5 monsters. The payoff is its multiple effects. The first is that when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can destroy all cards your opponent controls. Then, if its previous form, number 69 Heraldry Crest, is attached as a material, it gains its detaching material effect, which is that, once per turn, you can detach a material to target one face-up Xyz monster your opponent controls, then C69 gains attack equal to that face-up monster's original attack, and C69 copies that monster's name and effects until the end phase. This version of Heraldry Crest has a couple of records under its name. It's the highest attack of any psychic monster as well as the highest attack of any rank 5. The closest competitors are Digvorzak, King of Heavy Industry with 3,200 attack for rank 5s, and Hyper Psychic Blaster / Assault Mode at 3,500 attack for Psychic. The impressive attack point value of C69 is the combination of the previous attack and defense of the original 69 with 2,600 attack and 1,400 defense. On top of that, C69 was a pioneer of a couple of things. It was the first number C Psychic monster, as well as the first card to be summoned by Chaos Field. This was an anime-exclusive field spell that had one special effect. Once per turn, you can detach material from a C number card you control to special summon a random number card from your opponent's extra deck, with the cost of not being able to attack, having its effects negated, and being destroyed during the end phase, unless you activated the secondary effect of Chaos Field. This second effect was that you would target an Xyz monster that was special summoned from your opponent's extra deck by the first effect, then Xyz summon from your extra deck one CXyz monster that's one rank higher than the monster by using it as a material. Unlike the original Heraldry Crest, C69's anime counterpart isn't as unfair to play against. The anime version has a slightly stronger effect, but not too different. It has the standard battle immunity for number monsters, as well as its copying effect lasts until your next standby phase rather than just the end phase. And for good measure, it has the original Heraldry Crest effect that when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can destroy all cards your opponent controls. Ending today's episode is a level 6 ritual monster, Vendread Slayer. Requiring any Vendread ritual spell to summon, Slayer is the quote-unquote main character of the Vendread archetype. Its effect allows it to, during damage calculation, banish a zombie monster from your graveyard to boost its attack by 300 points, bringing it to 2,700, which isn't too bad for a level 6 monster. On top of that, if the ritual summoned Slayer is sent to the graveyard, you can search for any ritual spell from your deck and foolish a Vendread monster, meaning you send it from your deck to the graveyard. Although this seems underwhelming, Vendread Slayer works extremely well in its archetype. See, the Vendread archetype, or at least the non-ritual monsters, have the two typical effects. The first typically revolves around special summoning the monster from the graveyard, and the other is that if the monster is used for a ritual summon of a Vendread ritual monster, it gains an additional effect. So, for example, Vendread Core is a level 1 dark zombie monster with 0 attack and 500 defense. Its effects are that 1, if it's in the graveyard, you can banish another zombie monster to special summon Vendread Core from your graveyard, but banish it when it leaves the field. The other effect is that if Core is used in a ritual summon of a Vendread monster, it gives the ritual monster the effects of being unable to be targeted by your opponent's card effects. Despite the unique mechanic of the Vendread monsters, why they are on today's episode of The Unknown Side is due to their story and their inspirations. The Vendread monsters are a combination of a couple of different horror series like Resident Evil and The Thing, as well as their short lore-related story. And fun fact, the archetype was one of the 2 TCG-exclusive archetypes introduced to the game, with the other being the FA monsters. There are 6 non-ritual Vendread monsters that are all somewhat different in their effects but accomplish the same goals. But they are also all inspiration from other series. There's the aforementioned Vendread Core, which is based off of Resident Evil's Ouroboros virus, and the Necroplasm virus. There's Vendread Striges, which is based off of the crows from Resident Evil, and it can special summon itself by revealing a Vendread card, as well as it provides after battle calculation of a ritual monster to draw and discard a card. There's Hound Horde, which is based off of the Thing's Kennel Thing, which are essentially zombie dogs. Hound Horde can special summon itself by discarding a Vendread card, and it allows your ritual monster to quick effect banish a spell and trap that your opponent controls. Then there's Vendread Revenants, which are your typical zombies which can special summon itself when destroyed by an opponent's card, and lets your ritual monster banish a special summon monster of your opponent's. Last is the Scar the Vendread, which is somewhat unique. Scar the Vendread doubles down on the graveyard support rather than being ritual material. See, Scar's effect, once it's sent to the graveyard, you can search a Vendread spell or trap and add it to your hand. Then, if a monster is distributed, you can banish another zombie monster to special summon Scar. So essentially you get a search and a 2300 attack beatstick, which isn't too bad. So let's briefly touch on their lore. In the City of Heroes, a zombie apocalypse broke out. Likely an experiment gone wrong, the Vendread core was exposed to the population and things took a turn for the worse. However, rather than saving the city, it was decided the area would be quarantined. It was decided there would be no evacuation, that nobody within the quarantine area could be saved, and so the few survivors were locked in with no chance of escape. A family man was locked inside. He had already lost his wife, his everything in the initial wave of zombies. Sheer rage came over him when he was infected, and rather than becoming another mindless zombie, he became the Vendread Slayer. Slayer spends his nights taking vengeance on those who took everything from him, eradicating the zombies that plagued his home. As his fight continues, he approaches a giant mass of flesh. Could this be the source of the zombies? If I kill this thing, would I save my city? Slayer thought to himself. Either way, he was taking this giant flesh heap down. Vendread Slayer charged the amalgamation of zombie-fight creatures. Cutting deep into its body with various slashes, it only seemed to anger the monster. Vendread Chimera was deeply angered, but it wasn't attacking back. Vendread Chimera started shifting around, curling into a defensive position, and then burrowed away. Slayer followed suit, but he was surprised at how fast the Chimera dug. Reaching over a mountain of debris, Slayer arrived, and it was a trap. Standing in front of him was what could only be described as the leader of the zombies, the source, Vendread Battlelord. But Slayer wasn't intimidated one bit. In fact, he was more cheerful at the opportunity to go all out and enacted vengeance on the horde of zombies. Vendread Slayer charged in, attacking and tearing through the hordes of zombies. It didn't matter their numbers, it didn't matter their strength, all that mattered was that Slayer would live up to his name and slay. He leapt at Battlelord with no hesitation, ripped out his heart in mere moments. It all happened so fast, not even the zombies that survived understood what happened. As the source of the pandemic fell to the ground and started to decay, Vendread Slayers started to assimilate the infected heart of Battlelord, gaining new powers, becoming Revendread Executor. With the day saved, Slayer, or the now Executor, can be at peace and rest with his wife in the afterlife. Although the story of Vendread monsters is pretty short, it's nice in comparison to other larger archetypes like Albaz or Visa Starfrost. Some nice, smaller, self-contained stories to balance out the longer ones. In this video, we'll go over cards that appeared in the anime that had way better effects in the anime than their real-world card versions ended up getting. And at number 10, we have a personal favorite of mine, Neos Wise Man. Neos Wise Man has the effect where it can't be destroyed by card effects, and if it battles a monster, you inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of that monster, and then gain life points equal to the defense of that monster. Its effects and protection aren't half bad, but its summoning requirement is to send 2 level 7 or higher monsters on your side of the field to the graveyard, and 2 specific ones at that, Elemental Hero Neos and Yubel. Plus, you need to have this card in your hand. Its summoning requirement is incredibly difficult to pull off, making this nothing but a joke card. Now, its anime version is a fusion monster, which actually makes it 10 times easier to summon. The anime version basically has the same effect. Can't be destroyed by card effects, and inflicts damage and gains life points when it battles a monster. But it also has a floating effect when destroyed by battle, where you can banish Yubel from your graveyard to special summon an Elemental Hero Neos from your graveyard. So the fact that it's a fusion monster that requires Neos and Yubel as its materials, and that it floats on destruction, makes anime version so much better, but it's kind of a wonder why they printed Neos Wise Man as a main deck monster in the first place. Probably because they thought its effect was too powerful at the time, and they really wanted to kill the viability of the card, while keeping most of its anime effects. And they did a good job at that. And at number 9, we have Card of Sanctity. This card has the effect where you banish all cards you control in your hand, and then you get to draw 2 cards. Not a super useful effect, only really saw play in some niche burn decks and in Duel Links. But its anime effect is probably one of the most broken cards, as its effect is simply, each player gets to draw cards until they have 6 cards in their hand. So, any modern deck can completely empty their hand in one turn to set up combo plays, and then if you play Card of Sanctity, you could draw 6 new cards and then go for even more plays. There is no restrictions to it. so you could use multiple copies and special summon as much as you wanted. Basically, any card which allows you to draw 2 cards has lots of restrictions or limitations to it. And this one allows you to draw 6. There's a good reason why they nerfed its real-world version. Anime version would be banned immediately, but they kinda went overboard and made its TCG counterpart kinda bad. Number 8. Power Wall. This card has the effect where it can only be activated when you take battle damage from an opponent's attacking monster. Then you can send 1 card from the top of your deck to the graveyard for every 500 points of battle damage you took, in order to take no battle damage. So if you would take 1,000 points of battle damage, you can send the top 2 cards of your deck to the graveyard to reduce it to 0. Pretty simple effect. Its anime effect is basically the same thing, except you send 1 card per 100 points of damage, instead of 1 card per 500 points. So this means if you take 1,000 points of battle damage, you can send 10 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard to reduce it to 0, which is actually really good. Currently there's a card on the ban list called That Grass Looks Greener, which allows you to mill about 20 cards from your deck if you build around it, which is so good that people were playing cards like Left Arm Offering just to search it out, which is a card that basically forces you to go -2 in order to search out a spell card. Now, Power Wall isn't as easy to use as Grass. Spell cards are better as you can just use them immediately, instead of having to wait for your opponent to attack you, and hope they don't pop in the back row before it even happens. The anime version did allow you to send basically just as many cards as Grass would, and has a really funny effect when it's done in GX Tag Force games. Number 7. Final Attack Orders. This card has a continuous effect where all face-up monsters in the field are changed to attack position, and their battle positions cannot be changed. Usually this card was used in Goblin Attack Force beatdown decks, with high attack level 4 monsters that change to defensive position after they attack, which means it wasn't used in any really good decks. Its anime version has the effect where all face-up monsters are changed to attack position, and their battle positions cannot be changed, just like the TCG counterpart, but also, both players choose 3 cards in their decks, and then they send the rest of their decks to the graveyard, and those 3 cards become the only cards in your deck. So it's essentially a full deck mill, as all you have to do is mill 3 more cards after you use this one in order to completely deck out your opponent. This is an insanely strong effect, as cards like Pre-Errata Exchange of the Spirit could do something similar, and was on the ban list for being way too strong. So it's no wonder only the first part of this effect got printed. The other part of the effect was just ridiculously strong. And at number 6, we have Toon World. The real-world version of Toon World doesn't have an effect. It only has a cost to be activated, and you pay 1,000 life points to put on the field. And then it's the Toon monsters that have the effects that basically require Toon World to be on the field in order to do anything. But in the anime, Toon World was a broken card that would literally turn normal cards into Toon monsters. Now, Toon World had a whole bunch of anime effects, and they never really spelled out exactly what it could do, but basically what it did was convert your monsters into Toon monsters while this card was out. All your Toon monsters couldn't be destroyed by battle and took no battle damage from battles unless they fought another Toon monster. As in the anime, Toons would just dodge out of the way of attacks. After one of your Toon monsters attacked, it could retreat into Toon World and not be targeted by attacks or affected by card effects, which would allow your opponent to attack directly. And that's basically the gist of anime version of Toon World. It would literally convert whatever it wanted into Toon versions of itself, which would then have new effects, which would be impossible to just print onto one card, as Toon World was able to convert spells and traps as well as monsters. If anything, Toon Kingdom is much more faithful to the anime version of Toon World, as it prevents your Toons from being targeted or destroyed by anything. And at number 5, we have the Seal of Orichalcos. Now, the TCG version of this card actually has a pretty decent effect. All your monsters gain 500 attack. This is the highest attack gain on a field spell card that works on all monsters and not just a specific type, or from a specific archetype. It's a complete generic 500 attack boost. It also has an effect where your opponent cannot target one of your monsters for an attack if you have another monster on the field with a higher attack. It also has built-in protection, where once per turn it can't be destroyed. All 3 of these effects are good. The downside to this is that it can only be activated once per duel. So, if they do manage to get rid of Seal of Orichalcos, you can't activate it again. And it destroys all of your special summon monsters when you activate it, and locks you out of your extra deck. That last one is kind of the biggest reason why people don't really play this card. Now, its anime effect also increased the attack of all your monsters by 500, and allowed you to use your spell and trap card zones as monster zones, basically allowing you to have 10 monsters on the field at a time, which is the broken part of this card's effect, and there's no way that would have made it into the live game, like, at all. The card couldn't be destroyed by card effects or removed from the field. Monsters in your spell and trap card zone couldn't be targeted for attacks if there was a monster in the main monster zone on top of it. You could swap positions of your monsters in the spell and trap card zone with the main monster zone. When activated, this card would defuse your monsters. And also, whoever loses the duel while this card was activated would lose their soul, which I don't think could translate very well into the TCG anyway. So if anything, they did a pretty good job of transferring some of its anime effects into the TCG, and just gave it some really heavy restrictions to make up for its overpowered anime effects, even though they didn't include the most overpowered effect of having 10 monsters out. Now, at number 4, we have another field spell card, and that's the Golden Castle of Stromberg. Golden Castle Stromberg has one of the longest card texts in the game, as it made it into my video on the top 10 longest card texts. So I'm going to try my best to summarize its effect. Basically, while this card is out, if your opponent tries to attack you, their monster is automatically destroyed and they take damage equal to half of their attack. You can special summon a monster from this card's archetype from your deck instead of using your normal summon. And during your standby phase, it has a maintenance cost of banishing 10 cards from the top of your deck face down. Now, its anime effect has some pretty similar effects to its TCG counterpart. Once per turn, you can special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your deck, and you can't normal summon. If an opponent's monster attacks, they're destroyed and they take damage equal to half that monster's attack. And it has a maintenance cost where during your standby phase, you send half the cards in your deck to the graveyard, which honestly would be a pretty good cost to have in today's Yu-Gi-Oh! And those are just its effects similar to the TCG one. Now let's go over its anime-only effects. All monsters special summoned by this card must attack, as well as all monsters your opponent controls. So it forces your opponent's monsters to attack and get destroyed by its destruction effect, which is really powerful. This card cannot be destroyed by card effects, and last but not least, your opponent pays the maintenance cost of this card. So this one-size-fits-all mega field spell card has no downsides to it, and only a whole bunch of positives. Really good effects. Your opponent can't destroy anything you have with their monsters, and basically just have to wait for them to mill their own deck out. Whereas the real version has an actual downside of banishing 10 cards face down each turn. Number 3, Slifer the Sky Dragon. This card has the effects where it requires 3 tributes to normal summon, gains 1000 attack and defense for each card in your hand. If a monster is summoned in attack position, it loses 2000 attack and is destroyed if its attacks become 0. When this card is normal summoned, effects cannot be activated, and if this card is special summoned, it's destroyed during the end phase. So basically, it just gains attack for cards in your hand and has a pretty decent floodgate effect that automatically destroys low attack monsters, with the downside of it being difficult to normal summon, and that he can only be special summoned for 1 turn. Now, the anime effect is a little different, as this card is known as one of the God cards, and had a whole bunch of additional overpowered effects, on top of some of the effects Slifer has in its real version. All in all, its anime version has like 10 effects, so I'm going to quickly summarize all of them. Requires 3 tributes to normal summon, cannot be tributed by your opponent, cannot switch control to your opponent, unaffected by spell and traps that would make this card leave the field, unaffected by other monster effects, except for Obelisk the Tormentor, whose effects only work on this card for 1 turn, and the Winged Dragon of Ra, whose effects work on this card normally. Cannot be destroyed by battle, except by another God card, and you take no battle damage. Card effects which do not make this card leave the field, only effective for 1 turn. Also treated as Dragon type, gains attack and defense times 1000 for each card in your hand. If a monster is summoned to your opponent's field, they'll lose 2000 attack if in attack mode, or 2000 defense if in defense mode. And if brought to 0 attack or defense with this card's effect, it's destroyed. If special summoned, it returns to where it was special summoned from at the end of the turn. And that's about all of its effects. As you can see, it did a lot of things and was incredibly hard to get rid of. You understand why people like the God card so much, because they did so much and were just unstoppable boss monsters. And it's very obvious why they didn't keep all of these effects when translated into the TCG, although it did keep some of them, especially its more defining effects, like destroying monsters that were summoned, and gaining attack for cards in your hand. And at number 2, we have Obelisk the Tormentor, another one of the 3 God cards. Just like with Slifer, it has a ton of anime original effects, on top of some of its TCG effects. Funny enough, out of all the God cards that were printed in the real game, Obelisk was the only one to keep any kind of protection, as it can't be targeted by card effects, which made Obelisk the best of the 3 God cards. where that was not the case in the anime. So, for its TCG real-world effect, it requires 3 tributes to be summoned, cards can't be activated when it's normal summoned, it's destroyed during the end phase if it's special summoned, it cannot be targeted by card effects, and once per turn, you contribute 2 monsters to destroy all monsters your opponent controls. Then this card wouldn't be able to attack that turn. Now, let's look at its anime effect. First off, a lot of the same summoning requirements and protections that Slifer had. So, 3 tributes, cannot be tributed, cannot swap control, cannot be destroyed by battle other than by another god card. Immune to most traps except for ones that alter its attack and defense and prevent it from attacking, but only for 1 turn. Cannot be removed from the field by a card effect. Only affected by spells and non-god card monster effects for 1 turn, except for the Winged Dragon of Ra. Also treated as warrior type. Cannot be equipped with cards. If special summon, returns to the place it was special summoned from during the end phase. If in defense mode, your opponent can only target this card for attacks and effects. During your main phase, you contribute 2 monsters to destroy all of your opponent's monsters and then immediately attack directly, but then can't attack during the battle phase that turn. During your battle phase, you contribute 2 monsters to make this card's attack become infinity for 1 attack only. And for the most part, I think that's all of its anime effects. And just like with Slifer the Sky Dragon, you can see why they didn't give it all these effects in the TCG. Its effects are too much, too convoluted, and too powerful. Now, let's go on to the number 1 card in this list. And at number 1, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, the 3rd god card, which, ironically, is supposed to be the best god card in the anime, but is the worst god card in the actual TCG. Unlike the other 2 god cards, this card cannot be special summoned, requires 3 tributes for its normal summon, and effects can't be activated when this card is normal summoned, and when this card is normal summoned, and only when this card is normal summoned, you can pay all of your life points, so you only have 100 left, for this card to gain attack and defense equal to the amount of life points you paid. There are some people who incorrectly read this card and think you can pay life points to gain attack whenever you want, but that's not the case, it's only when it's summoned. It also has an effect where you can pay 1000 life points to destroy 1 monster on the field. And it has no protection. If your opponent just negates this card's effects, its attack will drop back down to 0 and will be basically useless on the field. Now, let's go over its anime effects, because it has like 20 of them. Requires 3 tributes to normal summon, cannot be tributed by your opponent, cannot switch control to your opponent, its normal summon cannot be negated, plus cards and effects cannot activate when it's normal summoned, except for divine monster effects. This card is summoned in its sphere mode, with no attack or effects, unless you recite its special activation code. Its attack and defense become the combined attack and defense of all of the attributed monsters. When special summoned, it can immediately attack all of your opponent's monsters, regardless of what phase or whose turn it is, and these attacks cannot be prevented by card effects. During the end phase, when this card was special summoned, it is sent to the graveyard, except if it was special summoned from the hand. Cannot be removed from the field by a card effect. Only affected by other card effects for 1 turn that don't remove it from the field. You can negate any card effect that targets this card. If in defense position, you can redirect any attack or effect that targets another monster to this card. You can pay all but 1 of your life points in order to increase the attack and defense of this card by the amount of life points paid. If the life points to attack effect is activated, you can use Defusion at any time during both players' turns on this card in order to return the life points to the player, and restore this card's attack back to its original value. You contribute all other monsters you control to increase the attack and defense of this card by the attack and defense of the monsters tributed. You can pay 1000 life points to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. The activation and effects of this card cannot be negated. During either player's turn, you can pay 1000 life points to transform this card into its Phoenix mode for 1 turn. While in Phoenix mode, this card's attack and defense becomes 0, and it cannot be destroyed by battle, nor do you take any battle damage from attacks involving this card. Also, it's unaffected by other card effects and cannot be targeted. When leaving Phoenix mode, this card gains all of its attack and defense that it previously had. Alright, and I think that's everything. All in all, while the other 2 god cards had about 10 effects each, the Winged Dragon of Ra has over 20 of them. Winged Dragon of Ra was ridiculously overpowered. I doubt it's even possible to fit all of its card effects on its text, as it's just too much and would be impossible to read. And this is why I think the Winged Dragon of Ra is the best anime card, which is way better than its TCG version.
Marik Ishtar held hatred in his heart for the pharaoh, and for good reason, as he and his family lived a life of suffering in its service. Marik, however, refused his unfair fate, and set off on a crusade to defeat Yugi so that he could claim the title of pharaoh and free himself and his family from their duty as tomb keepers. But because of all the pain, hurt, and hatred Marik had endured throughout his childhood, he had also developed a second personality known as Yami Marik, who was even more twisted than the regular Marik and was only held back by the love that he felt for his family. So today, we're going to be looking at Marik and Yami Marik's 10 most important cards, how he used them to torture his opponents, and whether or not they'd be capable of defeating the Pharaoh in the actual TCG. Taking up the mantle number 10, we have Zera the Mant, a ritual monster that, in the anime, was an extremely rare card. In the anime, rarity often coincided with the card's strength, and Zera the Mant, despite not having an effect, had an impressive 2800 attack. But because it's a ritual monster, you need to use its associated ritual spell, Zera Ritual, to summon it by tributing monsters from your hand or field whose level is equal to or more than 8. Regardless, its stats made Zera the perfect boss monster during Yugi's duel with Bandit Keith, where Keith had actually stolen Yugi's Millennium Puzzle and forced him to play for it and couldn't rely on Yami Yugi's help. But all throughout this game, something was off, as Bandit Keith wasn't acting like his usual self. And while he played his regular machine-focused strategy, he also played some new rare cards that seemed quite strange in his deck. The reason for this is because Yugi wasn't actually dueling Bandit Keith. He was dueling Marik, who had been using Keith as a puppet the entire time with the power of his Millennium Rod, which is why Keith's deck was so different, as Marik was a leader of the Rare Hunters, an organization centered around winning, stealing, and counterfeiting rare cards, so that Marik could eventually track down all 3 Egyptian god cards to eventually defeat the Pharaoh. And because he had such a surplus of rare cards, Marik would often gift his servants and puppets with powerful cards so they could use them against his enemies. In the case of Bandit Keith, Marik had gifted him Zera the Mant, whose monstrous stats made it extremely difficult for Yugi to deal with, especially when paired with Keith's cheating tactics. In fact, it was so powerful that Zera almost won Marik the duel, as while Yugi eventually destroyed it, Zera's Rampage took down Summit Skull and Dark Magician, both of Yugi's ace monsters. Thankfully though, Yami Bakura interfered with the power of the Millennium Ring, which caused Keith to struggle against Marik's control, leading to one of the most terrifying moments of the series, where Keith ended up smashing the puzzle into pieces, and accidentally set fire to the warehouse, forcing Yugi to attempt to build the puzzle from scratch as the flames grew around him. But if it hadn't been for Yami Bakura, the uncommon power of Zera could have potentially led to Marik's victory. However, in the TCG, Zera the Mant is a lot less powerful than its anime counterpart. Zera's stats are fairly impressive, but the fact it doesn't have an effect makes it ineffective at being anything but a decent beatstick. And what's worse is that Zera is a ritual monster, which requires a copy of itself, its ritual spell, and 8 stars worth of tributes to bring out to the field, which is an insane amount of investment for a vanilla beatstick when there are stronger cards out there that are easier to use. But at the very least, the anime version of Zera showcased an interesting aspect of the game that's still important today: card prices. Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be an expensive game, especially when a ton of decks are reliant on pricey cards to ensure their victory, and can often feel demoralizing when your opponent has an edge because they spent more money. However, Yugi defeating Zera proves one thing: every card, even a rare one, has a weakness. In the case of Zera, it was defeated by monster removal. But if you happen to face a similar rare card, common staples can sometimes be enough to defeat even the most expensive decks out there. So while it's definitely a shame that Zera isn't as much of a threat in the TCG, its rare status not only helped to establish Marik as the leader of the Rare Hunters, but its defeat also helped to show that a card's worth isn't tied to its price. And if nothing else, that's a really cool part of the modern game, as if you have the right knowledge of the meta, you can deck build to defeat pricey strategies with cheap cards. Tributing over the 9th spot, we have Lava Golem, a card that let Yami Marik torture his opponents by literally burning them while they're trapped in the Golem's cage. The way Lava Golem enables this strategy is actually really interesting. Lava Golem can't be normal summoned or set, and instead requires 2 tributes in order to special summon. But instead of tributing your own monsters to special summon to your side of the field, you instead tribute 2 of your opponent's monsters to summon it to their field. However, if you use the effect, you can't normal summon or set for the entire turn. And then, during each of their standby phases, Lava Golem burns its controller for 1000 life points, which is actually a little bit stronger than the anime, which only burns for 700 life points during that player's end phase. Still, that version of Lava Golem proved how powerful it could be in Marik's shadow game against Joey Wheeler. For the most part, Marik dominated the third-rate duelist, and while Joey proved that he had the spirit to fight in a shadow game, Marik had complete control of the duel, and was constricting Joey's options with the likes of Helpamir. However, despite the suffering that Joey endured, he managed to stage an impressive comeback using Question. This turned Helpamir's effect against Marik, as now he didn't know what card was on the bottom of Joey's graveyard. That monster turned out to be Jinzo, who was summoned to the field and eviscerated all of Marik's traps, giving him another chance to strike back and freeing his Rocket Warrior from the Nightmare Wheel. But Marik wasn't shaken, and on the next turn, tributed over both Jinzo and Baby Dragon to summon out Lava Golem to Joey's field, trapping Joey within Lava Golem's cage and burning through his life points. Wheeler tried to make the best out of a bad situation and use Lava Golem as a powerful beatstick, but Marik was prepared and easily defended his life points while keeping Joey encased within his cage. And funnily enough, the way Golem was used in the anime is exactly how it's used in the TCG. It might seem like a bad idea to give your opponent a 3000 attack monster, as they could just use the card against you as a strong beat stick. But most of the time, you're not distributing over low attack monsters. You're using Lava Golem to tribute your opponent's powerful boss monsters and interactions before they have a chance to use them against you. So if your opponent ends on an impossible to break board, you can tribute over the monsters so you don't have to deal with them, just like how Marik tributed over Jinzo so you can get access to the rest of his trap cards. What's even better is that other than only ending on a single monster, there's very little counterplay to Lava Golem, as its ability to summon itself isn't an activated effect. It's a summoning condition, so your opponent doesn't get a chance to interact with it before their monsters leave the field. And so it's really cool to see the way Marik used Lava Golem is precisely what makes it so strong in the TCG. Tributing 2 monsters for virtually no cost is really strong. Slashing the number 8 spot is Makura the Destructor, one of the many staple fiend monsters that made up Yami Marik's strategy during the Battle City Finals. And out of every one of those fiends, Makura has the most interesting effect because it allows you to activate trap cards from your hand during the turn it's sent to the graveyard. In the modern TCG though, this effect has actually been eroded, so you can only activate a single trap card from your hand the turn Makura is sent there from the monster zone to the graveyard. Now, Makura was just a small part of Marik's fiend army, but it made itself known during his and My Valentine's Shadow game. This Shadow game's rules differ depending on if you're watching the anime or manga. In the anime, Mai's monsters each represent the memories she shared with one of her friends, and if that monster was destroyed, Mai would lose her ability to remember or even see that person. But the manga, the Shadow game's rules meant that you would feel the same suffering that your monsters would endure. So when Mai's Amazon ended up decapitating Makura, Marik's head appeared to fall off, with Mai looking on in disgust while Marik gleefully picked out the trap card he'd used from his hand. In both versions though, the card Marik ended up choosing is Rope of Life, which revives Makura with 800 more attack, allowing for Marik to stage a counterattack and destroy her Amazon. The manga painted a brutal picture of this attack, as 3 slashes appeared across Marik's body. This injury was an illusion, but the pain that Mai felt was very real. However, the anime was arguably even more cruel to Mai, as this attack caused her to lose memories of Joey Wheeler, and would have left her fighting spirit broken if it wasn't for Yugi's intervention. And the scary thing about Makura in the TCG is that if your opponent ever had the chance to use its old effect, you would have an equally painful experience. There are a lot of powerful trap cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! With absurdly strong effects, that are balanced by the fact that they're inherently slow and need to be set for a turn before you can activate them. But if you could send the uneroded Makura to the graveyard by any means, you could bypass that restriction and use these busted trap cards on your first turn. Even back in the early days of the game, this effect was crazy and enabled a ton of different combos, the likes of Chick the Yellow TK with Call the Haunted, to even Exchange of the Spirit FTK, which used the pre-erotic Exchange of the Spirit to mill your opponent's entire deck on turn 1 with the effect of Makura, which meant that they could no longer draw on the following turn and lost a deck out. And as a result, Makura soon found its way onto the Forbidden Limited list, where it remained for over a decade until its eventual errata. This errata made Makura much more awkward to use, as it needed to be sent from the monster zone to the graveyard, so you had to commit it to the field in some way. But even if you got access to its effects, you'd only be able to activate a single trap card from the hand. And both of these factors combined pretty much killed most of Makura's competitive viability. But despite how weak its current errata made it, Makura is a legendary card in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and one that reflects Marik's genius as a tormentor even in the TCG, where its past effect could put a swift end to most opponents. Reformed at number 7 is Egyptian God Slime, who in the anime was actually just Metal Reflect Slime mimicking the power of Obelisk the Tormentor. But that was only the first stage of the Egyptian God Slime, as Marik fused this version with the card Revival Jam so it would gain immortal properties and be capable of reforming to make an invincible wall. And the TCG version did a pretty good job of translating this monster to the actual game, as you can either summon it by fusing an Aqua monster and a level 10 Water monster together, or by tributing a level 10 Aqua monster with 0 attack. While it's on the field, it can be treated as 3 tributes for a tribute summon, cannot be destroyed by battle, and if your opponent tries to target a monster with an attack or an effect, they must target Egyptian God Slime, making it so it protects all of your monsters from both battle and effects. These immortal properties and its ability to protect cards are what made God Slime so valuable to Marik in his final Shadow game against Yami Yugi, where each life point loss would cause the gradual decay of the host's body. In this duel, Yugi had already just managed to survive Ra's onslaught with the help of Kaiba's Feet Sanctuary, and although Slifer was defeated, Yugi brought out his second Egyptian God card, Obelisk the Tormentor, and attacked with Marik's life points. But Marik was a cunning duelist, and Yugi had fallen right into his trap, as the damage he took let him activate Metal Reflect Slime to copy 3/4 of Obelisk's power, and then fused it with Metal Reflect Slime to make an almost indestructible monster. And what was even worse for Yugi was the Egyptian God Slime could work alongside Jam Defender. And so, when he tried to attack Marik's Boganian to prevent it from gradually whittling away at Yugi's body, God Slime would infiltrate the attack, ensuring the immortality of Marik's monsters and putting Yugi under immense pressure as he tried to save his other self. But Egyptian God's line in the actual game isn't the defensive wall the anime made him out to be. Its effects are pretty solid, especially since it protects your other monsters from card effects without the need of cards like Jam Defender, and could theoretically allow for some strategies to play around certain hand traps or targeted removal. But in practice, very few strategies are willing to jump through the hoops of summoning a level 10 Aqua monster with 0 attack, and so the only strategies that really use the card are ones focused around summoning Egyptian gods, as these strategies can take advantage of Guardian Slime as a stall tool, and then use it to summon Egyptian God Slime, which can provide 3 tributes necessary for an Egyptian god. So at the very least, it's cool that God Slime is still a useful defensive tool for the Egyptian god cards, and can let you mimic their power while helping you summon out their true boss monsters, even if this particular strategy is never going to be competitively viable. Contained in number 6 is Nightmare's Steel Cage, one of Marik's strongest stall tools that give him enough turns to finalize his Slifer-focused strategy. Now, even though Steel Cage is a normal spell, it remains face-up on the field for 2 of your opponent's turns, in a similar way to Swords of Revealing Light. And while it's on the field, no monsters on either player's field can declare an attack. This made Steel Cage an incredibly strong tool in Yugi's duel against Strings, who was yet another one of Marik's mind puppets who had been entrusted with the power of Slifer the Sky Dragon to defeat the Pharaoh. But in order to bring out Slifer, Marik had focused his early game strategy on stalling out Yugi, so he could bring out enough tributes to the field to summon out the Egyptian god card. He did this in a couple of ways, such as with Revival Jam and Jam Defender to protect his tokens when summoned out with a Jam Breeding Machine. But the icing on the cake was Nightmare's Steel Cage, which guaranteed that he would have enough turns to summon out Slifer. But Steel Cage was more than just a guarantee, as in Marik's eyes, the cage that Yugi was now trapped under was the same cage he had been forced into by his destiny as a Tomb Keeper, never to have a hope of freedom. This allowed him to momentarily make the King of Games suffer the same hopelessness that Marik and his siblings had to suffer through for their entire lives. Because after its activation, all Yugi could do was watch Marik summon out the unstoppable Egyptian god monster, Slifer the Sky Dragon. But for as cathartic as this moment was for Marik, Nightmare's Steel Cage never had the same defining moment in the actual game. Floodgates that stop monsters from attacking have been quite useful across the game's history, and while they've mostly fallen out of favor in the current format, a few modern control strategies can still play these cards in a similar way to how Marik used Steel Cage, since these kinds of cards can guarantee your survival while setting up your plays. But Steel Cage specifically has never seen any use. And the reason for that is because while its attack prevention can be helpful, there are a ton of similar cards that do what Steel Cage does, but better. With the best example being Swords of Revealing Light, which is purely just a better version of Steel Cage that lets its controller monsters attack and stay in the field for a whole extra turn, making Steel Cage pretty redundant. Which is definitely a shame because the anime made Steel Cage look as restrictive as Marik's past by literally trapping the Pharaoh and all of his monsters beneath it. But at the very least, you can still technically use Steel Cage as an option to prevent your opponent's attacks, just like Marik. But if you want to stall it long enough to summon an Egyptian god, there are better tools available. And crashing at number 5, we have Meteor of Destruction, a card that was deemed so powerful that Kaiba actually banned it for official Battle City tournaments. And the reason why is because Meteor is a burn card capable of inflicting 1000 damage to an opponent, but you need to pay 500 life points to activate it. Although the TCG version of this card is a lot weaker, because while you don't need to pay a cost, your opponent's life points need to be 3000 or more to activate it, so it could never be used to finish off an opponent. But in the anime, that's exactly what it's used for. And in one of the most important duels in Battle City, where Yugi had to face off against his best friend Joey, who had been captured and brainwashed by the power of the Millennium Rod and given a bunch of banned cards to use against Yugi. This was a death duel where both players' lives were on the line, as they were shackled to an anchor that would drag both players to the bottom of the ocean, with the only way to free themselves being to reduce your opponent's life points to 0. Because if anyone tried to intervene, Taya would be the one to die instead. This was one of the most heart-wrenching duels of the original series, with Yugi constantly trying to reach out to Joey's inner duelist by summoning Joey's red eyes and even gifting him the Millennium Puzzle. Meanwhile, Marik used Joey as an opportunity to channel his anger and hatred of the Pharaoh directly to Yugi. And this duel culminated when Joey drew Meteor of Destruction, where he fought against Marik's brainwashing once more. This affirmed Yugi's belief in the strength of their friendship, but Marik then used the full power of the rod to force Joey to activate Meteor and assure his victory. But once again, Joey had broken free of Marik's mind control, and with his mind returned, Yugi channeled Mystical Red Panel, and in a symbolic act of care for his friend, had Mystical Red Panel target himself so that his life points would be reduced to 0 and Joey would be allowed to walk free. However, the newly freed Joey refused to let Yugi die, and in a moment of haste realized the Meteor had a side effect which could force Yugi monsters to attack him, and so he begged for Red Eyes to attack, giving both players their freedom. But Yugi had already fainted, and the anchor had started to fall, which forced Joey to remain chained as he fell into the water with Yugi to save his friend. And while he succeeded, Joey struggled with his own luck. Thankfully, he was saved by the heroic actions of his sister Serenity, and so, in the end, everyone was safe. But only barely, as while Meteor did show Yugi and Joey just how strong their bond was, it could just have easily been the cause of their death. Now, in the TCG, Meteor Destruction hasn't had the same spotlight because most burn strategies are pretty gimmicky. To make a burn deck that's competitively viable, you either need to FTK your opponent for all 8,000 life points immediately, or you need to wait to stall the game over multiple turns and survive your opponent's threats to continuously burn them. Now, there have been plenty of strategies across the years that have managed to turn burn into a real threat, but those decks quickly found themselves on the forbidden limited list as they're generally unfun to play against. But in these strategies, Meteor Destruction never saw any play. Most burn strategies have better burn cards they'll often build around that are capable of burning over 8,000 points of damage, either by themselves or with certain combos. Meanwhile, Meteor's burn is pretty small in comparison, and can't even be used to finish off an opponent because of its awkward activation requirement. But while it's unfortunate that such an important card isn't playable, it's probably for the best, as Kaiba was kinda right about certain burn cards being too powerful. At the very least, there's no denying how important Meteor was for almost assuring Marik's victory, while giving Yugioh's friendship a chance to shine. Constructed number 4 spot is Visor Des, one of Yami Marik's most brutal monsters. And that's because Visor Des is capable of tightening its grip around the head of an opponent's monster. And while the monster it's targeting is still in the field, Visor Des is incapable of being destroyed by battle. But the result of this effect differs depending on the TCG and the original version of the card, because the TCG's card effect causes the target monster to be destroyed during the 3rd standby phase after its activation, while the manga version simply reduces the targeted monster's attack by 500. Now, a lot of Yami Marik's cards were focused on the idea of torturing his opponent's monsters, because in the shadow games he would set up, one of the rules he would implement meant that a player would be forced to feel the same pain that was inflicted onto their monsters. As a result, Yami Marik's playstyle was slow and calculated, because instead of destroying his opponent and their monsters immediately, he preferred to gradually weaken them over the course of a duel to inflict as much pain as possible. But the most brutal card he used for his torture was Visor Des, a card that inflicted punishment that was so cruel it couldn't be adapted into the anime, as it would wrap around and tighten bolts into the skulls of whatever monster it was affecting. This made it a terrifying creature every time he played it, such as in his duel against Joey, where Visor Des ended up being replaced by Plasma Eel in the anime. However, the most frightening use of Visor Des was in its first appearance in Marik's shadow game against Mai Valentine, where it not only persecuted Mai's monsters, it tortured her directly, binding her alongside Visor Shock and holding her in place for the Winged Dragon of Ra's attack. But if you watch the anime, the cards that held Mai in place as Ra attacked were Holding Arms and Holding Legs, which were notably less cruel but still left Mai just as hopeless. Thankfully though, it's a lot harder to torture your opponent with cards in the modern TCG, especially with Visor Des. Its effect has always been quite slow, as it needs 3 of your standby phases to destroy a monster. And while it can't be destroyed by battle, it gives plenty of time for your opponent to figure out how to clear it from the field before its effect has a chance to be useful. However, one of Marik's torture devices did actually see competitive success, Holding Legs, which upon its release became a side deck staple for pendulum strategies, as a way to clear away your opponent's set spell and trap cards before you committed to your plays, as it was pretty much just a giant Trunade on legs. And like giant Trunade, once it activated, your opponent is forced to immediately use their back row, because if they don't, they're returned to the hand and you can perform your plays without worrying about their potential interruptions. And so while most of Marik's cruel devices have never seen competitive success, it's actually pretty cool to see Holding Legs was strong in the TCG in the exact same way that Marik used it, by clearing away my spell and trap cards in preparation for his boss monster. Oozing into number 3 is Revival Gem, Marik's most iconic slime monster that was an integral part to both his and Yami Marik's strategy. And that's because Revival Gem represented one of the themes of Marik's decks incredibly well, immortality, as whenever it was destroyed by battle, it would simply reform back to the field. In the TCG, this is represented by Revival Gem summoning itself back from the graveyard during next standby phase after it's destroyed by battle, if you pay 1,000 life points. But in the animated manga, Revival Gem will regenerate immediately, acting as an unkillable defensive option, a feat that was put on display in Yugi's duel against the Marik-controlled strings. In this duel, Marik was determined to defeat the Pharaoh and knew that by summoning out an Egyptian god card, Yugi would be left virtually defenseless. And so most of his early strategy was based around summoning out 3 slime tokens to prepare for the arrival of Slifer the Sky Dragon. The only issue was that these tokens were pretty weak, and so Yugi could easily beat over them with his stronger monsters. Which is why Marik employed several stalling tactics, including the use of Revival Gem and Gem Defender, so that whenever Yugi declared an attack on Slime Token, Marik would activate Gem Defender to switch the attack to Revival Gem, who would simply just regenerate, keeping his token safe and him enough time to summon out his Egyptian god. Slifer seemed unstoppable, and even though Yugi almost managed to defeat the god a couple of times, Revival Gem was there to immediately take the blow and revive itself, And because Marik's card is safe return, Marik would draw cards each time Revival Jam reformed, which strengthened Slifer even more. But this illusion of infinity was precisely the key to defeating Marik, because after Yugi used Monster Reborn to revive Buster Blader, he attacked Slifer only for Marik to defend with Revival Jam once more. But then Yugi activated Brain Control, taking control of Revival Jam before it regenerated and summoned it to his field, which triggered card to safe return to make Slifer even more powerful. And then this forced Slifer's second mouth attack to activate, which destroyed Revival Jam again, only for it to regenerate back to Yugi's field once more and activate card to safe return, forcing Marik to draw and Slifer's second mouth to activate to destroy Revival Jam again, forming an infinite loop. And so, even though Slifer's attack strength grew over 20,000, it couldn't attack, and Marik was forced to draw more and more cards each time Revival Jam was brought back, until he had 0 cards in his deck and couldn't draw anymore, winning Yugi the duel, and giving him his first Egyptian god card. Funnily enough, the way Yugi defeated Marik in this duel is still fairly common, as in Master Duel, if you're locked under the effects of Max C, you could choose to give your opponent infinite cards by special summoning as many times as possible to leave them with nothing in deck. However, Revival Jam isn't likely to be involved in this process, as its CG effect is a lot slower and weaker than its anime version. But at the very least, one card from Marik's infinite combo did see play. So much play that it ended up on the Forbidden Limited list in 2009, where it's remained ever since. Card of Safe Return. Because while this version of the card only drew 1 instead of 3, the effect had no once per turn. So if you were a deck that could easily revive monsters from the graveyard, you could just keep drawing cards again and again to get a ton of card advantage for free, which can be game-winningly strong, especially by today's standards where reviving cards from the graveyard is a pretty common occurrence. So it makes sense that this part of Marik's Jam strategy was the one that ended up on the ban list as an easy-to-use generic tool that, for some strategies, is basically a better pot of greed. The same can't be said for Revival Jam though, because while it led to one of Yugi's most iconic victories, it'd be impossible for the TCG version to be useful to either Marik or Yugi in the same way. Reviving into the number 2 spot is Monster Reborn, one of Marik's most feared cards, which makes sense as Monster Reborn effect is incredibly strong, allowing you to target a monster in either player's graveyard and special summon it to the field. But Yami Marik only ever had one monster in mind when using Monster Reborn, the Winged Dragon of Ra. Now, this might seem like a bad idea at first, as Ra would be summoned with 0 attack points and be forced to return to the graveyard during the end phase. But Yami Marik could read the entirety of Ra's hieratic text, which told him of Ra's secret ability. The first ability was known as point-to-point transfer, and allowed for Marik to pay all but one of his life points to transfer every point paid into Ra's attack strength, effectively fusing with the god card and allowing for Marik to perform a one-turn kill. But Ra also had a third litany which paired excellently with Reborn, Egyptian God Phoenix, which could only be used when Ra had been revived from the graveyard, and let Marik incinerate his enemies by paying 1,000 life points. These two modes put Ra above even the other Egyptian god cards. It made Reborn a genuine threat. So much so that by the end of Battle City, most of Marik's strategy was around using cards with cards like Left Arm Offering to find Reborn as quickly as possible, and Darkspell Regeneration so he could use Reborn from the graveyard. And in the TCG, Reborn is just as powerful as Marik made it out to be, but not for the same reasons. Summoning a monster from the graveyard is generally a strong effect for a card to have, as it gives you a way of using cards in the graveyard as a resource, which is why a lot of modern strategies have their own archetypal ways of reborning a monster. But very few archetypal reborns can match the strength of the original, with its main upside being its versatility and what it can revive, which was especially strong in the early days of the game, where you could either revive your own boss monster, or use your opponent's cards against them. And even in the modern day, Reborn is deemed to be so powerful that it's still limited to one copy, as it's an amazing extender that can either help play through certain hand traps, or help to build an even stronger board. Overall, Marik's obsession with Monster Reborn was justified, as it's an amazing card that can be a boon in almost every deck, but it's rarely ever going to be used to summon out an Egyptian god. Speaking of which, great beast of the sky, please hear my cry. Transform thyself, orb and sun, and on this list to be number 1. Envelop the channel with your glow and show your text so we may know. Unlock your effect from deep inside so our brains may grow wide. Appear with flame as I call your name, the Winged Dragon of Ra. Now, these weren't exactly the sacred words used to summon Ra, but in the anime, Ra's chant was an incredibly important step in actually summoning the card, because if you couldn't, Ra would just remain in its sphere mode. The anime and TCG versions of these cards have some major differences, but the things they both have in common are they both need 3 tributes. Its point-to-point transfer ability, and its Egyptian God Phoenix effects, which allows you to pay 1,000 life points to send a monster in the field to the graveyard. But in the anime, Ra being an Egyptian god gave it access to a ton of powerful protections, and even an extra effect which allowed it to gain the attack and defense points of the monsters used for its tribute summon.
But it's all of these effects combined that made Ra a near unstoppable force, and one that was deadly in Marik's hands. Ra was his ultimate monster and was game-ending almost every time it appeared in any one of its forms. Whether in the sphere mode that allowed for Marik's victory over Mai, as an immortal phoenix that almost killed both Bakura and Joey, or as the sun god Ra who Yami Marik would fuse with to launch all of his hatred directly towards the pharaoh. But Ra was more than just a regular monster, it was a god, whose rage could be cast into those that misused the card. Such as Marik's adopted older brother, Odeon, who was forced to use a counterfeit copy of Ra in his duel against Joey Wheeler. The counterfeit copy enraged Ra, and caused it to launch its judgment directly into Odeon, causing him to fall into a coma. And Odeon was the last bastion that was holding back the twisted alter ego that had been born after the tortured Marik endured to become a Toonkeeper. The same alter ego that killed Marik's father. And so, when Odeon fell, Yami Marik had the opportunity to take over and inflict the same suffering that Marik had endured unto his enemies. Now, in the TCG, Ra doesn't hold the same godly powers that it had in the anime, so it's unlikely the card is going to cause you to be struck down if you misuse it. But it's pretty hard to use Ra in the right way, because even amongst the Egyptian gods, Ra isn't an amazing card. While it can be a decent OTK tool with a solid removal effect, it requires a ton of investment to actually summon, especially since it's the only god card that can't be special summoned by regular means. And what's worse is that Ra's one-turn kill capabilities isn't really that unique, as there are a ton of different ways to OTK an opponent without needing to spend your normal summon on Ra. Meanwhile, Obelisk managed to see play because of its target protection, and Slifer's second mouth effect can sometimes floodgate certain strategies out of the game. However, there is one form of Ra that's actually become a staple of modern strategies and played in a ton of different side decks as a way to easily clear the field of your opponent's monsters. The Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. Because Sphere Mode can let you normal summon it to your opponent's side of the field by tributing their monsters, essentially forcing them to summon Ra without knowing the chant. This replaces your opponent's boss monsters and interactions with a ball that does virtually nothing, and is capable of breaking an opponent's entire board by itself. Not every deck can run Sphere Mode because it requires you to give up your normal summon to use, but any deck that can play Sphere Mode should, as it gives you a tool to make going second incredibly easy, and was once so feared that people were once even willing to play the original Ra in their deck just so they could actually use the ball for something. Overall though, it's genuinely cool to see that such an important monster from the anime has managed to become one of the most feared going second staples in the modern age, with a status that's lived up to its game-ending nature, letting your opponent feel Ra's judgment, even if it's not in the form that most people expected. Whether as an Egyptian priest or the head of his own company, Seto Kaiba has stood as Yugi's eternal rival, and one of the only duelists capable of keeping up with the king of games, opposing Yugi's belief in the heart of the cards by instead believing in the objective strength of his deck, and his skill as a duelist. And it's for this reason that Kaiba is so iconic and well loved, because no matter how arrogant he is, Kaiba always has the dueling strength and coolness factor to back it up. Which is why we're going to look at Kaiba's 10 most iconic cards, how Kaiba used their strength to his advantage, and whether or not the power actually holds up in the real-life game. And snapping into number 10 is La Jin, Mystical Genie of the Lamp, one of Kaiba's earliest beatsticks who also showcased Kaiba's tactical ability. As a beater, La Jin has an amazing stat line for a level 4 monster, with an impressive 1800 attack, which for a while made it one of the strongest low-level monsters in the anime, dwarfing some of the other iconic level beaters like Alligator Sword, a Gazelle, and even some of Kaiba's other strong monsters like BattleLogs. This made La Jin an absolute powerhouse, with it becoming an even stronger tool after the events of Duelist Kingdom, since, unlike some of the other high attack monsters in Kaiba's deck, La Jin didn't need a tribute to be brought out. But Kaiba didn't just use La Jin as a strong beatstick, he also used it tactically, by combining its strength with Ancient Lamp, a card that not only let Kaiba summon La Jin, but also allowed him to act as a powerful defensive wall capable of redirecting the attacks of your opponent's monsters towards their allies. Which turned out to be an important tool in Kaiba's second duel against Yugi, where La Jin and Ancient Lamp managed to take down the comparatively stronger Curse of Dragon, by redirecting the attack of Yugi's Dark Magician. But La Jin and Ancient Lamp's most iconic moment was in Kaiba's duel against his father, Gozaburo Kaiba, where they both were integral for the defeat of Exodia Necros, since Ancient Lamp allowed for La Jin to be summoned to the field to provide enough tributes for Blue-Eyes White Dragon, and La Jin's Fiend typing allowed for Kaiba to activate Soul Demolition, banishing all of the Exodia pieces from the graveyard to reduce the attack of Necros to 0, leaving it vulnerable to an attack, ultimately allowing for him to defeat his cruel adoptive father, and putting his awful childhood to rest. Unfortunately, La Jin and Ancient Lamp were never really as versatile in the actual card game, but both managed to see some minor success. Ancient Lamp was used in classic Monarch strategies as a way to ensure you have a tribute on your follow-up turn by using its redirect effect as a defensive option. And Lajin was once the best normal summon in the game due to its high stat line, which, just like in the anime, made it a solid offensive threat in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! That was hard to contest. But as a pair, they've never really been played together. Ancient Lamp's Swarmian effect is definitely a cute reference to the genie, but it's too niche to really be useful. Especially because one of Lajin's strengths was that it was already easy to bring out to the field with a normal summon. But at the very least, it's really cool that both Lajin and Ancient Lamp saw play in the TCG for similar reasons to why Kaiba used them in the anime, with Ancient Lamp being a defensive option and Lajin being one of the game's primary offensive threats. But of course, only Seto Kaiba would have the genius to combine these two strengths into one strategy. And plugging into number 9 is Enemy Controller, one of Kaiba's most iconic quick play spells that came in clutch in the Battle City finals. And a huge part of that is because of Econ's modularity and adaptability, which is evident in the TCG version of the card, which allows you to activate one of two effects, making it so that you can either change the battle position of an opponent's monster, or allow you to tribute one of your own monsters to take control of an opponent's. This is actually a simpler and nerfed version of the card in the anime, which required you to pay 1000 life points and enter a specific code to activate an effect. If you input up, down, left, right, A, Enemy Controller will cause a monster to destroy itself. If you input left, right, A, B, you can use Econ's effect to take control of an opponent's monster. And it's the second effect that made it such a useful tool in Kaiba's deck during Battle City, as he would use Enemy Controller in order to get an extra monster to tribute to threaten summoning either Blue-Eyes White Dragon or the almighty Obelisk the Tormentor. Something that Yugi managed to delay in his Battle City duel against Kaiba, as after he used Change of Heart to steal Kaiba's X-Head Cannon, Kaiba then stole back his monster ready to summon his Egyptian God card. And it was only through a lucky hit off of Light Force Sword that Yugi managed to temporarily stop Obelisk from entering the field. He also used the card in the runner-up duel against Joey Wheeler, stealing Joey's little wing guard and combining it with Cost Down to tribute summon Blue-Eyes White Dragon from his hand. But in this duel, Econ's modularity was his downfall, because after Joey used the effect of Grave Robber to steal it, he inputted the Destroy code to blow up Kaiba's Blue Eyes, which, even though it was used against Kaiba, managed to prove how versatile the card could be. And it's this versatility that has allowed Econ to see a ton of competitive play in the TCG ever since its release, even though it's a weaker version of its anime counterpart. Its first effect is a neat battle trick that can be used to stop an opponent's attack. This can be important for conserving your life points, but stopping an attack also prevents certain effects from activating, or stopping your opponent from accessing a Zeus. But it's Econ's mind control effect that's the most relevant. Like other mind control cards, it's a great going second tool, and one that can force an opponent's interactions because otherwise you'd steal their boss monster to use its effects, or to use it as material for a summon just like what Kaiba did. And it's even great for going first because you can just set Enemy Controller to use it like a trap card during your opponent's turn to steal one of their combo pieces, before they have a chance to use the monster for an extra deck play, making it a really powerful interruption and one that's sometimes capable of ending an opponent's turn by itself. In general, Enemy Controller has a near infinite potential use, and the modularity has been an important tool in a ton of different strategies over the years, with its most powerful effect being its mind control ability, allowing you to steal an opponent's monster and then use it for your own gain. Which is precisely how Kaiba used Econ in the anime, and while most decks aren't summoning an Egyptian god, its strength in the TCG manages to mirror its anime counterpart, even despite being nerfed. And drawn to number 8 is Card Demise, Kaiba's best comeback card that's been an integral tool for his victory in some of his most important duels. Just like Enemy Controller, Demise has two versions, the busted anime version and the comparatively tamer TCG version. The TCG version allows you to draw cards until you have 3 cards in your hand, but comes with a ton of downsides that prevents every deck from using it. Your opponent can't take damage for the rest of the turn, you can't special summon monsters for the entire turn, and you have to discard your entire hand during the end phase. The anime version, though, allows you to draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, with the only downside being that you have to discard your entire hand during your 5th standby phase after you use it. Which isn't really a harsh downside because it's unlikely this effect will ever resolve, since it's pretty easy to finish at most duels within 5 turns. A fact that Kaiba used to his advantage because in the anime, Kaiba only ever had to discard once for Card Demise during the Pyramid of Light movie, which actually ended up being a benefit anyways because it further increased the attack of Blue-Eyes Shiny Dragon. But of course, the main benefit of Card Demise was it allowed for Kaiba to draw a ton of cards to stage an insane comeback, with its most important use being in Kaiba's last duel against Siegfried von Schroeder, the head of Kaiba Corporation's rival company that aimed to humiliate Kaiba and ruin Kaiba Corp's stock price, so that he and Schroeder Corp would be the #1 games company in the world. Kaiba wasn't going to let this happen, and dueled Siegfried to officially disqualify him from the KC Cup. And although Siegfried got extremely close to winning with his Valkyrie strategy, Kaiba managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat with Card Demise, which allowed him to draw 5 cards, which were enough to set up his Banish Zone and grab Dimension Fusion from his graveyard, so he could summon out his Blue-Eyes White Dragons and Chaos Emperor Dragon to attack for game. And this way of using Demise is really similar to how it's actually used in the TCG, and has given people the chance to drown in an overwhelming advantage so as long as they have few cards in their hand,
which is why you'll see decks that play Demise committing their entire hand to the field so they can get as much advantage as they can out of a single activation. But because of the differences between the anime and the TCG version of this card, not every deck can play Demise, since it prevents you from special summoning at all, and its end phase effects means that you're guaranteed to lose every card in your hand. But that didn't stop a ton of different control strategies from playing it anyway, since it was virtually guaranteed to net you a ton of card advantage. And it was well worth the commitment of its downsides in decks like True Draco, which didn't need to special summon at all, and Cosmo, which could special summon during your opponent's turn, which let this nerfed version of Demise being limited in 2020. It's definitely not surprising that one of Kaiba's most busted comeback cards received such heavy nerfs in the TCG, but unlike other insane card draws like Card of Sanctity, Demise's nerfs weren't enough to stop it from being insanely powerful in the TCG, and one that definitely showcases that Kaiba knew what he was talking about when it came to strong cards. And pillaging into number 7 is Vorse Raider, one of Kaiba's strongest low-level monsters that act as one of Kaiba's most prominent offensive threats. And that's because, like Lajin, Vorse Raider was an incredibly strong, low-level beatstick that really represented Kaiba's belief in power, standing at an insanely powerful 1900 attack. This made Vorse Raider a powerful tool for Kaiba to use as an immediately strong monster that opponents would struggle to overcome due to its sheer attack power, and one that gave Kaiba a solid advantage in the early game of duels. Essentially, it was the truest definition of a beatstick. But, as we saw with Lajin, while Kaiba admired the pure power of his monsters, he wasn't dumb, and found a ton of creative, ingenious ways to use his vanilla beater. And its most interesting use being in Kaiba's Battle City duel against Ishizu, where he used Shrink on his own Vorse Raider in order to make it meet the requirements to activate Crush Card Virus. And once again, Kaiba's intelligent use of this card is really similar to why it's being played in the TCG. You see, by the time Vorse Raider had actually been released in the real-life card game, the days of caveman Yu-Gi-Oh were over, which meant that for a while, Vorse Raider never lived up to the offensive threat that it could have been. But after the release of Rescue Rabbit, Vorse Raider skyrocketed in use, becoming a meta threat in decks like Fire Fist, which appreciated Vorse Raider being a normal beast warrior with decent stats that they could use to instantly set up rank 4 plays. Although what really brought Vorse Raider over the edge was its dark typing. You see, since it was dark, Vorse Raider was a valid target for Deck Devastation Virus, a trap card similar to Crush Card Virus that is capable of wiping out all monsters in your opponent's hand or field with 1500 or less attack, which could devastate certain strategies. The other normal Beast Warrior target was Earth, so it couldn't be used as Deck Devastation Virus. But because Vorse Raider was dark, if you managed to increase its attack by 100 points with something like a Fire Formation 10 key, you'd actually get to mirror Kaiba almost exactly, and absolutely decimate an opponent's deck. For a card with 0 effects, it's impressive how important Vorse Raider was in its particular niche, and even though lesser duelists may have treated Vorse Raider as a beatstick, those that were capable of thinking like Kaiba managed to find a use for this classic vanilla monster that manages to recapture its coolest moments in the anime. And biting into number 6 is the Fang of Critias, one of the 3 legendary dragon cards that chose heroes to wield them to defeat the evil of the Orichalcos. Timaeus chose Yugi, Hermos chose Joey, and Critias chose Seto Kaiba, which turned out to be an excellent choice because the Fang of Critias lets you combine its power with a trap card, letting you send a trap card from your hand or field to the graveyard to summon a powerful fusion boss monster with an effect similar to the send trap. This led to Critias being an important part of Kaiba's strategy during the Orichalcos arc, after he'd been chosen by the legendary dragon in his first duel against the Orichalcos agent, Alistair, who almost wiped out Kaiba after stealing 2 of his Blue-Eyes White Dragons. But after a vision of Critias, Kaiba drew the legendary dragon and combined it with his Crush Card Virus to form Doom Virus Dragon, wiping Alistair's field and giving him a chance to counterattack before the duel ended in a draw. But the most important use of Critias was of course in Kaiba and Yugi's tag duel against Darts, where it was used to signify the trust held between the two rivals by combining Critias with Yugi's Mirror Force to form Mirror Force Dragon to wipe out Dart's Mirror Knights. But that's not all, because within this same duel, the Fang of Critias was eventually banished by Yugi with a Legend of Heart after Kaiba's defeat to bring out Legendary Knight Critias, alongside Hermos and Timaeus, all of which were integral in defeating Darts' infinite attack Divine Serpent Ga. Now unfortunately, in the TCG, the Fang of Critias never quite reached the legendary status it had in the anime, because while the effect of each of the dragons it could bring out were solid and mirrored the power of the trap cards they were based on, it was just a lot easier to use the trap cards themselves rather than trying to force out the fusion monsters. This meant that even the extremely powerful Doom Virus Dragon, whose effects mirrors Crush Card Virus before its errata, has never seen any actual play. Because while its effect can be game-winning, it's just a lot easier to set up Crush Card Virus and a suitable tribute rather than hoping to draw it alongside Critias. And even Critias' most modern fusion monster, Destruction Dragon, is actively worse than just plain Ring of Destruction itself, because Destruction Dragon's effect is spell speed 1 and can't be used during your opponent's turn. So unless you happen to be chosen by Critias, each of its forms are going to be fairly difficult to bring out.
Still, there's no denying that despite Critias's lackluster TCG performance, it was still an amazing tool in Kaiba's arsenal that, in his own words, was comparable to an Egyptian god, and one that was necessary to defeat the Orichalcos. And far enough, number 5 is XYZ Dragon Cannon, another mini-boss in Kaiba's toolbox that acted as his main machine-based menace. And for good reason, because XYZ Dragon Cannon is the ultimate formation of X Head Cannon, Y Dragon Head, and Z Metal Tank, and is one of the first fusion monsters in the game that didn't need polymerization, with its summoning condition instead requiring you to banish each of its component parts from the field. You can't special summon from your graveyard, but with no once per turn, you can't discard a card to target any card your opponent controls and destroy it, making it a really impressive removal option for its era. An option that Kaiba used to great effect against the likes of Pegasus in the Pyramid of Light movie, and Alistair in the Orichalcos arc. But Kaiba's coolest use of Dragon Cannon was definitely in its first appearance in the Battle City Finals, where he showed off the modularity of the light machines, combining them to form the Dragon Cannon and wiped out Yugi's Big Shield Gardna. And then, after Light Force Sword had returned Obelisk to his hand, he sacrificed Dragon Cannon as 3 monsters in accordance with Battle City rules in order to bring out his Egyptian god card. But despite how cool Dragon Cannon and its associated pieces were, they themselves haven't really seen any actual play in the TCG. Each of the individual pieces have lackluster effects, and it's difficult to bring each one of them out to the field to access their combo forms. But even though X, Y, and Z aren't that amazing in the TCG, there are still a number of ways you can embody Kaiba's use of this trio. In speed duels, these monsters were a meta threat when paired with Kaiba's Skill Union combination, which allowed you to banish the materials needed for your fusion monsters from the graveyard rather than the field, giving you a whole host of powerful removal options from your extra deck. Meanwhile, in the TCG, X, Y, and Z have a sister series of light machines composed of A. Assault Core, B. Buster Drake, and C. Crush Wyvern, who, just like X, Y, and Z, combine to form the incredible ABC Buster Dragon. And this strategy has actually seen a ton of competitive play in the modern era due to how easy ABC is to access, since it also allows you to banish materials from the graveyard as well as the field, but also due to its 2 amazing effects, each of which mirror how Kaiba used Dragon Cannon in the anime, with its first effect being a great removal option for your opponent's cards, and its second effect even allowing you to special summon out its component parts as if you were activating Dimension Fusion or Return from the different dimension, giving you enough materials to summon an Egyptian god. So despite X, Y, and Z not having seen any real competitive play in the TCG, it's really cool that their ideas and themes are still alive in the modern meta, since they're so well represented in ABC. And even though it's unlikely you'll be summoning XYZ Dragon Cannon anytime soon, these cards still allow you to mirror Kaiba's machine menace. Exploding into number 4 is Ring of Destruction, one of Kaiba's strongest trap cards that show that he was willing to risk anything to win a duel, including his own life points. Because Ring of Destruction allows you to, during your opponent's turn, target and destroy one face-up monster your opponent controls, whose attack is equal to or lower than their life points. Then you take damage equal to that monster's attack, and then after that, the same happens to your opponent. This is slightly different to its anime counterpart due to the number of erratas the TCG Ring of Destruction has received over the years, with the anime ring letting you activate it during either player's turn, target any monster on the field, and makes it so that both players take the damage at the exact same time. And as a result, Ring was a really important part of Kaiba's toolbox, because it allowed him to remove some of his opponent's strongest boss monsters, all while burning a decent chunk of their life points. But Ring is also somewhat reckless, because it burned both players, which meant that if Kaiba wasn't thinking properly, there was a chance that he could lose duels to his own card. But Seto Kaiba is a smart duelist, and so often paired Ring of Destruction with Ring of Defense, which protected Kaiba's life points while still letting Ring of Destruction destroy and burn their opponent. This combo was used a few times in the series, but featured most prominently in the 4-way duel between Yugi, Kaiba, Marik, and Joey, where Kaiba attempted to use Ring of Destruction on Joey's Axe Raider, while protecting his own life points with Ring of Defense, so that Joey would lose the duel so to be more likely that he and Yugi would face off in the finals. Now, in the TCG, this Kaiba patented combo was never really too relevant, because it's a specific 2-card combo that's only going to be really useful in really niche situations. And what's worse is that the TCG version of Ring of Defense protects both players' life points, not just your own. But this never stopped Ring of Destruction from seeing competitive play by itself, and in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! It was one of the strongest trap cards in the game, since it could either be used to destroy an opponent's boss monster, or just end the game outright by burning your opponent for a ton of damage, or sometimes both at the same time, just like how Kaiba would use the card in the anime. And this meant that, for most of his life, Ring existed permanently on the Forbidden Limited list all the way up until 2015, where the card received an errata that made it a lot worse. This errata didn't make the card entirely useless, but it changed a lot about what Ring of Destruction's so strong. You couldn't target a monster with an attack that was higher than your opponent's life points, nor could you target your own monsters either, which made it a lot harder for Ring to close out games with its burn effect. and because of the way its burn now applied, you had to take the damage before your opponent, which meant the card could no longer end duels in a draw, and could even potentially lose you the duel if you activate it while your life points were low. This led to Ring becoming a shell of its former self. It has never really reached the same height of competitive play as it saw prior to its errata, with it only really popping up in niche burn strategies like Trickstar and Mystic Mine. But even though Ring is a lot weaker nowadays, you can still technically use it as Kaiba did in the anime, since it still lets you burn or remove an opponent's monster from the field. And there's no denying the legacy that Ring had on the TCG as one of the strongest early trap cards in the game. But Kaiba actually has multiple trap cards that were so busted that they had to receive an errata, such as the next card on this list. And infecting the number 3 spot is Crush Card Virus, Kaiba's strongest trap card that allowed him to destroy an opponent's entire deck. Now, Crush Card actually has multiple different versions depending on which series of the anime you're watching and what era you're looking at. But in the TCG, Crush Card Virus lets you tribute a dark monster you control with 1000 or less attack, so that you can look at all cards in your opponent's hand and all monsters on their field to destroy every monster your opponent has with 1500 or more attack. But your opponent takes no damage until the end of the next turn after Crush Card Virus resolves, and also lets your opponent destroy 3 monsters in their deck with 1500 or more attack. This is very different to Kaiba's anime version, which instead infected a dark monster you control with 1000 less attack with the virus, so that when the monster was destroyed by battle, it would infect an opponent's deck. It would not only destroy every monster in their hand and on the field with 1500 less attack, it would also destroy those monsters in their deck as well. Now, in the anime, Kaiba often made fun of weaker monsters, but even he was willing to play monsters with low stats, such as Sagi the Dark Clown, purely just to facilitate Crush Card Virus. Which made perfect sense because the moment Crush Card was used, every strong monster in your opponent's deck would be sent to the graveyard. To Kaiba, this meant that your opponent would only have weak monsters left in their deck, all of which would fall to his overpowered monsters. A strategy that proved fruitful in his Duelist Kingdom duel against Yugi, where Crush Card destroyed the likes of Gaia the Fierce Knight alongside every other monster in Yugi's deck, pushing the King of Games into a corner and forcing him to rely on his weak monsters to try and win in the face of the Blue-Eyes Ultimate Dragon. But as powerful as Crush Card Virus was in the anime, there were also a number of times where it was turned against Kaiba, like in his duel against Ishizu Ishtar in Battle City, where after Kaiba had resolved Crush Card Virus, Ishizu used Exchange of the Spirit to leave Kaiba with only 6 cards left in his deck. And funnily enough, in the modern TCG, Crush Card Virus can be used against you, but in a different way to the anime, where instead of the effect being turned around onto you, like it was in Kaiba, your opponent will instead just gain a huge advantage by being allowed to foolish any 3 cards from their deck, letting them access a bunch of powerful graveyard effects. But this wasn't always how Crush Card Virus worked, because prior to its errata, it not only destroyed monsters in your opponent's hand and field, it also destroyed every card your opponent drew for 3 turns after it resolved, and didn't give your opponent a chance to destroy a card in their deck. This made Crush Card Virus absurd in the early days of the game, because even though it didn't destroy your opponent's deck, it would eviscerate every strong monster your opponent had on the field or in their hand and kept them locked under a pseudo floodgate for 3 turns. That meant if they drew any powerful monster, it was just immediately sent to the graveyard. Which, for as oppressive as the card was, fits the same purpose that Kaiba used it for in the anime, depleting your opponent of every powerful resource they had and forcing your opponent to rely on weak cards. However, because of its 2015 errata, Crush Card Virus no longer sees any real competitive play. Even though it has the potential to win you games, giving your opponent a chance to foolish 3 monsters for free is just too big of a downside. But for a time, Crush Card Virus is one of the strongest and most oppressive cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And crushing into number 2 is Obelisk the Tormentor, Seto Kaiba's signature Egyptian god card. Like Slifer, Obelisk's TCG version has a ton of effects designed to mirror the strength of its anime version. It requires 3 tributes and normal summon, its normal summon can't be negated, and neither player can activate cards or effects in response to that summon. Additionally, neither player can target Obelisk with card effects, and you can tribute 2 monsters and activate Obelisk's signature attack, Fist of Fury, by tributing 2 monsters you control, which destroys all monsters your opponent controls. But Obelisk can't attack the turn you use the effect. And Obelisk comes with the same downside as Slifer, where during the end phase, if it was special summoned, you have to send it to the graveyard. Now, just like the other Egyptian gods, the TCG version of Obelisk is a lot weaker than its anime counterpart, because in the anime, Obelisk had a ton of other protections and effects that made it an absurdly overpowered boss monster, and one that only other Egyptian god cards were capable of defeating, which is why Obelisk was deemed worthy enough by Kaiba to be his deck's main boss monster throughout the Battle City arc, because unlike Yugi, who only used Slifer when necessary due to its immense strength, Kaiba constantly summoned out Obelisk throughout the arc in order to test its power, even against random no-name duelists. And each and every time, Obelisk proved why it was worthy of holding the title of an Egyptian god, giving the strength-obsessed Kaiba a taste of the power of the gods. As a result, Obelisk has a ton of iconic moments throughout the series. from its first appearance against Kaiba's dueling robot to Kaiba's duel against Ishizu. But out of all of them, Obelisk's coolest moment came from Kaiba's duel against Yugi in the Battle City semifinals, where we got to see Obelisk the Tormentor face off against Slifer the Sky Dragon, where the two gods collided, destroying each other in the process, and causing both Yugi and Kaiba to see a glimpse of their ancient Egyptian past. Now, out of the 3 original Egyptian god cards, Obelisk is an anomaly in that it actually managed to see a decent amount of competitive play. You see, in the Dragon Ruler format, Obelisk was able to live up to its status as an Egyptian god due to its targeting protection. This, combined with its insanely high attack stat, made it so that the Dragon Rulers actually struggled to out the card, as their main sources of removal happened to target, and even their highest attack monsters couldn't stand up to Obelisk's mighty 4000 attack, which is really cool that, even if only for a brief time, Obelisk was able to be the ultimate boss monster that Kaiba in the anime made it out to be, even if it was only for one specific format. But overall, Obelisk is a great representation of Kaiba's love of powerful cards, and one whose strength actually managed to transfer over to the TCG. But there is still one more card that represents Kaiba's love of strength even better than Obelisk, so much so that he was willing to sacrifice a god to summon it. And burst into the number 1 spot is Dark Magician's eternal rival, Blue-Eyes White Dragon, Kaiba's ultimate ace monster who holds the spirit of Kisara within it. Blue-Eyes needs no introduction as it's one of the most iconic cards in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a level 8 vanilla beatstick with 3000 attack and 2500 defense, and doesn't have any effect due to it being a normal monster, and instead has flavor text that describes it as a virtually invincible monster. A statement that Kaiba truly believed as he constantly used Blue-Eyes throughout the series as his main boss monster, using its power to eviscerate lesser monsters and duelists alike, and believed in the power of Blue-Eyes so much that he was even willing to steal and tear up Solomon Moto's copy of the card, leaving only 3 copies left in the world, all of which belonged to Kaiba. Just so that the Blue-Eyes' power could never be used against him, because to Kaiba, Blue-Eyes represented distilled strength and his pride as a duelist, and he had so much faith in that pride that he dedicated a large portion of his deck purely around summoning and supporting as many Blue-Eyes White Dragons as possible, with the likes of Lord of D with Flute of Summoning Dragon, Kaiser Seahorse, and even Cost Down all to facilitate to summon out the Engine of Destruction. But strangely enough, despite Kaiba's obsession with strength, Blue-Eyes was more than just a monster to him, and he actually held a similar respect for Blue-Eyes as a partner that mirrors Yugi's respect for the Dark Magician. Because Blue-Eyes not only represents Kaiba's bond to his brother Mokuba, it also contained the spirit of Kisara, a slave that Priest Seto had freed who pledged her spirit to him in her death, who would go on to serve Priest Seto and the modern-day Kaiba as the Blue-Eyes White Dragon. And these ideas of strength and spirit become one whenever Kaiba fuses each of his Blue-Eyes monsters into Blue-Eyes Ultimate Dragon, the combination of the spirits of Kisara, Priest Seto, and Seto Kaiba himself that was even capable of standing up to Zork. And strangely enough, this power is well represented in the TCG, because not only have there been moments where Blue-Eyes was meta, it was once the undisputed best deck of the format, so much so that it actually ended up winning a Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship in 2016. And funnily enough, the way this championship was won was due to a monster that you would summon by combining the strength of Blue-Eyes with Kisara. Blue-Eyes Spear Dragon, a monster with a ton of effects that included a floodgate to stop 2 or more monsters from being summoned at the same time, which countered pendulum strategies, a graveyard negate which countered Burning Abyss, and even a tag out effect which could summon an Azure Eyes Silver Dragon from your extra deck, which allowed you to more easily bring the vanilla Blue-Eyes to the field. And it was its effects combined that not only countered the other best decks of the format, but allowed for Blue-Eyes White Dragon to have its own crowning moment as one of Yu-Gi-Oh's only World Championship worthy decks. Overall though, Blue-Eyes White Dragon is an icon of both the anime and card game itself, and just like Yugi's Dark Magician, showcases how strong the bonds between a card and a duelist can be. And this bond is one that a lot of people in the real life game form with the Blue-Eyes, because to a lot of people, while Blue-Eyes does represent pure strength, it's also a fond reminder of their childhood, and just how cool Seto Kaiba is. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has changed a lot since the first season of the anime, with the game having grown steadily more complex and cards more powerful as time went on. But even with this persistent power creep, Yami Yugi has remained as loyal to his cards as they have to him, no matter the era or timeline. Whether he's facing gods in Battle City, forging bonds beyond time, or exploring the dark side of dimensions, he's always treated his cards more like loyal companions instead of just creatures, and has inspired thousands of real-life duelists to do the same. So in this video, we're going to go over the 10 most important cards in Yugi's decks, how they were used in the anime or manga, and whether or not these cards have had any kind of impact on the real-life Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame. And swarming in at number 10, we have Kuriboh, Yugi's favorite furball that managed to prove their worth despite how often they were mocked for being the weakest monster in the game by the likes of Pegasus, Kaiba, and even My Valentine. And looking at Kuriboh, You'd probably agree with him because it has a terrible stat line of only 300 attack and 200 defense, which made it pitifully weak even against the Duelist Kingdom era, where just about every other monster in the game dwarfed it. But Karibo was always more than just its stats, since it also has an effect in both the anime and the card game, which allows you to discard it from your hand during the damage calculation of a battle where your opponent's monster declared an attack, to make it so that you don't take any damage from that battle. This effect was used a bunch in the anime in order to save Yugi's life points in dire situations, which gave the Pharaoh an extra turn to try and fight back. This was an integral part in the Battle City semifinals against Kaiba in order to protect Yami from Obelisk's onslaught, and was ultimately one of the deciding factors that allowed for Yugi to win that duel and go on to face Marik. But that's not the only way Karibo defended Yugi's life points, because it actually had a few hidden abilities and potential that only Yugi could see, and was specifically strong when paired with Multiply, a card which was capable of swarming an infinite number of Karibos to create an impenetrable wall that no monster could break. This was especially effective when paired with Karibo's ability to detonate on contact with an opponent's monster, to either weaken them or destroy them outright, which ended up being pretty much the entire reason that Yami was able to deal with the Pegasus Thousand Eyes Restrict to save his grandpa. Essentially, Karibo was supposed to represent the idea that even though a card might appear weak at first, a smart duelist that cares about their cards is going to find a way to use it to its full potential, an idea that's still incredibly important to Yu-Gi-Oh! To this day, which is why probably every protagonist to date has had their own Karibo variant in either the anime or in the manga, to show off how weak cards can have a huge impact. Although, despite how iconic Karibo is for representing this ideal, the card never really made too much of a splash in the TCG, with Karibo itself only having seen competitive play in old Chaos strategies as a dark monster that could easily find its way to the graveyard for you to later banish for something like a Chaos Sorcerer. But other than in Chaos, Karibo itself has never seen any competitive play. Multiply might generate you a ton of tokens, but it's an unreliable 2-card combo, and there are other cards which can do a way better job of protecting your life points. Though most play it saw was probably in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, as stopping the damage from one attack from the hand was actually a pretty good effect in certain stall decks. With only 3 monster zones and before stronger X-Deck monsters came out, sometimes you only needed to stop one attack per turn in order to make it to your next turn. And with the plethora of back or removal options that people had in their decks, cards that could stop attacks from the hand did have some value. However, a ton of different Karibo variants, counterparts, and evolutions keep popping up within the TCG metagame, whether it's Sangan in older formats, Kari Bandit in Burning Abyss, or Link Karibo during Spiral's Tier 0 reign. Karibo has always managed to keep reappearing in some way, shape, or form to guide and assist new generations of duelists just like how it aided Yugi. At times, even Yugi doubted Karibo, but no matter how often it was mocked or made fun of, he was an incredibly important part of Yugi's deck, and one that was responsible for winning him tons of duels, as a monster, as a deckmaster, and even as a friend. And while in the TCG it lacks the versatility that it had in the anime, Karibo and his variants still managed to find a way into the decks of duelists everywhere to show that even the weakest monsters have their strengths. Lighting the way to number 9 is Swords of Revealing Light, the first spell card that Yugi ever activated in the anime, and one that saved him from defeat a ton of different times on different occasions. Because what this card does is lock your opponent's monsters under its light and prevents them from being able to attack, but only for 3 turns, because during the end phase of your opponent's 3rd turn after you activate it, the swords destroy themselves. This is the most iconic effect of Swords, but it also comes with a lesser known effect when you activate it, which causes all set monsters your opponent controls to be flipped face up, revealing your opponent's hidden tricks. This second effect proved incredibly useful in Yugi's duel against Panic, who hid his monsters in the darkness of the duel field where Swords of Revealing Light managed to clear away the darkness. But of course, Swords of Revealing Light is best known as Yugi's main stall tool, and one that he'd activate in the face of impossible odds after opponent had brought out their boss monster, in order to give himself 3 more turns to try and turn the duel around, trusting that the heart of the cards will eventually draw him to what he needs to defeat whatever insurmountable odds his opponent has set up. And the most famous example of this is when Yugi activated Swords in the first duel of the anime, locking Kaiba's 2 Blue-Eyes White Dragons from being able to attack as he scraped through his deck for a way to win the duel, stalling out until he realized the power of his grandpa's cards, and eventually drawing into the 5 pieces of the unstoppable Exodia. In the actual game, Swords Revealing Light isn't as effective of a staple as the anime would have you believe, since there are a ton of different ways to remove it from the field, and even if it resolves, it doesn't stop your opponent from actually building their board in the first place. Which is why it's so surprising that there have actually been a couple of times where Swords has been competitively viable, for the exact same reasons that Yugi would use it in the anime, to stop your opponent's boss monster from ending the game while also guaranteeing that you remain alive for a few more turns so that you can draw into your outs. This was important when Gladiator Beast was seeing competitive success, since it was a way to stop the Gladiator Beast from being able to battle and declare their effects.
But even in the modern competitive games, Swords Revealing Light still sees play in runic stun strategies to floodgate the opponent out of ending the game by battle while accumulating a ton of free advantage from fountain draws. In the anime, Swords Revealing Light was a safety net that Yugi could cast in just about every situation that gave him enough turns to make a comeback. And while this effect is a lot more niche in the TCG, decks that can play swords genuinely appreciate its ability to stall the game so they can draw to their deck's versions of Exodia, which shows that even the most competitive decks out there still need to believe in the heart of the cards. And charging into number 8 is Gaia the Fierce Knight, a warrior monster that came in clutch for Yugi several times due to the number of different forms he could take. By himself, Gaia is just a vanilla monster that requires 2 tributes. And while its attack stat is decently high, it pales in comparison to a ton of other 2-tribute vanilla monsters. But for what Gaia lacked in offensive power, he makes up for in his adaptability. You see, in the anime and manga, while Gaia was a powerhouse, he grew even stronger if you managed to evolve him into a new form in the middle of the duel. The most common way Yugi did this was by fusing Gaia with Curse of Dragon to form Gaia the Dragon Champion, a vanilla fusion monster that had an impressive 2600 attack stat that was capable of packing a punch, and appeared as the focus as one of the most iconic moments in the Duelist Kingdom arc, where Yugi launched the Dragon Champion with Catapult Turtle into Panic's Castle of Dark Illusions to crush his monsters after the Sword of Revealing Light had dissipated. But the Dragon Champion wasn't the only form that Gaia took, because the other evolved form of Gaia occurs after the Blackluster ritual occurs so that he becomes the Blackluster Soldier, one of Yugi's most powerful cards with an attack and strength that matches the Blue-Eyes White Dragon. Now, just like in the anime, Gaia by himself has never seen a sustained amount of competitive success. But there are actually quite a few cards that are either linked to or evolved from Gaia that have had a metagame impact, with the best by far being Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning. Envoy of the Beginning was an insane boss monster for any strategy playing Chaos attributed monsters, since it can act as removal for your opponent's monsters by banishing them, or could just OTK an opponent outright with its double attack. And thankfully for this BLS, you didn't need to perform a ritual summon, nor did you need the original Gaia to bring it out, as all of the power of the BLS came at a small cost of banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard to summon him. In both the anime and the game itself, Gaia is definitely not the strongest card on this list, but was one of the first monsters in the game that showed us the strength of using one monster as material for another, whether that's for a fusion, synchro, Xyz, a link, or a ritual monster. And without Gaia, there is no Dragon Champion, and there's no BLS, which definitely makes him one of the most important pieces of the puzzle that is Yugi's deck. And thundering into number 7 is the Summoned Skull, a key member of the Archfiend archetype that actually holds the title of Yugi's first ace monster. Summoned Skull is another vanilla beatstick, much like Gaia, but is specifically notable in the TCG for being a level 6 monster, which made it an impressive boss monster in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Playground formats since it had an attack set that matched the Dark Magician, but required one less hold tribute. The anime version of Summoned Skull was an important part of Yugi's arsenal for this reason, since it was a high attack beater that was capable of dealing with a ton of different threats based purely on its attack power alone, all the way from Duelist Kingdom up until Yugi and Yami's final duel against one another. But it was actually within the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga where Summoned Skull shined the most, as Yugi's original ace monster. That, according to Kaiba, was one of the top 5 strongest monsters in the entire game. A fact that this manga showed off well with Summoned Skull beating down each and every one of Kaiba's monsters, and forced Kaiba to cheat to bring out Sugoroku Moto's stolen Blue-Eyes White Dragon. But this duel didn't just show off the power of the original ace Archfiend, it also showed an ideal that was incredibly important to the events of Season 0 Yugi, and one that stuck with duelists to this day: respecting and having loyalty to your cards so they, in turn, will be loyal to you. Summoned Skull appeared to Yugi after several turns of Kaiba's Battle Axe destroying Yugi's monsters, and rewarded Yugi for his faith in his deck by letting him stage a comeback. This in contrast to Kaiba's summon of the Blue-Eyes White Dragon, a card which didn't belong to him that he cheated to his hand. And as a result, when Kaiba declared an attack with Blue Eyes, the card simply refused to attack, and ended up destroying itself since it wasn't loyal to Kaiba and had Sugoroku's heart. Now, in the TCG, while Summoned Skull boasts an impressive attack stat for its level, that's the only reason it's ever seen any success. And once the game moved past that point for big beatsticks, Summoned Skull never really amounted to anything other than being a staple of Playground formats. But the ideals with Summoned Skull are still very much around in the TCG to this day. So many people will choose to play a deck or a strategy not because of how good it is, but because they're loyal to certain decks or even just cards they consider as their ace monsters, leading some people to discover the hidden strength held behind weird or janky boss monsters that nobody else has been able to see. As a whole, Summoned Skull is well past its glory days, and unless it gets a ton of good support, it's unlikely that it'll ever see play again. But there's no doubt about Summoned Skull's importance, both to Yugi and the game itself,
setting the standard and foundations for what an ace monster should be. Cool, interesting, and powerful. And reflecting into number 6 is Mirror Force, one of Yugi's strongest trap cards that was capable of turning an entire duel in his favor with a simple but game-winning effect in both the anime and TCG. And that effect is that whenever an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can activate Mirror Force to destroy all attack position monsters your opponent controls. This was an absolute boon in the anime, because no matter how dire the situation, Mirror Force was able to always act as the apex equalizer, as a card that was capable of redirecting the attack of even the most powerful boss monster right back at them. This made it the perfect trap card, and one that Yugi used to great effect by mind-gaming his opponent and making them think there was no way for them to lose, caused them to cockily declare an attack only for them to fall directly into Yugi's trap, wiping their field in the process and allowing for Yugi to stage a comeback. And this almighty power was a really important part in Yami and Kaiba's duel against Darts in the culmination of the Waking the Dragon arc, where its power was absorbed by the Fang of Critias to form Mirror Force Dragon, who uses effect to destroy every monster Darts controls, thereby freeing the trap souls contained within the Mirror Knight tokens. But that's not the only place where Mirror Force came in clutch in this duel, as its power was also absorbed by the legendary Knight Critias to defeat the Orichalcos monsters after Darts had grown scarily close to winning the duel, giving Yami yet another fighting chance. Meanwhile, in the actual game itself, Mirror Force is actually a really important part of the history of the TCG for similar reasons to why Yugi used it in the anime, because in the first 15 or so years of Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, its effect had the potential to be a devastating blowout if it was capable of wiping an entire field, giving you a fighting chance of winning the duel even after your opponent had managed to build up an impossible board. In fact, Mirror Force was so infamous and so powerful that not only did it spend some time on the Forbidden Limited list, it also changed the way people played the game. Because every card your opponent set had the potential to be Mirror Force, so if you wanted to play around it, you turned some of your monsters to defensive position before attacking, even if you were guaranteed game if you attacked with all of your monsters instead, simply because you had to fear and respect Mirror Force. And this respect for Mirror Force isn't just something that was done in the ancient past, as it even managed to see a ton of competitive play in Zodiac lists during its Tier 0 reign. Unfortunately though, in the modern era the past 5 years or so, battle traps as a whole have seen a sharp decline in use simply because it's now a lot easier for your opponent to prepare for the threat of something like Mirror Force, even if accidentally. Because it's very likely your opponent is just going to be able to remove it from the field before the battle phase, set up some kind of negate, or just summon a towers-like monster that Mirror Force and its variants can't beat. And that's honestly a shame, because there's no doubt that in both the TCG and the anime itself, Mirror Force is a really iconic and important part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and one that's managed to turn duels around, winning games for both Yugi and real-life duelists. There are definitely still a ton of good equalizers around that fulfill the role of Mirror Force and allow you to deal with your opponent's oppressive fields, but none of them really encapsulate the fear and suspense that Mirror Force could generate. Obliterating the number 5 spot are the Exodia pieces, the ace monster of Solomon Moto's deck that, for a while, was the ultimate boss monster of the anime, and one that was deemed so unstoppable by the likes of Weevil Underwood that the only way he could think of beating it was by throwing it overboard before the Duelist Kingdom arc. And the reason why Exodia was deemed so overpowered in the anime was because once you managed to collect each of the 5 pieces, it obliterated every one of your opponent's monsters and won the duel instantly, and there was no way to deal with it, or stop the oncoming attack once it had begun. A fact that Seto Kaiba learned the hard way in the anime. You see, in the first episode, Yugi was on the verge of defeat after Kaiba had managed to bring out 3 Blue-Eyes White Dragons, which he believed to be the strongest monsters in the game, that only had been held back thus far by the Swords of Revealing Light. This gave Yugi a crisis of faith, and made him unsure if he was even capable of defeating Kaiba even with the heart of the cards, to the point where he began to struggle to draw the final card from the top of its deck. But due to the reassurance of his grandfather's spirit, and a reminder that his friends were always with him due to the friendship mark Taya had drawn, Yugi's faith in his cards was bolstered, which gave him the confidence to draw the final piece of Exodia, the only card capable of winning the duel, and one that hadn't even been summoned before, as no one else, other than Yugi, had ever managed to assemble all 5 pieces of the puzzle. This made for one of the most, if not the most iconic moment in the anime, and exists in the hearts and minds of thousands of duelists to this day as a reminder that no matter how dire a situation is, believed in the heart of the cards can sometimes be enough to win a duel. Unfortunately though, this was actually the only moment in the Duel Monsters anime where Yugi uses Exodia in a game, as thanks to a certain insect duelist, most of Yugi's Exodia pieces were lost. The cards did reappear every so often though, either as Solomon Moto's Ka, or even in the hands of other duelists, such as the Bear Hunter in Battle City who used Exodia much differently to Yugi. Because while Yugi used Exodia as the ultimate trump card in his duel versus Kaiba, the Bear Hunter centered his entire deck around the Exodia pieces, with most of his cards either being designed to thin his deck, or stall out your opponent so that he could eventually draw the 5 pieces. Which, funnily enough, is usually how Exodia decks are used in the TCG. because the Exodia pieces themselves are actually kind of bricky, since until you have all 5 pieces, they don't really do anything. Which means playing Exodia as a plan B like Yugi did usually makes your deck worse, since you're filling it with a bunch of dead cards that are likely to never come up. But if you play your deck with a bunch of draw cards, as well as ways to restrict your opponent's actions like the Rare Hunter, you'll have a pretty effective Exodia strategy that can end up obliterating unprepared opponents by turboing the pieces to your hand. And it's this style of Exodia deck that managed to succeed in the 2012 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship, a championship that featured some of the best duels from around the world at the time, where Exodia managed to reach top 8 amidst a meta of Insector, Windup, and Dino Rabbit. As a whole though, Exodia definitely isn't the ultimate strategy as the anime portrayed it, with it only really being a gimmick deck in the modern era. But to a lot of people, that doesn't matter. And no matter how bad the deck might be, they're willing to play it just so they can resolve Exodia and feel like Yugi did in that first duel, solving the puzzle that is the invincible Exodia. Resurrecting to number 4 is Reborn the Monster, otherwise known as Monster Reborn. In the anime and the TCG, Reborn works exactly the same. It allows you to target one monster in either player's graveyard and special summon it to your field. This made it yet another important tool in Yugi's arsenal, and one that he'd consistently use in the anime and manga in order to return monsters from the graveyard back to the field, and was even an important part in his first duel in the manga against Kaiba, where he used Monster Reborn to revive Sogoroku's Blue-Eyes to attack Kaiba for game. But the most important use of Reborn was actually in the final duel between Yugi and Atem. In this final duel, Atem activates Monster Reborn in order to special summon out Slifer the Sky Dragon from the graveyard and attack Yugi Silent Magician level 5, which would have won him the duel. If Yugi had activated Gold Sarcophagus earlier, a card that, in the anime, actually negates the effects of that card after your opponent activates it, which meant that Atem's Slifer the Sky Dragon was sent to the graveyard. According to Ishizu Ishtar, this negation wasn't just a tactical move by Yugi, it was also a message to the Pharaoh to say that the dead don't belong in the world of the living, and the fact that Reborn was negated allowed for Yugi to win the duel, showing Atem his strength and giving him peace as he moved on to the spirit world. Thankfully, games in the TCG have a lot lower stakes, so if your Reborn happens to be negated, it doesn't mean that you have to be sent to the spirit world or Shadow Realm. It just means you might lose the game. Although, if your Reborn manages to resolve, that can result in a huge advantage, because just like in the anime, being able to return to monsters to the field is incredibly strong, and gives you a wide array of potential options when looking at both graveyards. Reviving is just a really strong effect, and Reborn was the first card in the game that allowed for that level of recursion. So much so that pretty much any card that revives a monster from the graveyard is usually referred to as a Reborn. And no matter the era, this effect is absurd, whether you're using Reborn in older formats to steal an opponent's big beater, or using the archetypal Reborns of the modern day to extend your combo. Reborn and Reborn-like effects are always going to be good, which is likely why, even to this day, Monster Reborn is still limited to 1 copy. As a whole, Monster Reborn is one of the most iconic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! In both the anime and TCG, as the card's capable of allowing your coolest monsters to return to the field in some way, shape, or form. And although Yugi's final message to Atem was poignant, bringing monsters back to the world of living is one of the coolest effects in the game, and has allowed for a ton of different and fun strategies to see play over the years. Thundering in with force at number 3 is Slifer the Sky Dragon, Yami Yugi's signature Egyptian god card. Now, in the TCG, Slifer has a ton of different effects in order to match its anime counterpart, because just like in the anime, Slifer requires 3 tributes to normal summon, its normal summon can't be negated, and cards and effects can't be activated after it's normal summoned. It gains 1000 attack for every card in your hand. It even has Slifer's second mouth attack, which reduces the attack of any monster that's normal or special summoned to your opponent's field and attack position by 2000. And if that monster's attack is reduced to 0, you can destroy that card. But Slifer also comes with the downside that during the end phase, if it was special summoned, you must send it to the graveyard. But this is actually a nerfed version of Slifer, because in the anime, the Egyptian god cards all shared extra effects that made them extremely powerful, with all the Egyptian gods being immune to the effects of non-god cards, alongside a bunch of other busted protection effects that made them almost impossible to deal with, unless you also had an Egyptian god yourself. And as a result, Yugi pretty much made Slifer the main boss monster of his deck for Battle City, but only used it when it was necessary, as otherwise it would be too dangerous and could potentially put innocent people at risk. But he didn't hold back during the Battle City Finals, where he used Slifer to take on the other Egyptian god cards, facing off against Kaiba's Almighty Obelisk, Marik's Winged Dragon of Ra, the 2 other god cards that, in the anime, were pretty much unstoppable. Unfortunately though, in the actual game, Slifer hasn't really lived up to its status as the ultimate boss monster, and has only ever seen fringe amounts of play due to its second mouth effect, which can technically act as a floodgate against decks that focus on low attack monsters as combo enablers. But even though Slifer never really saw any play itself, what it represented is still an important part of Yu-Gi-Oh! the boss monster. A monster that feels satisfying to bring to the field that makes you feel secure in your chances of winning. And to a lot of people, these boss monsters are an important part of the deck that makes them and their strategy feel special. It doesn't matter if your boss monster is as bad as the original Gate Guardian, or as used as Baron de Fleur or Axis Kotaker, summoning these monsters just makes you feel cool, in a similar way to summoning out your ace card. Ever since he won in Battle City, Slifer has always been one of Yugi's coolest monsters, and was the one that was vital to take on both Kaiba and Marik during the Battle City finals. And although it never saw play itself, the excitement it brought by being on screen inspired a ton of duelists to believe in the power of their own boss monsters, even if they were a lot weaker than anime Slifer. And appearing from behind the curtain at number 2 is Dark Magician Girl, the ever faithful student of the Dark Magician, who also happens to be Mana's Ka, the student of Mahad who vowed to grow stronger after her teacher's death. And this is reflected in Dark Magician Girl's effect, because she gains 300 attack and defense for every Dark Magician or Magician of Black Chaos in either player's graveyard. In the anime, this made Dark Magician Girl an excellent part of Yugi's arsenal, as a backup ace monster that has the potential to be even stronger than the Dark Magician himself. A fact that was specifically highlighted with her first appearance, as she gained an attack buff from both the Dark Magicians in Yugi's graveyard and the one in Arcana's to defeat his on-field Dark Magician. But the Dark Magician Girl represents more than just strength for the Pharaoh, because as a card and as a character, Dark Magician Girl represents Atem's humanity and his promise to destroy the Orichalcos. Which is part of why it was such a shock when Atem activated the Seal of Orichalcos, binding Dark Magician Girl, the Dragon Knight, to the Seal's powers, as he essentially gave in to the corruption of the Orichalcos in an attempt to win a duel, which caused Timaeus to abandon the Pharaoh for a while. This made it seem like the Pharaoh had given up his soul completely, as he was even willing to sacrifice Dark Magician Girl and the promise he made to her. But after proving himself worthy of Timaeus once more, Dark Magician Girl and her Dragon Knight form became a staple of Yugi's strategy and was even an integral part of Dart's defeat. You see, in the duel against Darts, after each of the Orichalcos monsters had been destroyed, Darts had brought out Divine Serpent Get and declared an attack on the legendary Knight Timaeus, destroying it by battle and reducing Yugi's life points to 0. But despite that, the duel wasn't over, because Yami activated Relay Soul to special summon Dark Magician Girl from his hand. And due to the effect of the anime version of Relay Soul, so as long as she remained face up on the field, Yugi couldn't lose the duel. But the catch was, if she left the duel, then he would lose the duel instantly. This made for a really intense moment in the anime, where in order to win the duel, Yugi had to literally hold on to his humanity, putting all of his faith into Dark Magician Girl while resisting the pull of the Orichalcos. A play that he was rewarded for because after redirecting the second attack of Get to his legendary knights, Yami formed an infinite loop and combined Timaeus with his other knights, which gave him an infinite attack as well, allowing to crash with Ge, winning Yugi the duel on the spot. Unfortunately though, Dark Magician Girl has never played too much of a pivotal role in the TCG. Her effect isn't really that useful out of Dark Magician decks, and Dark Magician strategies have never really been that competitively viable. But even in spite of that, Dark Magician Girl has become an icon of the Yu-Gi-Oh community, as a monster that's instantly recognizable by both fans of the anime and competitive players alike, and is a really important part of Yu-Gi-Oh's cultural impact as one of these faces of the game. And while Dark Magician Girl has never been competitively viable, there's no doubt about the important role she's played in both the anime and real world as a pillar of Yu-Gi-Oh's identity. But every student needs a teacher, which brings us to the number 1 spot. And at number 1 is his ever-loyal companion, the Dark Magician, the Ka Mahad and Yami Yugi's ace monster. Dark Magician is a 2500 attack beatstick that has no effect, with it instead being a normal monster that, according to its flavor text, is the ultimate wizard in terms of attack and defense. And it was this power that allowed for the Dark Magician to contend with and face off against some of the most powerful monsters in the anime, from Relinquish to the Guardians, and of course against Seto Kaiba's Blue-Eyes White Dragons. In a sense, Yugi treats a Dark Magician more like a friend than an actual card, which makes sense given the spirit of the card belongs to Mahad, a childhood friend of Atem that chose to live on as an eternal servant by sacrificing himself in order to become the Dark Magician. And Yugi is rewarded for that trust because no matter the duel or the opponents he's faced, Yugi could rely upon this card with his entire being to either get him out of rough situations or deliver a final blow. And true to his name, Dark Magician was more than just his stat lines, because he also had a series of magic tricks that made for some of the most intense and interesting duels in the anime. Magical hats saved Yugi in a ton of different situations, allowing for Dark Magician and his other monsters to hide beneath the hats to potentially dodge an opponent's monster's attack. There was also Magic Cylinder, a card capable of sending an opponent's attack right back at them. And Mystic Box, a card that plays both Dark Magician and an opponent's monster within the 2 boxes. The Dark Magician's box would be pierced by swords, only for it to be revealed that he's magically switched boxes with an opponent's monster, leaving them to be destroyed by the swords instead. But of course, the magic that Dark Magician was best known was his Dark Magic attack. And that's not even where Dark Magician's utility ends, because just like Gaia, Dark Magician could evolve and either combine his power with other monsters or evolve, from the likes of Dark Sage to Amulet Dragon and of course the Dark Paladin. And this willingness to evolve or lend his strength to others is precisely why Dark Magician has managed to see play in the TCG. You see, as a strategy, Dark Magician has never been a key contender in the metagame, because while the deck has some decent interaction, it's usually not enough to take on the strongest decks of the meta. But because of the power of the Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, a fusion monster that specifically requires the Dark Magician as one of its materials, the card has seen a spike in competitive play in recent years, because the representation of Joe and Yugi's bond is strong, really strong, since it's a monster with a high attack stat that can't be destroyed or targeted by card effects, can pop your opponent's monsters while burning for a ton of damage, and even has an Omni Negate. And as a result, a ton of different strategies throughout the years have willingly chose to play Dark Magician in their decks so they can access it in some way. Some decks did this by using Red Eyes Fusion by either activating it from the hand or copying its effect with Verte Anaconda. This made for a really strong plan B in case your main line of play was interrupted, while also being an extra piece of difficult to deal with interaction that you could just easily add to your end board. However, after Verte was banned in the TCG, Dragoon and Dark Magician saw a lot less play, since there weren't that many decks that could really take advantage of Red Eyes Fusion due to its harsh restriction. But it didn't stop seeing play entirely, because there's actually a deck that can play Dragoon without the need for Red Eyes Fusion, Branded. A deck that can choose to play Dark Magician to send with the effect of Branded Fusion in order to get access to the insanely powerful boss monster. Overall, no matter whether you're a fan of the anime or the TCG, Dark Magician is without a doubt one of the most important and iconic monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! And his loyalty to Atem shows just how strong the connections between cards and duelists can be. He was an important feature in just about every one of Yugi's duels as his ace monster. But more than that, he was a friend to Atem, and one that refused to leave his side even in death. And although he's only ever been played in the TCG to facilitate Dragoon, it's a nice thought that the Spirit of Mahad is helping duelists in the competitive game, just as he did in the anime, and gives even the most competitive duelists a chance to feel like Yugi Moto themselves. Ishizu is the name of the anime character from the first series who has a duel against Seto Kaiba, who doesn't really have any other duels in the series. The cards she uses are all vanilla monsters with no effects, and Konami basically printed every single card that appears in her deck into the actual game, albeit with changed effects. In order to go over all the cards in this video, I think we should first recap the duel real quick, because it'll make a lot of sense why they created some future support cards for the Ishizu cards, which is the unofficial name for this series of cards that we're going to be going over in this video. Ishizu starts off the duel with the Drag Down to the Grave, summons Keldo, which promptly gets destroyed, uses Swords of Revealing Light to stall for 3 turns, sets Exchange of the Spirit, then Kaiba destroys her deck with both Crush Card Virus and Virus Cannon, which are both much stronger than the animated version and the real-life versions, which basically gets rid of all of her monsters with more than 1500 attack, and 10 spells from her deck. Then, after her deck is destroyed, she uses Exchange of the Spirit, which swaps both players' graveyards with their deck, giving Kaiba only 6 cards left. Then she uses Muko twice in order to deny 2 of his draws, and slowly summons Kelbeck, Zolga, and Agito over the course of 3 turns. Then Kaiba sets Soul Exchange in order to confusingly use it on his opponent's turn, even though it's a normal spell card, they just kind of ignore this, in order to tribute those 3 cards in order to bring out Obelisk from his hand. However, Ishizu had booby-trapped Zolga with a trap card she didn't have to actually flip face up, so that if a monster that tributed Zolga declares an attack, he would be destroyed and inflict damage equal to its attack to its owner. However, on Kaiba's turn, instead of attacking with Obelisk, he uses Silent Doom to bring out a monster. Then tributes both the God card and the new monster to bring out a Blue-Eyes White Dragon, which he then uses to attack with in order to win. So, keep all this in mind as we go over the plethora of support that the Ishizu cards received over the years. In 2003, the set Dark Crisis was released in the TCG, and with this set, we received the first round of the Ishizu cards. First up, we have Mudora. This card was changed from Vanilla Monster in the anime to an effect monster that has the ability where it gains 200 attack for each fairy monster in your graveyard. So, how strong was Mudora during its time period? Well, to give some context, the card Breaker the Magical Warrior was released in the previous set, which has 1600 attack, immediately goes up to 1900 when it's summoned and places a spell counter on itself, and has the opportunity to remove the spell counter to destroy 1 spell trap card on the field. And Breaker was such a meta staple that it was constantly restricted on the ban list. So Mudora doesn't really stack up to Breaker on its own, and would need at least 3 fairies in the grave just to beat over Breaker the Magical Warrior's default mode. And fairy-type monsters were not really known for putting a whole bunch of cards in the graveyard outside of Shining Angel at this time period. So it's safe to say Mudora never saw any competitive play. Next up we have Keldo. This card was upgraded from vanilla in the anime to have a floating effect, where if it's destroyed by a battle, you can shuffle 2 cards in your opponent's graveyard back into their deck. I have to assume this effect was given to it, seeing as it was the only card actually destroyed by battle during the duel, and of course the theme of shuffling the graveyard back into the deck was kind of Ishizu's thing. Agito is a level 4 Earth Fairy monster with 1500 attack, which was given the effect that if it's destroyed by battle, you can roll a 6-sided die. Then you can special summon a fairy monster from your grave who has a level equal to the dice result, or level 6 or higher if you rolled a 6.
Kelbeck is also a level 4 Earth Fairy with 1500 attack, but has 1800 defense, the highest of all the Ishizu monsters, and has the ability where if it's attacked by a monster, it returns that monster to the hand after damage calculation. And finally, we have Zulga, another level 4 Earth Fairy, this time with 1700 attack, which is actually decent. And it has the effect that if it's tributed for a tribute summon, you gain 2000 life points. Out of the 5 level 4 Earth Fairy monsters that make up the Ishizu monsters, not a single one of them saw any kind of competitive play. They were all kind of a little bit too low statted for the time period that they came out, back when their stats really mattered in level 4 monsters. And also, all of their effects were just kind of bad. Fairies did not have enough support to make Midora have a high enough attack power. Keldo's effect to return cards from the graveyard was just too slow because it needed to be destroyed by battle, even if it was technically useful. Agito's effect was basically a joke for how bad it was, and only Kelbeck and Zulga had halfway decent effects. Being able to bounce a monster that attacks Kelbeck is decent, as this was an effect tied to Wall of Illusion, which did see competitive play, and had basically the same effect. However, Wall of Illusion had 50 more defense, which was really a world of difference from 1800, because that was kind of the threshold on a decently statted monster. To put that into perspective, if Kelbeck simply had 1900 defense instead of 1800, it probably would have seen competitive play. But since it was only 1800, it was just not good enough, because it would be destroyed by pretty much anything decent. And with Zulga, while tributes were used at the time, generally the best cards to tribute were ones that special summon themselves in some way, which Zulga did not. Also, getting life points was just not a good effect, even in early Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you went through the effort to try to tribute summon using Zulga, there wasn't really a payoff for it. One has to wonder why they gave the Ishizu cards such mediocre effects, when they might have actually been better if they were just left as normal monsters, because then they at least would benefit from normal monster support. These cards were just beyond awful. They didn't work together in any cohesive way, and didn't even really have support, since Earth Fairies were just kind of not a thing, as most support for fairy monsters was generally tied to the light attribute. However, the spells and traps are a little bit different, as some of them did see competitive play. Also in Dark Crisis, alongside the Ishizu monsters, were the Ishizu spells and traps, which also did not share a theme because the archetypes didn't really exist back then. In fact, the pack that included the Ishizu monsters included one of the very first archetypes in the game, that being the Archfiends. First up, we have Cestus of Dagla. This is an equip spell which can only be equipped to a fairy, which gives it 500 attack. In addition, if it deals any damage to your opponent, you gain life points equal to the damage inflicted. One has to wonder why they have so many life point gain cards in an archetype dedicated to a character who only wanted to deal burn damage. Drag Down to the Grave was also released at this time, but was heavily nerfed from its anime counterpart. What it does is allow both players to reveal their hands, then each player chooses one card from their opponent's hand in order to send to the graveyard. Then both players draw one card. In the anime, it chose 2 cards instead of 1, which would have been kind of insane because Drag Down to the Grave has actually seen competitive play over the years, and probably would have been banned if it did select 2 cards instead of 1. Blast Held by a Tribute is a battle trap which can only be activated when an opponent's monster declares an attack that was tribute summoned, in which case you destroy all of your opponent's face-up attack position monsters, then inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent. So it's basically like a Mirror Force that also deals a little bit of burn damage, which actually made this card really good in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, when Mirror Force was still not in the game, and tribute summoning was a normal part of the game as well. However, in the actual TCG, it wasn't even used as a side deck option, because there were just better staple spells and traps to use instead. Of the 3 Ishizu spells and traps, only Drag Down to the Grave has been useful over the years, mainly used with Darkworld decks, as it was a great way to trigger the Darkworld effects in hand in order to be discarded by a card effect, while also getting rid of choice cards in your opponent's hand in the process. The way you would use it was basically set all your good cards in the field, that way you only had Dark Worlds in your hand, which would all trigger when they were sent to the graveyard. Then your opponent's hand would be ripe for the taking. In fact, Drag Down to the Grave was also used in just normal meta decks during Master Rule 4, because the speed of the game finally got to a point where players had multiple 1-card starters. So they would just use Drag Down to the Grave in order to look at their opponent's hand and get rid of a hand trap that would stop their plays, and just wouldn't care which card of theirs was discarded from their hand because their entire hand could start their combo. Next up, we have Muko. This is a trap card which can only be activated if an effect activates, which allows people to draw cards, in which case both players get to see the cards drawn and then send them all to the graveyard. In the anime, this card worked more like drop-off, as it was just sending the cards they drew immediately to the graveyard without any other kind of effects. Also, fun story about Muko is that when it was first translated into the West, it was actually named Null and Void. And in fact, if you find any copies of this card, that's still its name, as it hasn't actually been reprinted since its name was changed to Muko. Null and Void actually came out after the initial wave of Ishizu cards in 2004, and no other Ishizu cards were released until 2005. And finally, we have Exchange of the Spirit. This card was released as a promo and then later on in the year released in a pack, which has the effect that if you have 15 or more cards in your grave, you can pay 1,000 life points in order to swap both players' decks with their graveyard. And in its original effect, this was one of the most broken cards in the game. And the reason for that was it was one of the easiest ways to mill your opponent's deck in one turn with one card. You see, there are a plethora of cards which allow you to draw cards from your deck. So if you simply play a deck full of draw cards, or ways to cycle through your deck, you would eventually get 15 of them into the graveyard while doing this, and eventually find one of your copies of Exchange of the Spirit. In which case, you just pass to your opponent, immediately activate the card during the draw phase, and completely deck out your opponent, since they wouldn't have any cards in the graveyard yet. Then you would just have to not lose that turn, and then you'd be able to win on your opponent's next turn. And in fact, in no ban list tournaments, this was the fastest way to win in one turn alongside Melchior the Destructor and Temple of the Kinks, allowing you to activate trap cards from your hand. Exchange of the Spirit was then promptly banned and stayed banned until it received an errata. The errata was twofold. First, they made it so both players need to have 15 or more cards in the graveyard to use it, then they gave it a once per duel clause on top of it. Since both players needed 15 cards in the grave to use it now, if you use the effect when your opponent had exactly 15 cards in the graveyard, that means they would still have 15 cards left in their deck and no longer be instantly decked out as soon as you got 15 cards in your grave. Which basically turned it from an overpowered juggernaut of a card to a funny card you might be able to use to FTK with if you get your opponent's entire deck into the graveyard and then swap it. Basically, the card wasn't really played competitively anymore. But for a short time, this is one of the strongest cards in the game, and still is considered a very strong card in its pre-errated version. And with Exchange of the Spirit, this is every single card which was shown in the anime that Ishizu played, having all of them put into the real game, with one of them even breaking the game a little bit. Then, randomly in 2021, Zolga got a retrain. It was given the exact same stats as the original, but with an entirely new effect and a slightly different name, as it was now called Zolga the Prophet. And it was given 3 effects, all of which are more in line with its anime version, and no longer being tied to life point gain. First off, it could special summon itself from your hand if you controlled an Earth Fairy. Next, when it's special summoned, you can look at the top 5 cards of both players' decks. And finally, if this card was used as a tribute for a monster, and that tribute summon monster declares an attack, you can banish this card from your graveyard to destroy that monster and deal 2,000 points of damage to your opponent. So, first of all, they finally fixed the part of this card that made it bad in the real game. In that, it was a monster with an effect tied to being tributed for a tribute summon, but could not special summon itself. Also, it finally dealt damage to your opponent, which is more in line with the anime version of the card, but only deals 2,000 points of damage instead of the full attack of the monster, to, I guess, pay tribute to its old version of the card, which gained you 2,000 life points. And finally, it lets you look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, which is just a nod to the anime and how Ishizu always knew which cards were being drawn because of her ability to see into the future. And since you could see the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, you now knew exactly the next 5 cards they would draw. Now, when Zolga the Prophet was released, people were kind of perplexed as to why they only retrained one of the 5 Ishizu monsters, because it seemed kind of random. Well, don't worry, they were just cooking in the oven a little bit, as they definitely would be retrained as well really soon. In the meantime, Zolga the Prophet saw absolutely no competitive play, but at least it was no longer an awful card. Later in 2021, they released a whole bunch of god card support, including the card Soul Crossing. This is a quick play spell card which allows you to tribute 3 monsters in both players' fields in order to summon a god card from your hand. And in the artwork, you can see Kelbeck, Agito, and Zolga, as they were the 3 cards used by Kaiba in order to summon out Opposite Tormentor. However, they finally created a card that allows you to do what he did in the anime. As in the anime, he just used Soul Exchange during his opponent's turn, which doesn't work that way, and also only allows you to use 1 monster to tribute and not 3. Then, at the tail end of 2022, Konami finally released a brand new set of Ishizu cards, basically retraining the rest of them, and made them just a tiny bit better than Zolga. First up, we have Mudora the Sword Oracle. It has the same stats as the original, and none of its original effects. All of these new retrained Ishizu monsters have 2 effects, with 2 parts to each of those effects. The first one of Mudora is that you can discard 1 Earth Fairy from your hand in order to special summon it from your hand. Then, place the card Gravekeeper's Trap directly from your deck into the field face up. Its second effect can be used while it's on the field or in the graveyard, where at quick effect speed, it can banish itself in order to target up to 3 cards in both players' graveyards and shuffle them back into the deck. Or if you have the trap card Exchange of the Spirit on your field or in the grave, you can instead shuffle back 5 cards. The card that searches out, Gravekeeper's Trap, has the effect where you can discard a card from your hand in order to add an Earth Fairy or Gravekeeper monster from your deck to your hand. When your opponent draws a card, you can declare a name, and if you declare the correct card they drew, it's sent to the graveyard. And finally, if you have Exchange of the Spirit in the grave, it turns into a floodgate, where your opponent can't activate card effects in the graveyard or special summon from the grave. Next up, we have Keldo the Sacred Protector. This card can also special summon itself from your hand by discarding another fairy. Then if it's summoned this way, you can add Exchange of the Spirit or a card that mentions it from your deck to your hand, which basically includes all of the new Ishizu monsters, as they all have a bonus effect if Exchange of the Spirit is in the graveyard. Where, in Keldo's case, it's the exact same as Mudora, where you can banish it from the graveyard or field in order to shuffle back 3 cards from the graveyards, or 5 if Exchange of the Spirit is on the field or in the grave. Agido became Agido the Ancient Sentinel. Its special summon effect is triggered if a card is sent from the hand or deck to your opponent's graveyard, in which case you can special summon this card from your hand, then you can special summon a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your grave. This effect pays tribute to the original Agido card, which could also special summon a fairy from the graveyard, just on a much worse effect. And also, Keldo was the card that originally shuffled cards in the graveyard back into the deck. They just kind of tacked that ability onto Mudora for some reason. Anyways, Agido also has the effect where if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard in any way, you can send the top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard. With its bonus effect being, if Exchange of the Spirit is in the grave, you can send 5 more cards from the top of either player's deck to the grave. Lastly, we have Kelbeck, which becomes Kelbeck the Ancient Vanguard. This card is modeled like the Agido Retrain, where it special summons itself from the hand on a trigger, and also mills cards when it's sent to the graveyard. In this case, it triggers exactly the same as Agido, where if a card is sent from the hand or deck to your opponent's graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand, but only if your opponent controls a special summoned monster, which you have to bounce back to their hand. Obviously referencing its original effect, where it could bounce monsters to the hand that attacked it, which actually turned Kelbeck into a legitimate hand trap which could also just be played outside of its archetype. Additionally, if this card is sent to the graveyard from your hand or deck, you can send the top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard, just like Agido. However, its bonus effect, if Exchange of the Spirits is in the grave, is that you can set any trap card from your graveyard to your field. There were also 2 more trap cards released: Exchange of Despair and Hope, and Blast Held by Destiny. Blast Held by Destiny is a battle trap where if a monster declares an attack, you get to destroy your opponent's highest attack monster, then both players take damage equal to that monster's attack. Or if you have Exchange of Despair in the grave, only your opponent takes the damage. Additionally, if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard in any way, you get to add a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard to your hand, which means all of your Ishizu monsters. Blast Held by Destiny finally plays proper homage to the anime version of the trap card Ishizu was trying to use, even if it was only played sometimes for its graveyard effect now. Exchange of Despair and Hope is a trap card which can only be activated if you control 3 more Earth Fairy monsters, where you send all monsters on the field to the graveyard, then basically each player gets to special summon their opponent's monsters to the field that were sent to the graveyard. Then, if Exchange of the Spirit is in the grave, you get a bonus effect to also set any trap card directly from your deck to the field, and it can be activated this turn. Now, this new wave of Ishizu monsters were insanely broken, like legitimately some of the strongest cards ever made, and were played in basically every single deck that existed in the time period in which these cards were released. And all 4 of these monsters are restricted in the ban list in some way to this day. And what was really unfortunate was they were released when tier limits were still basically at full power, which is an archetype all about milling cards from the deck to the graveyard in order to go into fusion summons, and was basically one of the strongest archetypes ever made. So when you have one of the most legitimately broken set of 4 monsters combined with one of the most overpowered archetypes that directly benefits from its effects, you have a combination that is easily a tier 0 format, comprised of one of the best stacks that has ever existed, called Ishizu tier limits. In the OCG, they had no ban list tournaments during this time, where you could use any copies of any card that has ever been banned. And the deck that won the event was basically just a normal tier limits Ishizu deck. They didn't even need to use Pot of Greed because they were just so consistent without it. The Ishizu cards don't have this video for being bad. They're in this video for being so incredibly broken that they're more failures from a design standpoint, and that they were just too strong for the game. Even though this series is called Failed Cards and Mechanics and Archetypes, we should probably add designs to that as well, because that's the only place where these cards fail. Now let's talk about why this is. The 4 Ishizu monsters are categorized into the millers and the shufflers. The millers allow you to mill 10 cards every turn if you're able to hit both Agido and Kelbeck, and the shufflers allow you to shuffle back 6 cards every turn if you're able to hit Keldo and Mudora, because funny enough, most people did not play Exchange of the Spirit in order to gain their bonus effects. So most of the time, it was these numbers that we were dealing with. In the game currently, we have a card called Needlebug Nest. This is a trap card which only has the effect to send the top 5 cards of your deck to the graveyard. This card has historically seen competitive play because there are tons of good decks that have good graveyard effects, and this is one of the best ways to put 5 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard without any other kind of fuss. And this is despite the fact that it's a trap card, which means most people won't play it specifically because of that, as having to wait a turn in order to use a card is just way too slow in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! However, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a card called Transaction Rollback. which allows you to banish it from the graveyard and pay half your life points to use the effect of a normal trap card in your graveyard as its effect. And currently, Tearlaments are top in events using the effect to copy Needlebug Nest, because this 2-card specific combo to only mill 5 cards is so good that it's absolutely worth running. And Agito and Kelbeck could do this for a fourth of the amount of effort. You could easily get Agito or Kelbeck in the grave in a vast majority of ways, including during your opponent's first turn. There's a card called Herald of Orange Light, which is a hand trap that can negate and destroy a monster, but requires you to discard it with another fairy monster from your hand to use it. So, if you use it on your opponent's first turn in order to get one of their monsters and destroy it, you could also pitch Agito or Kelbeck if it was in your hand, in order to start the mill train and get 5 cards in the grave. Where if you then milled another one, you could mill 5 more cards and get 10 cards in your graveyard right there. Additionally, during your turn, there's a card like Diviner the Herald, which could send it directly from your deck to the graveyard, or of course a Foolish Burial, milling it incidentally with the Tearlament mills, or through Mudora and Keldo, which could search them both out, as Mudora could bring out Gravekeeper's Trap, which could then search out either Agito or Kelbeck, and Keldo could be used to search out either Agito or Kelbeck, or it could search out Mudora, who can then search them out through Gravekeeper's Trap. Then, the 2 cards which you used to search out Agito and Kelbeck were also ridiculously good. You see, there's a card in the game called Transmigration Prophecy, which is a normal trap card which has the effect to target 2 cards in either graveyard and shuffle them both into the deck. This card was so good it was actually restricted on the ban list for a long time, and only stopped seeing play in the modern days simply because trap cards are just too slow, but the effect was always good. There's also a card in the game called DD Crow, one of the very first hand traps ever made, which simply has the effect to banish 1 card from your opponent's graveyard by sending itself from your hand to the grave. And being able to disrupt a single card from your opponent's graveyard was considered so good that DD Crow has never stopped seeing competitive play since it came out. And Mudora and Keldo are both power-crept versions of the Transmigration Prophecy and DD Crow, who also could search out the overpowered millers in the process of getting themselves into the grave, and can also use their effects from the graveyard instead of having to be on the field or in the hand, which means if they're randomly milled through Agito or Kelbeck, they're live. And since they're both quick effects, you can absolutely use them in order to disrupt your opponent's graveyard plays. Mudora and Keldo are so powerful that while Ishizu was at full power, you could not play other decks that relied on the graveyard in almost any way, besides other Tearlament Ishizu decks, because Mudora and Keldo completely shut down the graveyard. In fact, even today, when both of the millers are banned and Mudora and Keldo are only available at 1 copy, they're still played quite regularly because their shuffle effects are just that overpowered. On top of it all, they're all level 4 monsters that can special summon themselves from the hand, which means you can use them to go into rank 4 Xyz's plays, who can then later on go to the graveyard to trigger their effects, except for Agito and Kelbeck, who specifically have to be sent to the graveyard from your hand or deck. And this meant that if you played the Ishizu engine, you also had access to number 41 Baguska the Terrible Attired Tapir, and Abyss Dweller, 2 floodgates which could just shut down all your opponent's monsters, or turn off your opponent's graveyard entirely. To give more of an indication of just how strong milling 10 cards, and then being able to disrupt 6 of them is, we're going to go over a couple of very good graveyard effects. Fairy Tail Snow is a level 4 monster, which can special summon itself from the graveyard by banishing 7 other cards from your hand, field, or grave. Then when it's summoned, you can Book of Moon one of your opponent's cards. Destrudo, the Lost Dragon's Frozen, can special summon itself from the grave as long as you control a level 6 or lower monster, which gives you a 2-turn board to allow you to go into synchros. Rainbow Bridge of Salvation allows you to search out any field spell with its graveyard effect, and Metal Foes Fusion just straight up allows you to draw a card. Then there's really good cards which activate when they're sent to the graveyard, like all of the Tearlaments, which allow you to go into fusions and mill more. Shadow Beast will let you draw a card. Trickclown, Wolf, Felis, Dotscaper, Nightsword Serpent, and Revival Golem, which can all special summon themselves if they're sent to the graveyard. Goki Pole, which can search out Danger Mothman. Eva, which can search out Herald of Arc-Light. Tackle Crusader, which can Book of Moon a monster. And even Farfa, which can banish a monster. Then there's cards in the graveyard which can gain advantage if they're banished from the graveyard. Cards like Giant Rex, Algul Mazura, Dotscaper, DD Scout Plane, Shinobi Necro, Ascan, and Zeb, which can all special summon themselves if they're banished from the graveyard. Or cards like Thunder Dragon Roar, Resident Insect, Ghost Wyvern, Chaos Witch, Shiranui Samurai, and the 3 Sword Soul traps, which can all special summon other monsters if they're banished from the graveyard. Or cards like Thunder Dragon Dark, Dragon Matrix, Neptune, Ascension, Mercurier, Shiranui Squire, and all 4 Dragon Rulers, which allow you to gain advantage if they're banished from the graveyard. So not only are there a lot of really good cards with graveyard effects and cards which can use resources from the graveyard, these are also all really good targets to be removed from the graveyard with Mudora and Keldo, which shows you why they see play despite the fact that the other cards have been banned. And let's talk about the bannings. Currently, Kelbeck and Agito are banned in all formats, with Kel and Mudora being limited in all formats. And with how many decks have archetype-specific cards that are good in the graveyard, or archetype-specific ways of reviving cards in the graveyard, it really shows how ridiculously powerful these 4 cards were. It's kind of insane that literally all of them are good and worked together so well, and came out with one of the best graveyard-centric decks ever made with the tier limits. As long as people are using transaction rollback to copy Needlebug Nest from the graveyard, the game is not at a point where Ishizu cards can be lifted off the ban list. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just too revolved around the graveyard, and being able to get so many pure resources into the graveyard so easily just kinda speeds up the game into a new level of power. Modern tier limits Ishizus can still beat pretty much any meta deck that currently exists, and it's kind of hard to see how they could possibly power creep again to get away from this, other than making floodgates more abundant. To say it again, the Ishizu cards do not fail because they're bad. On the contrary, they're so incredibly good that I doubt we'll ever see cards like them again. And in fact, I'd be surprised to see Agito or Kelbeck unbanned without some kind of errata. You know they messed up when basically all of their main cards are on the ban list, just like they did with the Dragon Rulers all those years ago. As the huge franchise it is, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has spanned multiple different video games in the past, many of which had some really unique cards in them. For better or for worse, many of these cards never got brought over to the TCG, and in this video we're going to be going over some of the best of these. Starting us off at number 10, we have Dark Flare Knight from Reshift of Destruction. This is a level 6 fire warrior whose text reads, a warrior of flame and darkness. If it's in the player's graveyard, it is able to summon a Mirage Knight to the own field. Wonky English aside, this is easily one of the best cards from Reshift, allowing you to bypass many of the game's crazy difficulty spikes with its effects. If this version of Dark Flare Knight is sent to the graveyard in any way, you can summon a Mirage Knight for free, and since Reshift's rules are a tad different to the real games, you don't even need a Mirage Knight in your deck to pull this off. Mirage Knight itself sweetens the deal even more. It's a 2800 attack beater that will, at the start of your opponent's turn, transform into a Dark Magician and a Flame Swordsman. So, off just putting a single Dark Flare in the graveyard, you get 2 big monsters out for free. But how hard is it to dump it there? Well, Reshift may not have cards like Foolish Burial available, but it does allow you to freely discard cards from your hand at will. So getting this effect off is as easy as drawing into your Dark Flare Knight. It's no wonder that most players' first real grind session will be to get enough money to buy a copy of this and try to cheese the rest of the game. The only similar card to this has only gotten much later on, and you pretty much need a guide for it, in the Winged Dragon of Ra Phoenix mode, which also triggers when it's sent to the graveyard but floats into the Winged Dragon of Ra instead. Except that Reshift's version of Ra can pay life points until you have 1 left to damage your opponent's life points by the same amount, which may sound OP, but it's not an effect you want to use that often, since a lot of the game's difficult fights involve fighting multiple duels in a row without a health refill. Either way, that game's versions of these cards certainly put the real ones to shame, even if we could never get something quite like that in the TCG. And at number 9, we've got Kiteroid. This is a level 1 wind machine monster with only 200 attack and 400 defense. During damage calculation, if your opponent's monster is attacking you directly, you can either discard this card or banish it from your graveyard to prevent any battle damage from that battle. As far as hand traps go, this is a pretty unique one that you can use it twice. One time by discarding it, and then another by banishing from the graveyard. Its effect is basically a better Karibo, and even if that was never a meta hand trap, this made this card decent enough to be great in the game it's available in. You can play Kiteroid in either Tag Force 3, Special, or Duel Links, and exclusively in those, since this is one of those cards that never got brought over to the TCG in any way. Though there'd be very little reason to ever play this in real life due to the existence of better anti-battle phase hand traps like Battle Fader or Swift Scarecrow. Tag Force 3 didn't have either of those due to being released in 2008, a couple of years before either of those came out. Duel Links lack them due to balance reasons. The battle phase is generally much more important in that game, and cards that skip it like Fader would be much more powerful since you're forced to go straight to the end phase afterwards. Kiteroid was actually strong enough to be meta in Duel Links for several years, and it even still sees play there to this day, even if it's not as represented as it once was. That's partly because it was so prevalent that it even got limited to 2, which is a much harsher restriction in Duel Links than it is in the TCG, as you can only have 2 limit 2 cards in your whole deck. Even its searcher, Megaroid City, had to be limited to 2 as well, as having that much access to Kiteroids made stalling way too good of a tactic. Even if we get this card eventually, it'll be nothing more than pack filler for the TCG, but Duel Links players will always know how many duels were won or lost due to it. And at number 8, we've got 100 Eye Dragon. This is a level 8 Dark Synchro Dark Monster with 3000 attack, and it must be made with a non-tuner minus a Dark Tuner. Its effects are that when it attacks, your opponent cannot activate spells or traps until the end of the damage step, and then it gains the effects of all Infernity monsters in your graveyard. Also, if it's destroyed, you can add a card from your deck to your hand. So, to get it out of the way, Dark Synchros must be made by subtracting the levels of a non-tuner and a Dark Tuner until they reach the inverse of their levels. So in this case, you need them to go down to -8. Also, Dark Tuners don't mean a tuner of the Dark attribute, but rather a specific set of monsters that were used to only make Dark Synchros in the anime. For example, you can use a Dark Tuner Nightmare Hand, who's a level 10, and minus a level 2 monster to make 100-Eye Dragon. Of course, this is a mechanic from the anime that's only ever been implemented in the Tag Force games, and rightfully so. If new players struggle with all the summoning methods already, imagine if anything of this sort existed. Either way, despite how meh most of the Dark Tuners were in the games, this version of 100 Eyes is way cooler than the original. Even if the one we got can banish any level 6 or lower dark monster from your graveyard and copy its effect, most of the time you were copying your Infernity Necromancer or Mirage anyways. And this one lets you get both without having to get rid of any resources. Of course, this sort of thing never really came over to the TCG, and it'd be probably a ruling's nightmare to have a card also be multiple other ones at once. But it lets you do some pretty cool combos in the games. It would probably get abused relentlessly in the real game due to its crazy floating effect, which got upgraded from getting any Earthbound Immortal when it's destroyed, to just getting any card from your deck instead. God knows Infernity would have been a threat for much longer if their boss monster just floated back into Infernity Launcher if it was ever outed by your opponent. And at number 7, there's Jurassic Impact from the Tag Force games, a normal trap that can only be activated if your life points are lower than your opponent's. It destroys all monsters on the field, and then each player takes 300 life points damage for each monster they control that was destroyed by the effect. Also, neither player can summon monsters until the end of your next turn. The Tag Force version of Jurassic Impact is essentially a torrential tribute stapled onto a heat wave, with the small cost of only being activatable if your life points are lower than your opponent's. This is, of course, a crazy card, and it would have no doubt seen play in the TCG if it wasn't nerfed as hard as it was. The version of this card we got has an extra restriction requiring to control at least 2 or more dinosaurs, and even if it bumped the burn damage up to 1,000 per monster instead, it makes you take it first, so you can't even force a draw as a last resort. The thing is that needing to control dinos made this card completely unusable, since dino decks are usually more combo based and would never bother with a trap like this. However, imagine if it was generic as the video game version. This card could have certainly been a staple in really slow strategies. Decks like Eldritch and Runic would kill for this, as its removal, interaction, and a floodgate all at once. Eldritch even has an in-engine way to lose life points, as well as having monsters that can't be destroyed by card effects anyways. Runic would need an extra card that fits the requirement, but stopping your opponent completely would certainly be more than worth it. Either way, looking at the decks that could use it, it probably was a blessing that Konami nuked this card's playability back into the Stone Age. And at number 6, we have Chaos Blast. This normal spell has you target a level 4 lower monster in your graveyard, and then sending 3 level 1 machines from your deck to the graveyard to destroy it. This is one of the simplest cards on this list, but its effect is ridiculously powerful. Dumping 3 machines from your deck is so powerful that needing to have a level 4 or lower monster in the field feels more like the card's restriction rather than its main upside. Granted, that isn't really the case in the Tag Force games where this was in, but nowadays this would be more than enough to let you build a crazy board by itself. Imagine a Drytron deck that just casually jumped 3 names to the graveyard, and then ending on a countless amount of Omni Negates. Or even a Synchro deck dumping Despot 001 and Jet Synchron for infinite setup fodder. There's just no telling what kind of crazy setups this could enable, and again, the only downside would be having to pop one of your own monsters if you were to use it going first, which is probably more than worth it. What's crazy is that they actually made it better in the Tag Force than it was in the anime, changing the cost from milling 3 to this diet painful choice for machine decks. This is understandable though, as in the 5Ds era where this card originated, there really wasn't much you could foolish with this. They probably changed it to make this card work better with the Mechlord Emperor creation, another video game exclusive that needs you to banish their versions of the Mechlords to summon out a Mechlord Astro Mechanical from your deck, ignoring its summon conditions. Though even for back then standards, Astro Mechanical was pretty bad even if you could bypass its awful summon conditions for this slightly less inconvenient one. And so, even if you were doing Aporia's route in Tag Force 6, you probably wouldn't bother with it. And at number 5, we have Fog Castle, another Tag Force exclusive. This is a field spell that makes it so whenever a monster you control is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon it back to your field, but the monster card zone it used to occupy can no longer be used. Then, if this card leaves you with no usable monster zones, you send it and your entire hand to the graveyard and add back 4 monsters from your graveyard to your hand, but you cannot conduct your battle phase a turn to use the effect. Now, there's a very clear reason why this card is limited in pretty much every Tag Force game it's in. Fog Castle is busted. Essentially, it just protects your entire board in a way that's better than if it just said that all your monsters can't be destroyed, as long as you build your deck around it. Since any monster in your field that gets destroyed will just come back, this card goes extremely well with floating and on-summon effects like Sangan and Stratos, getting you a free search every time these cards are removed by destruction. And even if you will eventually run out of zones to work with, all the search power will more than make up for it. Also, this card's effects will just make filling up your zones more of a bonus than anything else, as getting back 4 monsters from the grave is a crazy effect. In terms of raw card advantage, it's hard to think of a card that can plus you more in the course of a duel than Fog Castle, and luckily the AI in these games is never smart enough to point their MST at it instantly. This card could never be released into the game as is, as imagine a deck that destroys their own cards like Unchained, getting their downsides erased completely, and eventually even adding back their whole engine and hand traps to their hand at once. Fog Palace is one of these cards we'd only ever want to see released just to know how badly nerfed it'd get. And at number 4, we have Mimicat from Duels of the Roses. This card's effect is to select, revive, and control one card from either graveyard. To put it into a more PSCT-like fashion, this card targets any card in any of the graveyards, and if it's a monster, you special summon it to your field. While if it's a spell or trap, you activate it from the graveyard instead. Now, to give some context to those who've never played Duels of the Roses, it's certainly one of the most unique Yu-Gi-Oh video games out there. It plays more like a tactics game than an actual card game, with you moving your units on a grid, having to worry about effects laid down on the terrain, and even having to protect what is called your deck leader. But even within the confines of such a different game, Mimicat still manages to be an ultra powerful option. Enough so that it's not even available through normal gameplay, but rather you need a special password for it. A card like this being put into the real game would surely be game defining. Monster Reborn might not be the staple it once was, as we have limited deck space these days and not many decks make use of it, but a straight up better version of it would surely make some waves. Getting to either get back a monster to keep extending, or just copy a powerful spell that was either used the turn before or was negated, would be way too much utility for a single card. We've already had Pseudo Spacey playing competitive decks solely due to being additional copies of a field spell, and every other meta people discuss of made-to-order Mermaid Outfit Outfitter is maybe playable now, and Mimicat would just be a better version of both. Konami, unfortunately, picked up on how busted this would have been, as when they were finally ready to release a playable version of Mimicat 15 years after Duels of the Roses release, it came packaged with the heavy restrictions of needing to control both Toon World and a Toon monster, as well as only being able to copy cards in your opponent's graveyard and not your own. And at number 3, we have a Cold to Zone. This is a field spell that makes it so that each time a monster is normal or special summoned, that monster gets destroyed, and then you special summon a mask token with the same stats as that monster. This token is level 1 Dark Spellcaster and comes out with the same battle position the monster was in. The video game / anime version of a Cold to Zone would be a really nasty floodgate if it was ever put into the real game. It works kind of like a reverse Black Garden, filling up your zones with tokens as you attempt to play. As a baseline, this card makes all monsters with ignition effects completely useless outside of their stats, as you won't ever get a window to activate their effects. And even if you're bringing out something with a quick effect, it'll force you to immediately use it on summon anyways, if you even can. This is an extremely debilitating effect, as even if most of the good monsters have unsummoned effects, good luck trying to build a board when all your guys are getting replaced by tokens. Pretty much all extra deck summoning methods are rendered completely unusable while this card's on the field. The only way to get around this card is to either put out a monster that's indestructible, which isn't that easy for most decks, or if you manage to summon 2 or more monsters at once, which is also not that easy to come by. If you could just go first, make your own board, and then activate this card, you could be sure that your opponent would never be able to make theirs. This card would be severely nerfed when brought over to the TCG, with the main change being that it was turned into a hard once per turn, making it go from a really annoying floodgate to a piece of spot removal that's almost trivial to play around. And at number 2, we have Illusion Gate. When activated, this normal spell destroys as many monsters your opponent controls as possible. Then you special summon a monster from your opponent's graveyard to your field, ignoring its summoning conditions. However, during the end phase of the turn this card was activated, you lose 90% of your current life points. Who'd have thought a random one-off villain from GX like Camilla would have access to a busted card like this? Illusion Gate is essentially Raigeki combined with Monster Reborn, 2 cards that were long confined to the Forbidden List in Tag Force 1, the game where this card originated. While we get to play 3 Raigekis and 1 Monster Reborn in the TCG nowadays, a card like this would probably still not be okay. While the former sometimes sees plays these days, the biggest downside is that there are many modern monsters who can easily come back and even plus when destroyed. Illusion Gate's second part of this gets rid of that issue entirely, since you can then pluck the problem card out of your opponent's graveyard while it resolves, leaving these kinds of effects no window where they can trigger. Sure, losing 90% of your life points is a lot, but it'll never be enough to kill you. And the game's so fast nowadays that if you don't out your opponent's board, you're going to die anyways. Though even in past formats, this would have been such a crazy effect to be able to resolve that it'd probably be still used anyways. In the anime, this card actually needs you to offer up your own soul to use it, and if you lose the duel, well, you know what happens. making it kind of like the GX version of the Seal of Orichalcos, except it actually gives you an effect that's worth losing your soul over. Even in the Tag Force games where you have access to it, this card is limited, and usually pretty annoying to acquire too. If they ever make an Illusion Gate for the real game, it'll probably be as crippled as the next card was. And finally at number 1, we have the video game version of Sabatel the Philosopher's Stone. This card lets you pay half your life points to add any card from your deck or graveyard to your hand, and then you shuffle this card back into your deck. If you activate this effect 3 times, you also get to target a monster you control, and multiply its attack by the number of monsters you control until the end of the turn. Also, when a Winged Cerebral you control is destroyed, you can add this card from your deck to your hand. Though one thing more broken than Illusion Gate, a card which combines 2 previously banned staples together, is Sabatel. Despite Konami's inexperience and many mistakes they made in very early Yu-Gi-Oh!, they still never printed a card which just adds any other card from your deck to your hand. And this card is even better than that. If Sabatel was ever legal, it'd be played at maximum copies in every single deck, going first or second. It's arguably better than a Pot of Greed and makes Upstart Goblin's theory of a 37 card deck look like a bad joke. On the dice roll, just add your starter from your deck to your hand. Already have it? Then any going first staple will do. Going second, you can choose exactly which card your opponent's board is going to lose to. All of this while still having less of a life point cost than Illusion Gate. This card is probably good enough to make Winged Cerebral a consideration in the modern game, though if it kept that part of the effect, it'd be a ruling's nightmare. Cards that summon themselves from the deck is one thing, but a card which triggers an effect from the deck would be a new path entirely. And since it's a when you can, it'd even open up the avenue for a card to miss timing straight from the deck. This card is so broken that even in the anime they had to come up with a reason why Jaden could only use it for a single duel and never again. And even in the games, it's often straight up forbidden unless you change the ban list. It got rightfully debuffed in the ground when being brought over, now requiring you to have a Winged Cerebral in your graveyard to even activate it and adding either Polymerization or a fusion spell instead of just any card. It's a shame standalone Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games have pretty much stopped being a thing ever since Master Duel came out, if only because we will never see a card to top this version of Sabatel ever again.
In this video, we'll go over 10 cards that are way too good for their respective archetypes, and rank them in how much better they are than their archetype. And at number 10, we have Ally of Justice Cataster. This card is part of the Ally of Justice archetype, which is probably one of the worst archetypes in the game's history. Although this particular synchro monster is one of the better level 5 synchro monsters in the game, to the point where they still haven't added it to Duel Links because it's a little bit too good. As what this card does is if it battles a non-dark monster, it destroys that monster at the start of the damage step. And with generic materials and a decent attack at 2200, this was the go-to card if you just wanted to selectively destroy your opponent's cards, and could go into level 5 synchros. Although synchro monsters don't get used as much as they used to, and they released a whole bunch of other good level 5 synchro monsters over the years after Ally of Justice, that it kind of only makes this list because it was so much better than the archetype it's part of. And it's a really good starting point to show what this list is kind of about. And at number 9, we have Gagaga Cowboy. This is a rank 4 monster who has 2 effects. One of them allows you to detach an Exceeds material in order to allow this card to gain 1000 attack, and an opponent's monsters to lose 500 attack if it attacks a monster. And if this card is in defense position, you can detach a material to inflict 800 points of burn damage to your opponent. And you can only use 1 effect per turn. And the main use of this card was to bring it out in defense position to inflict 800 points of damage. And this effect was so good that this card is probably the most played Exceeds monster in the game's history, and codified the term cowboy for game, as if you could just get your opponent to 800 or less life points, you basically won the game, as you could just go into Gaga Cowboy during your main phase 2 to inflict the burn damage to finish off your opponent. Having your life points under 1000 was a real concern before Master Rule 4, because Gaga Cowboy existed. And one of the most heavily played rank 4 monsters in the game, which surprisingly still sees lots of play even today, is technically part of the Gagaga archetype. Now, many of you probably don't know what this archetype does, and that's because it's kind of a small one, whose gimmick was around changing their levels of their monsters to be around 1 to 8. And for an archetype all about changing the levels of their monsters, they had 3 rank 4 monsters as their only extra deck support, which was kind of weird that they didn't have them of a whole bunch of different kinds of ranks. But no one really played them anyway, so I guess it didn't matter. And at number 8, we have Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon. Ultimate Falcon is one of the best targets if you have the ability to cheat a monster out of your extra deck, because baseline, it has 3500 attack and is immune to all card effects. and that stat line in effect is good enough to kind of instant win against some decks. So it sees a lot of play alongside cards like Waking the Dragon, which occasionally sees extra deck play in competitive decks. Ultimate Falcon definitely sees a lot more play than the archetype it's part of, the Raid Raptors, who are all about dark winged beast monsters that go into Xyz monsters and then rank them up. As another one of Raid Raptor's Ultimate Falcon's effects is that if this card has a Raid Raptor monster as one of its Xyz materials, it gains an additional effect where you can reduce the attack of all of your opponent's monsters by 1000 during the end phase. And this card is so rarely brought out properly to actually gain this effect that I kind of forgot what its other effect even was, even though I've talked about this card many times in other top 10 lists. Generally, really good cards will show up a lot in my videos, so I usually have all of their effects and everything about them memorized, except Ultimate Falcon. I always have to look up that second effect because it's never used. Now, the archetype it's part of is not that bad. It has even seen some competitive play in the past, and they recently got a really good Link monster that might allow them to see more play in the future. So this one kind of gets a low spot on this list, because I kind of gauge these cards based on the gap of how good they are in comparison to their archetype. Ultimate Falcon is a good card, but its archetype isn't half bad either. Not top tier, but not half bad. So it doesn't have a big enough gap to make a higher spot on this list, mainly because the other ones are a lot better. And at number 7, we have Isolde, Two Tales of the Noble Knights. This is a Link 2 monster that requires 2 warriors as its materials and has 2 really good effects. The first one is when this card is Link summoned, you can add any one warrior monster from your deck to your hand. You just can't use it that turn. Its other effect allows you to send equipped spell cards with different names from your deck to the graveyard to special summon a warrior type monster from your deck who has a level equal to the amount of cards you sent to the graveyard. So if you send 1 equipped spell card, you can special summon a level 1 warrior type monster, and etc, etc. And because of this card, previously unplayed cards like Divine Sword Phoenix Blade started seeing lots of play. And Isolde is one of the best warrior support Link monsters in the game, and warrior types are the most plentiful type of monster in the game. So that's actually a pretty big deal. And Isolde is technically part of the Noble Knight archetype, which is an archetype about warrior-type monsters who use equipped spell cards, so the effects kind of fit. And Noble Knights have seen a handful of play over the years, and they occasionally get new support. So even though Isolde is a super good Link monster that's used in every warrior deck, the archetype it's part of isn't half bad either. Noble Knight decks have topped a lot of events in the past, which is why this card only gets the number 7 spot on this list, but still definitely makes this list, because Noble Knights are nowhere near as good as this one Link monster is. And at number 6, we have Dino Wrestler Pancratops. This card has 2 effects. The first one allows it to special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls more monsters than you do. And with it being a level 7 monster with 2600 attack, this is a super good effect for this card to have for its stat line. Its other effect allows it to tribute a Dino Wrestler monster to destroy 1 card on the field. And since this effect is a quick effect, meaning it can be used during either player's turn whenever you want, gives this card disruption during your opponent's turn, or an out to your opponent trying to selectively pick this card off. Spell Speed 2 destruction effects are super good, and generally only attached to really powerful cards that eventually get banned or limited, which was the case with this card, which is currently limited to 1 copy per deck. Because both of its effects are super good, being able to bring itself out easily and selectively destroy any 1 card on a quick effect means this card saw tons of competitive play in all kinds of decks, to the point where they had to limit it because it was too good and was seeing too much play, which cannot be said about the archetype it's part of, which sees no play at all. And I'm sure most people don't even know how Dino Wrestlers work. Well, I actually didn't know how they worked either, so I had to look it up. Apparently, they're all about the battle phase and have effects that can only be activated when your opponent controls more monsters than you. And since they're all dinosaur type monsters, there's no real reason to play them over the much better generic dinosaur support cards, which is why I assume they don't see very much play, and why Pancratops is a staple card in normal dinosaur decks as well. Although he's just a pretty good staple card in pretty much any deck, to be honest. And at number 5, we have Heavy Metal Foes Electromite. This is a Link 2 Pendulum support Link monster who has 3 effects that basically allow you to go +1 in card advantage while setting up your extra deck with choice Pendulum monsters. As when this card is Link summoned, you can put a Pendulum monster from your deck into your extra deck face up. It can also selectively destroy one of your face-up cards in order to add a pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. And if a card in your pendulum zone leaves the field, you get to draw one card. All three of these effects are good in pretty much all pendulum decks, as all pendulum decks like to put pendulum monsters into their extra deck face-up, they like to add those cards back to their hand, and they like to destroy their own cards, including their own scales. And they like to draw cards on their pendulum monsters leaving the pendulum zone. And this card is currently banned for being a little bit too good at supporting all pendulum monsters. And this card is part of the Metal Foes archetype, which is a pendulum archetype that has a lot of neural monsters in it, who all have effects that relate to destroying your cards and gaining advantage off of that, as well as going into fusion monsters. And the Metal Foes archetype did see competitive play in the past, because the pendulum monsters could destroy other cards they controlled instead of their own scales, which just combos very well with a lot of decks that like to destroy their own cards. But they kind of stopped seeing play after Master Rule 4, which heavily nerfed pretty much all pendulum decks, including Metal Foes, and Heavy Metal Foes was supposed to be a very good link monster to kind of help pendulum decks, with how heavily restricted they were with the new format, and did such a good job that it worked better in non-Metal Foes decks, so they just kind of stopped seeing play, while Magician and Endymion decks were basically the go-to pendulum decks of the link format. And at number 4, we have Magician's Souls. This is a Dark Magician support card, which has a hand effect to send a level 6 or higher spellcaster type monster from your deck to the graveyard as a cost, which then allows you to activate one of two of its effects, where it can either special summon itself, or send itself to the graveyard to special summon a Dark Magician monster from your graveyard. It also has another effect on the field where you can send up to 2 spell or trap cards from your hand or field to the graveyard to draw that many cards. Now, this card was obviously meant as Dark Magician support, but since it works on any level 6 or higher spellcaster type monster, it sees play in all kinds of different competitive meta decks, since there's a couple of good targets to send to the graveyard with this card, like how Spiral decks can send Spiral Master Plan to the graveyard in order to use it to great benefit. Other decks like to use Apprentice Illusion Magician with Magician's Souls as an engine, since the card can special summon itself by discarding one card, which activates danger effects. The card is so good in other decks because of its ability to special summon itself and also trade in some of your spell or traps for extra draws. It's an engine kind of like Brilliant Fusion, except the Garnet of the Magician's Souls engine is also useful for combo plays on its own. And since technically this card was created for the Dark Magician archetype, and it has allowed Dark Magician decks to see some competitive success, it is just definitely used much more often in all kinds of other decks instead, and has very much overshadowed the deck it's originally part of. And at number 3, we have Lavalval Chain. This is a rank 4 Xyz monster with generic materials who has the effect to once per turn send one card from your deck to the graveyard. Or you can choose a monster from your deck and place it on top of your deck. And the reason this card is currently banned is for the effect of sending any one card from your deck to the graveyard, as that's an incredibly good effect for a wide range of decks, especially when you can gain that effect with any 2 level 4 monsters, as there is currently a wide range of cards restricted on the ban list that have effects to send specific types of cards from your deck to the graveyard. And Laval Chain allows you to send any spell, trap, or monster card. It is the main combo piece in all kinds of OTK and FTK strategies, a place that is currently taken up by Curious, the Lightsworn Dominion, who has the same effect of sending a card from your deck to the graveyard, but is a little bit harder to bring out, as it requires 3 monsters of the same attributes but different types as its materials. Now, the Laval archetype itself is all about effects that activate in the graveyard, while having a certain number of Laval monsters in your graveyard first, before you can use those effects. So, this card's effect does make sense within its archetype, of selectively sending those cards to the graveyard. And Laval decks even saw some competitive playing in Duel Links when they first came out. They don't really see play in normal Yu-Gi-Oh though, except for this one lone card, which is just very good generic support for a wide range of different archetypes and strategies. And at number 2, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. This card is in the top 50 of the most played cards in the game, as it appears very frequently in the side decks of competitive decks, because what it does is it allows you to tribute summon this card to your opponent's side of the field by tributing 3 of their monsters. And since getting rid of 3 of your opponent's monsters for this card summon counts as just a normal summoning condition and not an effect, your opponent can't actually play around this. And very few cards are immune to this card's form of removal. So since your opponent can't really negate the summon, and since it's a normal summon for you, this is one of the best ways to break an opponent's unbreakable board of negates, indestructible monsters, or floodgates, and to get rid of 3 of them at once at that. And all you lose in that exchange is just 1 card from your hand and your normal summon for the turn, which is a pretty good price to pay for getting rid of cards your opponent probably put a ton of resources into, and can sometimes just win you the game on its own. Now, this card does have other effects. It can also tribute itself to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions, and setting its attack and defense to 4,000. And this card is technically part of the God card archetype, which is an incredibly small archetype notable for being the only cards in the game with the Divine Beast types and the Divine Attribute, which this card shares. And the God cards are not very good, and the only one that did see competitive play was definitely not the Winged Dragon of Ra. Although since this one card does see so much play in so many different kinds of decks, Spear Mode is technically the most used God card in the game, and this one definitely deserves a high spot on this list, for being such an incredibly useful card in comparison to the archetype it comes from, which isn't very competitive at all. However, I think the number 1 spot on this list just barely beats out Spear Mode because its gap is much higher. And at number 1, we have Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. This is a synchro monster which was banned for 2 years, and basically always saw play whenever it wasn't banned. Trishula has the effect that when it's synchro summoned, you can banish 3 cards from your opponent. 1 random one from their hand, 1 from their field, and 1 from their graveyard. Now, the thing to note about this card's effect, it's not once per turn, and it doesn't target. So you can selectively get rid of cards on your opponent's side of the field, and they can't actually respond to it with something like Pancratops, tributing itself in order to avoid getting destroyed by targeted effects, since you can just choose something else after it gets rid of itself. Now, this card is supposed to be bounced around the fact that it's difficult to synchro summon, as it's a level 9 monster that requires at least 3 materials, 1 tuner and 2 or more non-tuners. But being able to get rid of 3 cards on its summon is definitely worth that cost, especially since you can use cards like Desynchro in order to send it back to the extra deck to get your synchro materials back in order to just go into it again and use its effect for a second time. There are currently 2 other monsters in the game who were created directly based off of Trishula, called Necros of Trishula, and Trishula the Dragon of Icy Imprisonment, both of which have similar effects of banishing 3 cards, and both of them have hard once per turns on their effects. So there's no way to abuse it to use their effects multiple times like you can with the original Trishula. Because its effect was just that strong, they made sure to put limitations on its retrains. And once the new Master Rule revisions come through, and synchro monsters are easier to bring out than they are now, you can expect Trishula to probably be put on the ban list again in some way. Because as it is now in Master Rule 4, it still sees consistent play, and the archetype Trishula is part of, the Ice Barriers, is another one of those incredibly terrible and mediocre archetypes like the Ally of Justice. The Ice Barriers are not at all good at bringing out Trishula, despite the fact that it was made for them. And the Ice Barriers kind of have a long-running tradition of having very mediocre main deck monsters, while having some of the best synchro monsters in the game, as 2 of the other Ice Barriers synchro monsters also appeared on the ban list, with one of them getting an errata to its effect before it was removed from being banned. And even the 4th and final Ice Barrier synchro monster is pretty good. So with 3 of the 4 synchro monsters appearing on the banned list, it's almost comical that none of the other Ice Barrier main deck monsters are even close to as good as their synchros, which is why there is such a huge gap between Trishula being super good, to the point where it may get banned again in the future, in comparison to the archetype it's technically supposed to be part of. Which is why I think Trishula is the perfect example of what this list is supposed to be about, and just barely takes the number 1 spot, since I think the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode is also a hot contender for this spot. In this list, we'll go over monsters that require 3 tributes to be summoned, a special requirement only achieved by card effects, as normally, you only need 2 tributes max for level 7 or higher monsters. And usually the reason these cards require so many tributes is because the monsters themselves are really strong, and this list will try to rank the 10 best. At number 10, we have Slifer the Sky Dragon. This card gains 1,000 attack for each card in your hand, and has the effect where if your opponent summons a monster in face-up attack position, that monster loses 2,000 attack, and is destroyed if their attack reaches 0 with this effect. This effect is a pretty decent shutdown on your opponent's cards, and requires them to basically special summon all their small monsters in defense mode, and is completely unavoidable by links. Its attack point gain effect isn't the best thing in the world though. Usually you commit a lot of resources to get this card out, which leaves you with a small hand afterwards. So it almost always has low attack points in any kind of consistent deck that can bring him out quickly. Not to say there aren't gimmick decks that can bring him out and draw a bunch of cards, but I will say none of those decks are consistent. Honestly, one of the best uses of Slifer is to special summon it during your opponent's turn to slow down your opponent for that turn, as Slifer destroys himself at the end of the turn it's special summoned. But it can be special summoned, so it's a viable use of a pretty good continuous effect, and bypasses its tough summoning requirement of 3 tributes and a normal summon. This card was also the god card the main character in the original Yu-Gi-Oh anime used, so it's one of the more popular god cards, even if it's only the second best when it comes to their TCG counterparts. Number 9, the Tripper Mercury. When this card is tribute summoned, you can change all monsters on the field to face up attack position, and this card can attack twice. But also, if you tribute 3 monsters for this card summoned, it gains an extra effect, where all monsters your opponent control will lose attack equal to their original attack, basically making all of their attacks 0, and making it real easy to beat over them with your brand new double attacker on the field. There are very few cards that can attack twice with no restrictions, and most of them have low attack. Tripper Mercury kind of has low attack for a 3 tribute type monster, but you can also bring it out in other ways, and it will still have its double attack effect. Now, what's good about its 3 tribute effect is that it doesn't target and makes it real easy to beat over just about anything. So if your opponent is running some kind of hard to kill monster that can't be targeted by card effects, Mercury can get over it and attack again. But that's pretty hard to pull off, as 3 tributes is kind of steep for its effect. It's a good effect, but not that good, and that's why it's only number 9. Number 8, the Wicked Avatar. When this card is summoned, your opponent can't activate spell or trap cards until the end of their second turn after this card was summoned, and its attack is 100 higher than whatever the highest attack is on the field, which changes all the time. So this card basically locks your opponent into only monster effects for 2 turns, and can beat over any monster. And that's a pretty good effect. If you're going against a deck that lives by their spells or traps, this lockdown can basically win you the game. But with how prevalent monster effects are in Yu-Gi-Oh! And how they're the preferred way of destroying monsters, the Wicked Avatar is easily stopped by a ton of decks, and only really shines in specific matchups against spell or trap heavy decks. Number 7, Beast King Barbaros. This card has 3 ways to summon it. The first is you can normal summon it without tributing, but its original attack becomes 1900, which is a perfectly reasonable amount for a normal summon. Its second way is the normal way with 2 tributes, as it's a level 8 monster. And the third way is with 3 tributes, and if summoned this way, destroys all cards on your opponent's side of the field. Beast King Barbaros is just a straight up power cramped version of Moisture Creature and Guilford the Lightning. Both cards require 3 tributes and destroy either spell and traps or monsters, while Beast King has 3 advantages over them: a higher attack, can clear both spell traps and monsters, and an alternative way to summon it, so it's never dead in hand. Beast King actually saw some play in meta decks over the years for its pure versatility and board wipe status, as well as being able to convert its attack points back to 3000 from 1900 if you negate its effects with like a Forbidden Chalice or something. Number 6, Destiny Hero Plasma. This is the only card on this list that can special summon itself with 3 tributes, making it a little easier to bring out than a normal summon requiring 3 tributes, as since its tributes count as a cost to an effect instead of a normal summon, you can actually tribute stuff like scapegoat tokens for it. Now, what Plasma's effects are, is it can absorb 1 monster your opponent controls and gain half its attack. And also, while it's face up, all your opponent's monster effects on the field are negated. It's basically a one-way skill drain, an effect so good it can sometimes win you the game on its own, as most decks are very monster effect heavy, with the majority of those effects taking place on the field. So, easy to bring out, non-destruction monster removal, and a great lockdown effect makes it a great monster deserving of its 3 tributes. Number 5, Obelisk the Tormentor. Obelisk is the best of the 3 god cards, because it's the only one with protection on the field. You see, Obelisk can't be targeted by card effects, its normal summon can't be negated, and you contribute 2 monsters to destroy all monsters your opponent controls. But it can't attack that turn. And with a built-in body of 4,000 attack and defense, it's a hard wall to beat over. There were some decks that saw success in the past that would turbo out Obelisk and basically win since their opponent couldn't get rid of it. Of course, nowadays, there are a handful of really common run extra deck monsters that can take out Obelisk real easily, which means he's not really in win condition in himself anymore, and only really high on the spot for its past accomplishments of actually being a relevant card in the metagame that was also good in the anime. Because anime god cards were brokenly powerful, and they lost pretty much all of that status when brought over to the real trading card game, with Obelisk losing the least amount of abilities of the 3, and being the only one to keep its protection abilities, even if a little watered down version of them. Number 4, Metaltron 12, the True Draco Combatant. This card can use face-up continuous spell and trap cards as its tributes as well as monsters, and it gains immunity to effects of those cards used for its summon. So, if you use a spell, trap, and monster for its summon, it basically becomes immune to all card effects. But that's all it does on the field. It's just a 3k beatstick that's immune to everything, or a slightly weaker Ultimate Falcon. But when this card is destroyed, it can float into a fusion, synchro, or exceeds monster from your extra deck that isn't light or dark type, which ironically means it can't float into Ultimate Falcon. But it can float into other good extra deck monsters, like Nichiria Exteria or Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon. So its floating effect is actually pretty great. And considering the archetype it belongs to is all about getting continuous spell and traps on the field anyway, it can be brought out easily too. Number 3, Apocryphort Skybase. This card is one of the better 3 tribute monsters that never really saw much play, but I'll explain more about that when I go over the number 1 spot. This card requires 3 Klee monsters as tributes, and seeing as the archetype has ways to special summon a lot of monsters quickly, has monsters with good effects that go off when tributed, and has ways to supplement more tribute fodder, bringing out Skybase is not at all an issue. When tribute summoned, it's immune to spell and traps, and monster effects if the level and rank is less than Skybase's. And seeing as it's level 9, and the average level of monsters is 8 and below, it has very good protection. And its final effect is basically a change of heart, where you can just steal one of your opponent's monsters for a turn. And at 2900 attack, it's not easy to beat over, but not as hard as cards like Obelisk. Everything about the card is good. Good protection, good effect, decent stats, easy to bring out within its archetype, so it deserves a high spot on the list despite the fact that no one really played the card very often. Number 2, Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. Now, on the opposite end of Skybase, this card sees the most amount of play currently out of all the cards on this list. This card effect basically lets you tribute it to special summon Winged Dragon of Ra from your deck, and give it 4,000 attack and defense, which is pretty nice, as Winged Dragon of Ra has no stats, and a pretty bad effect for gaining attack. So Sphere Mode helps solve one of Ra's biggest weaknesses. Only, Sphere Mode is not used for its effect. It's used for its summoning condition. You see, in order to summon this card, you have to tribute 3 monsters. Only, Sphere Mode lets you tribute 3 of your monsters, or 3 of your opponent's monsters. So, like Kaijus, being able to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters is a great way to break a board set up to stop you from playing. And all you lose in the process is your normal summon for that turn, and giving your opponent a card that they can then use for link plays on their turn. Sphere Mode is one of the best mass removal cards you can add to your side deck to turn the game around in your favor, and its actual intended use of special summoning Winged Dragon of Ra is basically never used outside of gimmicks. Now, I'm not sure Sphere Mode counts as a god card, since it's technically like a support card for one of the god cards, but if you do count it as part of Ra, then all 3 did make this list kind of. And now, number 1, Apocryphort Towers. Out of all the cards in this list, this was the only one banned for being too good of a boss monster, and only recently came off the semi-limited list. Towers is the reason Skybase saw basically no play, and that's because it's another Klee monster that requires 3 tributes for its summon. Towers has the same summoning condition and protection as Skybase, 3 Klee monsters, and immune to spell and trap effects, plus monsters with a lower level and rank than it. The fact that Towers is level 10 means it gets a little more coverage than Skybase. It also has 1 extra effect, as well as 100 higher attack. While out, all special summon monsters lose 500 attack and defense, making its one weakness to being destroyed by battle harder to achieve. And why cards like Diamond King Crab, a card no one used before Towers Turbo was a thing, all of a sudden became a meta card included in everyone's extra deck, because it could actually destroy towers by battle. And its other effect was, once per turn, you could make your opponent send one of their monsters to the graveyard from their hand or field. And this was the nasty effect that really elevated towers to top tier status. If you went first and brought out towers, you could start the duel with an incredibly hard monster to get rid of, plus 1 less card in your opponent's opening hand. Since the effect forces your opponent to send a monster to the graveyard, it technically doesn't target, or count as sending those monsters to the graveyard by a card effect. So if your opponent has no other monsters, they have to send their hard-to-kill boss monster to the graveyard with Tower's effect. Or, if they send a card to the graveyard with a floating effect that requires it to be sent there by a card effect, like the Shadows, it won't activate, since the effect forces your opponent to perform an action which doesn't count as a card effect for those kinds of floating effects. So Towers was easy to bring out, immune to most forms of removal, hard to beat over by battle, and had a non-targeting removal that dodges a lot of floating effects, making it a monster of a boss card. And it's no reason no one played Skybase, a solid card with good effects, when you could play this borderline broken card instead. And that's why Towers is the best monster that requires 3 tributes.
In Norse mythology, Thor, Loki, and Odin are the most famous and powerful trio. Known for their legendary stories and moments, they've always been depicted in media as a force to be reckoned with. Leave it to Konami to not make this the case in Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduced in the 5D anime and given a hype set properly named Storm of Ragnarok, the Nordic/Iser archetype was expected to overtake the TCG and compete with the best in the format. From weak effects to head-scratching conditions to support not really meshing well. We'll be talking about all the reasons why the Nordics had a Viking's death in the TCG. We'll start with the Nordic Beast that lead to Thor. Tangröster of the Nordic Beast was a level 3 Earth Beast with 800 attack and 1100 defense. When a monster you control is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand. When this card is changed from defense position to attack position, you can special summon a Nordic monster from your deck in face-up defense position. Goldfax of the Nordic Beast was a light level 4 tuner with 1600 attack and 1000 defense. And when your opponent controls a synchro monster and you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. Grimir of the Nordic Beast was a dark level 4 with 800 attack and 1900 defense. When Grimir battles a level 4 lower monster, during damage calculation, you can return your opponent's monster to the hand. And finally, Tangröster of the Nordic Beast was a level 3 with 1200 attack and 800 defense that would spawn 2 level 3 Nordic Beast tokens when it was destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard. Nothing in the Nordic Beast stood out to be good. Most of the monsters were battle-oriented, needing to be either destroyed by battle or other cards needing to destroy them by battle to get their effects. They also didn't have any extensions, with their only extension being Goldfax, who had a terrible Cyber Dragon-esque effect, needing your opponent to control a single monster to be able to special summon it. So, we know the Nordic Beasts weren't carrying the deck, but what about the other 2 sub-archetypes? Moving on to the Nordic Alfars, Yolsoth of the Nordic Alfar was a light level 4 spellcaster with 1400 attack and 1200 defense. When normal summoned, you can target a face-up monster you control, except this card, and special summon a Nordic monster from your hand with a level less than or equal to the face-up's level. Svaltorf was a dark level 5 tuner with 1400 attack and 1600 defense. That lets you target a Nordic monster from your graveyard and add it to your hand when it's normal summoned. Finally, Diverg was a level 1 light warrior with 100 attack and 1000 defense. That gives you an additional normal summon or set when you normal summon it. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target a Nordic relic card in your graveyard and add it to your hand. While the Alfars were barely put together as a sub-archetype, they synergized better than the Nordic Beasts. Diverg and Svaltar were the best 1-2 combo, with you being able to play Diverg, fetch a second normal summon in order to tribute for Diverg to Staltrof to grab a Nordic relic from your grave in the process. However, they also suffered from a lack of extenders and special summons that they needed in order to summon their high-level synchros. However, the Nordic Ascendants didn't have this problem, as they had a starter that could instantly make the All-Father in 1 turn. Well, sort of.
Valkyrie the Nordic Ascendant was a level 2 light fairy tuner monster. When it's normal summoned, if your opponent controls a monster and you control no other monsters, you can banish 2 Nordic monsters from your hand in order to special summon 2 level 4 Ironheart Jar tokens in defense position. Mimir was a level 2 Dark Fairy monster that, once per turn during your standby phase, would allow you to send a spell card from your hand to the graveyard to special summon it from the graveyard if you control a Nordic monster. Vanadis was a level 4 Dark Fairy tuner monster that could be used as a substitute for any Nordic tuner for a synchro summon. But if this card is used as synchro material, the rest of the monsters must be Nordic monsters. Once per turn, you can send a Nordic monster from your deck to the graveyard to make this card's level become that set monster's level until the end of the turn. Finally, though not an Ascendant, Tyr, the Nordic Champion, was a level 4 warrior monster which prevented your Nordic monsters from being targeted by attacks. But if there's no other Nordic monster in the field, destroy this card. Vanadis is one of the better highlights for the Nordic archetype, as it was the only tuner you could use for all 3 Nordic gods. Valkyrie would be the MVP for the Ascendants at least. Though it took your opponent controlling a monster for its effect to be live, it was the quickest way to summon Odin, as the card was able to summon the Father of the Aesir himself all by himself with the tokens that it spawned. The main issue all 3 of them had was they had no cohesion with one another outside of their names being Nordic. Their effects also relied heavily on normal summoning and barely having little to no extenders to be able to pop out their respective synchros. If it went for Vanadis being able to treat itself as any Nordic tuner, the deck probably would have been even more unplayable. Decks with multiple sub-archetypes usually don't do well due to engines clashing and combos requiring specific pieces to function as a deck. If you think that's disappointing, wait until you see what the Nordic gods do. Thor, Loki, and Odin were all level 10 synchro monsters. Thor required a Nordic beast tuner plus 2 or more non-tuner monsters. Once per turn, you can negate the effects of all face-up monsters your opponent controls currently. During the end phase, if this face-up card you controlled is destroyed by your opponent's card by battle or effect and sent to the graveyard, you can banish a Nordic beast monster from your grave to special summon this card from the graveyard and inflict 800 damage to your opponent. Loki required a Nordic Alfar tuner plus 2 or more non-tuners. Once per turn, you can negate the activation of a spell or trap card during your battle phase. During the end phase, if this face-up card you control is destroyed by your opponent's card effect and sent to the graveyard, you can banish a Nordic Alfar monster from your graveyard to special summon it back and add a trap card from your graveyard to your hand. Odin took a Nordic Ascendant tuner plus 2 or more non-tuners, and once per turn, you can make it unaffected by spell and trap cards until the end of the turn. During the end phase, if it is destroyed in your possession by your opponent and sent to the graveyard, you can banish a Nordic Ascendant monster in your grave to special summon it back. For the amount of material and requirements it took to make these monsters, the effects were truly lackluster. Level 10 synchro monsters weren't vast in the TCG then, but they usually came with powerful game-changing effects if you could make them. However, these effects weren't worth the materials used to make them. Between an effect that turned off effects for current cards on the field, a spell and trap card negate during the battle phase only, and immunity that you have to activate manually, these just made Nordics not worth it to summon, even with their ability to revive themselves. It's not like they were invulnerable on summon either. A quick bottomless trap hole or compulse would make quick work of keeping Ragnarok from happening. What's even more grievous is that their revival effects didn't do anything if they were banished. So you were probably thinking maybe the spell and trap cards kept them upright. Well, that wasn't really the case either. Nordics had 4 spell cards to work with alongside 8 traps. For spells, we start with the field spell Nordic Lights, which prevented all Nordic monsters from being destroyed by battle, but destroyed all Nordics on the field when it's destroyed. Nordic Relic Drumpier was an equipped spell which could only be equipped to a Nordic or Aesir monster. The monster gains 800 attack, and when a card effect destroys this card, you can add a Nordic Relic card from your deck to your hand. March Towards Ragnarok is next. It's a quick play spell that targets an Aesir monster you control and negates its effects. In return, that monster is unaffected by spell and trap cards until the end of the turn. Finally, Götterdämmerung was a continuous spell that lets you target one Aesir monster you control and give it to your opponent. During your opponent's next end phase, destroy that monster and banish all cards your opponent controls. The spells were on the wonky side of the Nordic/Aesir support, making it hard to justify running. Nordic Lights was a legit 1 MST away from emptying your field. Dranpnir was a conditional searcher that needed to be equipped just to get popped for you to try to search your only Nordic relics. March Towards Ragnarok made your Aesir monsters only useful in the battle phase at best due to its protection, but it negated your Nordic gods' effects. And Götterdämmerung was a gimmick board wipe that would probably not last very long on the field, and cause you to lose your revival effect due to you not controlling it when Götterdämmerung pops it. Outside of the occasional use of March Towards Ragnarok, none of these cards warranted any play in the deck. The traps also lived up to the statement, except for one of them. Gleipnir, the Fetters of Fenrir, was a trap card that added one Nordic monster from your deck to your hand. Nordic Relic Megajord lets you target an Aesir or a Nordic monster you control and doubles attack and defense until the end of the turn, but it can't attack your opponent directly. Divine Relic Mjolnir targets one Aesir monster you control to give it the ability to attack a second time during the battle phase this turn. Solemn Authority was a continuous trap that targets an Aesir monster and makes it unaffected by card effects while it's on the field.
but destroy this card during the second standby phase after activation. Nordic Relic Brisingamen targets one face-up monster you control and one face-up monster your opponent controls, and makes the attack of the first target equal to the attack of the second target until the end of the turn. Nordic Relic Levitine targets one face-up monster in the field that destroyed a monster by battle this turn, and destroys it. Cards and effects can't be activated in response to this card. The Golden Apples gives you life points equal to the battle damage you took while controlling no monsters, and if you do, special summon a Malice token. Its attack and defense is equal to the battle damage you took. Nordic Relic Gungnir banishes a Nordic or Asia monster to target one card in the field and destroy it, and brings the monster you banished back to your side of the field during the second standby phase after activation in face-up attack position. To round it all off, Odin's Eye was a continuous trap that lets you target one Asia monster once per turn during the standby phase, negate its effects until the end of the turn. If you do, you get to look at your opponent's hand and set cards, and your opponent can't activate cards or effects in response to this effect's activation. The main issue with Nordics continued with their spell and trap cards. Incohesive effects, super conditional requirements to activate the cards, and effects that didn't warrant play were the main suspect that made Nordics nothing more than a pile of cards. It's sad to see that the only card that consistently saw play from the plethora of trap cards was Gleipnir, and it was barely a good searcher because it was on a trap card. The other cards were really seen as terrible because they either required you to target a certain monster you control and either banish it or negate the effect of the monster you control to meet the requirements, leaving you with either just a crappy beat stick or a vulnerable field. So, for their debut in the TCG, these Norse Legends archetypes had little to no synergy, issues making their synchros, wonky spells and traps, boss monsters with mediocre effects, and one of the worst solemns ever to be printed. So when anyone says the deck made no impact and just took up pack space, you now understand why. On May 10th, 2011, Konami introduced the newest TCG set, Extreme Victory. Though Nordic/Asia didn't receive an Extreme Victory with this next card, it was a slight win with the introduction of Mara the Nordic Alfar, a level 2 Dark Tuner that could only be used as a synchro material alongside 2 Nordic monsters from your hand. There are a couple of pros and cons with this card. The upside is you don't risk putting your synchro materials on the field to get blown up. You could also synchro now with just having Mara on the field and could easily bring out Loki. The downside was this was only good for the Nordic Alfars and Loki, meaning using it for any other Nordic god was out of the question, since they needed either a Nordic Beast or an Ascendant Tuner to be synchro summoned. So the support made players favor Loki builds more due to Mara's ability. It also didn't fix the fact that the deck still lacked extenders, good surge power, and synergy to be playable on a casual or competitive field. On October 24th, 2014, Konami continued its Nordic support in Legendary Collection 5Ds, and also made sure the support was abysmal. Vendread the Nordic Wolf was a level 10 Dark Beast with 4,000 attack and defense. It can't be normal summoned or set, and can be special summoned in defense position during the main phase 2, from your hand to your opponent's field if there's an Asia monster on your side of the field. If there is no Asia monster, destroy this card. At the start of the battle phase, change all defense position monsters you control to face-up attack position, and both players take any battle damage from attacks involving this card. Jormungandr the Nordic Serpent was a level 8 Dark Dragon with 3,000 attack and defense. Like Nordic Wolf, it can't be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned in the same way as well. If this face-up defense position card is changed to attack position, take 3,000 damage. This effect can only be used once while it's face-up on the field. If the effect seems terrible, that's because they're supposed to be, as you'd want to make your Asia synchro monster and then special summon these cards to your opponent's field to combo with each of them using Fenrir to change Jormungandr to attack position, and then burn your opponent for 3,000 with Jormungandr's effect. The only issue is that the monsters need an Asia monster on the field, which took time due to how slowly Nordics would make their synchros. The combo didn't seem any good either. Jormungandr's effect could only be used once while it's face up, and essentially it just gave your opponent a 4,000 attack and 3,000 attack beat stick, which was more than enough to take down almost any monster you controlled, and easily get these Nordic calamities off the field. Nordics at this time was already considered a bust, too slow to keep up with the meta. Unable to even establish a board, let alone its boss monsters, what chance did it have at being a successful archetype? At this point, the only way for Nordics to work is to make a card that can turbo out its material, which they did do during the Link format. In the Legendary Hero deck, Nordics were given a Link 1 in Gullveig of the Nordic Ascendant. This Link 1 requires just one level 5 or lower Nordic monster to be made. When it's Link summoned, you can banish up to 3 cards from your hand and or field to special summon Nordic monsters from your deck in defense position up to the number of cards you banish with the effect. But then you're locked into only special summon Asia monsters, and you can't normal summon a set for the rest of the turn. Your opponent cannot target the monster this card points to with card effects, or target Gullveig for attacks. To print an insane card like this for an archetype proves how unplayable Nordics were before making this card. To be able to have a card that pulls whatever materials you need to build your board directly from your deck is one of the most frowned upon mechanics in the game, as cards like these either get limited or straight out banned. For a deck to have this effect on a Link 1, and hilariously, had the potential to pump out 3 monsters, literally would likely mean the deck would be ridiculously good. Too bad the monsters they brought out were Nordic ones. With access to no other good cards, the deck lived and died by Gullveig. Either you would get your one Nordic monster protected by Gullveig, or a Gullveig's effect would be negated by a hand trap, and you'd get scooped up worse than Loki did by Hulk and the Avengers. It also didn't change the fact that just having a Gullveig plus a Nordic God end board didn't strike fear in any player's hearts. By 2018, non-targeting effects were taking the TCG by storm, making protection from Gullveig not as powerful as it seemed. Let's not forget that the Nordic gods weren't all that great either. Their effects didn't have any impact as they were slow ignition effects that didn't do anything during your opponent's turn. So even with one of the strongest Link 1 monsters to be printed just for them, Nordics still weren't that good. At this point, it was just about having them be playable. They would get further support for their Link in Soul Fusion. Alvis of the Nordic Alphar was a level 4 Dark monster where you could send one Nordic monster you control and 2 Nordic monsters from your deck whose total levels equal 10 to the graveyard to special summon an Aesir monster from your extra deck. If an Aesir monster in your possession is sent to the graveyard by opponent's card, you can banish this card to special summon an Aesir from your extra deck with a different name once per duel. Now you get a card that helps you successfully get a Nordic god on the field if used as the main monster for Gullveig. It even grants a revival for the synchro summon Aesir monster, yet the issue lies here. Since Alvis summons a Nordic god with a card effect, the monster summoned by Alvis can't be revived from the graveyard with its own effect or any other card effects. So it was a great backup plan if you can't bring out your Nordic gods through normal means. Our final batch of support for Nordic came in the TCG set Battle of Chaos, as Konami revealed 4 new cards for the archetype. The 2 monsters given were Nordic Beast Golem Bursty and Nordic Smith Ivaldi. Golem Bursty was their new level 3 tuner monster that can be treated as any Nordic tuner. If normal or special summon, you can target and special summon a Nordic monster from your hand. You can also target a 1 Nordic monster in your graveyard and add it to your hand. Nordic Smith Ivaldi is a level 4 Earth Warrior monster that can be special summoned from your hand if you control another Nordic monster. If normal or specialed, you can add a Nordic Relic card from your deck to your hand. For spells, they had Nordic Relic Healskelf. It continues to let you special summon a Nordic monster from your deck, but restricts you to only summoning Aesir monsters from your extra deck only while that monster is face up on the field. You can banish this card from your graveyard to add a Nordic card from your deck to your hand, then shuffle 1 card from your hand into your deck. However, this card can only be used once per turn and only once that turn. For traps, Nordic Relic Fallon was a continuous trap that lets you negate the effects of all face-up cards your opponent currently controls if you control an Aesir monster. You can also tribute a face-up Nordic monster to target an Aesir monster from your graveyard and special summon it, and you can only use 1 of its effects per turn. There's not much you can ask for in a deck than monsters actually having synergy, which the Nordic archetype has been lacking ever since its release. Golem Bursty was an excellent target, whether in hand or being summoned off of Gullveig's effect. Ivaldi fetched your newest trap from your deck or any other Nordic relic that you wanted on summon. Hilid floated a monster from your deck for free and was a search when banished. And Swallen was a negate that your deck was missing to have interactions on your opponent's turn, which let you have more pieces to your end board. Unfortunately, in 2022, that wasn't enough to stop anything in the current game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Have a high attack monster that your opponent couldn't target, and a negate is simply too easy for decks to play through. Most meta decks in 2022 had no problem breaking through that board. It was still an issue that 1 hand trap could end your turn as there was no protection for Gullveig when using its effect, the most vulnerable card in your deck because it was your only good card. The deck also couldn't go second as it had little to no chance to break through boards with multiple negates or pops. Depending on 1 card in your entire extra deck to carry to victory is the epitome of a fragile deck that wouldn't be able to compete on any level. If it gives you joy, or if you need some copium, the deck did surprisingly make a top 8 at WCQ in Ottawa in June 2022. The deck leaned heavily on the Adventure package for card advantage and a negate in Griffin Rider, and a Magician's package to fetch your Alphars and set up your combos. Could it have been pure luck? Did the Odin's Eye bless his draws? Who knows, but we can guarantee if you run Nordics in 2024, you're looking at a Viking's death in today's game. So with all that being said, it's safe to say the Nordics weren't given a good hand in the TCG. It's once again a case of quality over quantity, as the deck had a whole set dedicated to them, but almost every card gave them no shot at being a playable deck. Constant sub-archetypes clashed with each other, the lack of extenders to establish a board was desert dry, and to top off the ultimate smack to the face, your Nordic boss monsters had lackluster effects that didn't apply pressure to your opponent. Even by the time cards like Gullveig and Golem Bursty came out, the game had already surpassed these cards to make an impact on how Nordics could impact the meta due to the speed of the format and the countless interruptions being played. The deck couldn't operate without Gullveig, and if the card is stopped, so are you. So if you expect Nordics to play like the strong Norse legends they are, expect a more MCU/God of War accent out of your locals or any tournament. May the Nordics/Aesirs rest in Valhalla.